Hello guys, so if you clicked on this video, you're either interested in Iggy Pop and the Stooges and want to know a little more about them, or you're just clicking to see what the hell I've done this time. Well, either way, you'll be satisfied with your answers here. Um, I've made a little presentation on Iggy and the Stooges after studying in detail this particular book, Open Up and Bleed, by Paul Trynka, which is a brilliant biography on the man. I've been into Iggy Pop since I was a little boy, and my dad got me into his music. He bought me Blah 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 when I was only about 2 or 3 years old. I had it on cassette. And I also had the home single off of Brick by Brick, around about the age of 5 as well. So I got into his music very early. And I decided for the latest A Brief History, I was going to do it on Iggy and the Stooges. Now what I've done, rather than doing it on Wikipedia like I did the other two, I figure you guys maybe find that a little bit dull because I didn't get as many views when it was just me in the corner of the screen and just a white background with text scrolling. So I figure you guys don't want me to make you read, so I'm not going to do that this time. I have prepared a presentation which I'm just going to use for my own notes to talk from. I'm not going to show it to you because I don't want to put text on the screen and lose your attention. So this is Iggy and the Stooges, A Brief History. We start with Jim Osterberg, the early years. So he grew up in Coachville Gardens Trailer Park in Ypsilanti, which is just outside of Ann Arbor, Detroit, in a definitive blue-collar home. In the area, there was a class divide between people who earn money from their intellect and those who work with their hands. So you've kind of got that division of class going on in the background of his mind and his life from an early age. His father was James Newell Osterberg Sr., because he's James Newell Osterberg Jr., and his mother is Luella Osterberg. He was born in Muskegon's Osteopathic Hospital on the 21st of April 1947. His father was a disciplinarian who didn't spare the rod. After all, he was a teacher in the 1950s, so he kind of had that mindset. Jim, that's Jim Osterberg, who became Iggy, was a driven personality with a charm and wackiness he got from his easygoing and loving mother. His father would take him on long drives where he would sing along with Sinatra on the radio, which was Jim's first musical influence, listening to his dad singing along to Sinatra. Then the school years. We're going to move on to his school years. Jim had bouts of asthma from a young age for which he'd been off school for extended periods. Isolated and treated with ephedrine at the time, which he later claimed sparked his creativity as he inhabited an imaginary world. He was seen as a special student at Carpenter Elementary, where he attended, cheeky, full of energy, with a slightly coy smile and cute goofiness about him. He was the ringleader of his group of friends. He was highly intelligent with an impressive vocabulary. He found a new social circle when he moved to Tappan Junior High, and this group was seen as snooty by his former contemporaries, but he wanted to fit in with the wealthy kids from Ann Arbor Hills, so he kind of changed it up a bit when he got to junior high. He had a knack for networking with and charming Ann Arbor's most influential people, which comes up again and again in the book. He and his dad and their associates would golf at Pat's Par 3, where they would kind of socialise with a lot of these people. An ability to pluck words out of the air helped him on the debate team, so he was a member of the debate team. And it kind of builds a picture of him in this book of him being like a real intelligent guy, which I believe he is. It says, witty, well-dressed, classroom politician, this kind of character he was, envied by other kids, voted most likely to succeed back then, though he appeared slightly ashamed of his trailer park origins and tended to play it down. And there's mentioned in the book a lot of him actually not taking people home because he didn't want them to see that he lived in the trailer park, even though at the time it wasn't really as frowned upon as I don't think, as he thought it was. He campaigned to become class president in the 9th grade, championing Jack Kennedy and supporting unionization. And then when he's at Ann Arbor High, in his junior year at Ann Arbor High, he secured an entry to the American Legion's Boys State Program, an intensive summer course at Michigan University, which was an event modeled on the state's political structure. Each boy assigned a dorm, which was treated as a city whose inhabitants would run for public office, and where he showed his skills as a public speaker. So again, that kind of thing I never would have assumed before I read the book, that he was like that at school. But he really was almost like going for like politics and like a presidential candidacy early on, before he kind of succumbed to rock and roll. He ran for student office again in 1965 but lost the election. At the graduation talent show, he played a character called Hyacinth, taken from one of his poems that he'd written, who was a flower, alongside his friend Ricky Hodges, who, when he was watered, would grow into life, skipping, prancing, and giggling around the stage. And this appeared to be an early incarnation of what would later become his Iggy Stooge persona. Then, Jim had trained in the school marching band and later the orchestra. Obsessed with Sandy Nelson and the Ventures, in 1962 he formed the Megaton 2, a duo with his friend Jim McLaughlin, where he played drums. Because originally Iggy was a drummer, way before he was a vocalist, and he was a drummer for some years before he started doing the vocals. At McLaughlin's house, he first heard Duane Eddy, Ray Charles, and Chuck Berry, and the guys would spend long hours with McLaughlin playing boogie riffs on the guitar while Jim would accompany him on his three-piece drum kit. They played their first gig at Tapan Talent Show in 1962, joined by Sam Swisher on sax and later in '64 by bassist John Swickerath and guitarist Nick Kolakifas. Jim called the band the Iguanas after what he considered to be the coolest animal. Over the next 2 years, they played local high schools and frat parties at the University of Michigan. Their set changed in keeping with Michigan's musical vibe over time, gradually incorporating more Beatles, Rolling Stones, and Kinks numbers into their set, their stripy surf band shirts replaced with matching sharkskin suits. The band secured a summer residency at Harbor Springs Club Ponytail, where the book, if you read it, details just like they had a really fun summer, basically. So after that, Jim had secured a place at the University of Michigan to study anthropology. On the 24th of October 1965, Jim was in the audience at a newly electric Bob Dylan set at Detroit's Cobo Hall, which divided and shocked fans because they were used to his more acoustic, folky side, but he brought on this new electrified version of Bob Dylan. And apparently that gig hugely influenced Jim, especially the way that the audience were divided on him, but he didn't care. Jeep Holland hired Jim to work at Discount Records, checking in and out the stock of vinyls, outside of which he first spied the Ashton brothers. The Ashton brothers who would later join him to form the Stooges. Brothers Michael and Dan Erlewine from another local band, the Prime Movers, disliked the Iguanas. They would come into Discount Records and call Jim Iguana as an insult. Later, when they got to know him and became friends with him, they shortened it to Iggy, coining the name he would later go by. So it came from him being insulted and being called like Iguana, but then they shortened it to Iggy. In November '65, Jim left the Iguanas to become drummer for the Prime Movers. The Iguanas had been an intimate, cozy outfit, all clanging chords and major key optimism. The Prime Movers' cynical bohemian attitude was in tune with the zeitgeist, and their music got heavier and druggier. So the book says, some of this is quotes from the book. Ron Ashton started hanging out with the band. He auditioned on bass and lasted a couple of gigs before being demoted to roadie and general helper. So at this point, Ron Ashton is hanging out with the Prime Movers, and Iggy's the drummer now. Jim wasn't really into university life and would mainly hang out at the coffee shop and library, dropping out in his second term. He claimed he learned more from his own research in the university library. While with the Prime Movers, Jim studied and learnt a lot from bandleader Michael Erlewine. The band was regularly booked into Mother's Teenage Nightclub, which was kind of a happening place at the time. In the autumn of '66, Jim decided to leave the Prime Movers and took a trip to Chicago to learn blues drumming technique from a guy called Sam Lay. And he played some gigs with other Chicago bluesmen, such as Big Walter Horton and J.B. Hutto, and that period is also described in the book. Again, to start off with, I'm not jumping too much into the book because I wanted to sort of not just read you the thing, but it's going to get to a point with this where I will be reading more because there's so much info in here about the movement of basically the members of the band in the Stooges and what they did to get Iggy to where he then got to. I kind of can't stay away from reading certain passages of the text. But yeah, during a stay at Bob Costa's house, who was a prominent figure at the time in the Chicago blues scene, the bond between Jim and Ron and Scott Ashton was formed, to the detriment of Bob Costa, as they basically trashed his house and kind of set out to like insult and humiliate the guy, which was really out of order, but that's what happened, and it goes into further detail in the book about that. So quite a direct quote from the book. The Stooges could only have existed in Ann Arbor, for no other town was as smart and as dumb. A place where high art met greaser thuggery, the intellectual met the dysfunctional, which kind of sums up the Stooges perfectly. This is the point when Iggy would later boast he became corrupted. Much of the alienation, boredom, and gonzo humour that pervades Iggy's persona originates from Ron and Scott Ashton. Now, Ron was the original guitarist in the Stooges, and Scott was the drummer. They were brothers. Jim adopted their values and tough guy persona. The Ashton brothers' mother, Anne, had brought them to Ann Arbor immediately after their father Ronald's death in December 1963. Ron and his pal Dave Alexander, who would eventually become a bassist in the Stooges, dropped out of high school and travelled to London in hopes of spotting the Beatles or the Stones. They ended up seeing the Who while they were there. After getting kicked out of the Prime Movers, Ron joined Scott Richardson's Chosen Few on bass, playing Detroit's Grand Ballroom opening for the MC5 in October '66. Again, there's a lot of mention of the MC5 in the book, who the Stooges are kind of referred to as the MC5's little brother band, because the MC5 were not just a band, they're almost like a political movement in their own right in Detroit, in and around Ann Arbor. And the Stooges kind of came up with them, like gigging with them. Scott Ashton at one point played drums with Ron and Dave and Bill Cheatham, who would later join the Stooges as well, in a garage band called the Dirty Shames. Jim and the Ashton brothers returned from Chicago at a time when a psychedelic revolution was happening in Ann Arbor, which is really important. They decided to form a band, at first thinking Jim would play drums and Scott would sing, because Scott had kind of the looks for the frontman. For funds, they would buy marijuana plants and dry them to sell on as grass. There's a funny story in the book about how they're doing it in drying them out in like the laundry room somewhere around the trailer park, and the dad ends up smelling it and cottons under what they're doing. They rehearsed at the Ashton's house until Dave Alexander was recruited, then moved rehearsals to his place. They debated a lineup, and that was also because their mum had been like driven nuts by the sound of the band, like rehearsing all the time. They debated a lineup where both Jim and Scott would play drums, but after Jim's parents bought him a Farfisa organ, he played that, so he started playing the keyboard in the band. Ron fed his bass guitar through a fuzzbox and a wah-wah pedal. The group moved into their first band house in the summer of '67 in Forest Court, which was on the university campus. They took on Ron Richardson, the Chosen Few's previous manager, as a manager, as he owned a van and could supply them with LSD. I think it was because there were experiments with LSD like actually going on at the university, like in terms of their like science side of things, and so he could get the LSD from there and was supplying it to the band, and he was taking it himself as well. Acid trips became a regular part of their lives, while they would listen to Frank Zappa's Freak Out album, Hendrix's Are You Experienced, Dr. John's Gree, and Pharoah Sanders' Towheed albums. There was also the constant background noise of late night TV, including Ron's favourite, the Three Stooges, where they got their name from. They originally called themselves the Psychedelic Stooges. That was what they went by on their early gigs. They played their debut gig at Ron Richardson's house on the 31st of October '67, and that's where I'm going to have to dive into the book, because it describes it, that first gig. Psychedelic Stooges boasted a hotline to the MC5 in the form of Ron Scott's sister, Kathy Ashton, who had attracted the attention of MC5 guitarist Fred Sonic Smith. Wayne Kramer, the MC5's leader, had known Jim from his Prime Movers days, and at one point had considered enticing him into his own band. Hence, when the Psychedelic Stooges decided to unveil the results of their musical experiments, it was natural that Sinclair and the Five would be invited. And as 1967 rolled on, it was decided that All Hallows Eve, which marked the onset of winter and the time when spirits walked the earth, was a well-starred date. The buzz spread around town for several weeks beforehand. The chosen venue for the Psychedelic Stooges' public debut was Ron Richardson's house on State Street, a short way out of the centre of Ann Arbor proper. Richardson was responsible for overseeing the guest list, while his wife, Nausicaa, was assigned the task of assisting with Jim's costume. After fighting with him over a Victorian nightdress at an Ann Arbor thrift shop, Nausicaa admitted Jim's need was greater. She spent several days cutting aluminium foil into strips and gluing them to a rubber bathing cap to make Jim a metallic silver wig. Influenced by American avant-garde composer Harry Partch, who specialised in bizarre homemade instruments, Jim spent much of his time stoned, looking in the garbage dump at the back of Ron's house for promising junk. Scott Ashton prepared for his public drumming debut by decorating his improvised drum kit, which was fashioned from oil cans rescued from the dump. He decorated his kit with symbols that were the perfect metaphor for the Stooges' mix of high and low art. In bright colours, he painted the Om, the winged eye of Horus, and other spiritual symbols from Dave Alexander's books on Eastern mysticism. Then wrote words like, basically bad words, in ultraviolet paint that would only be visible under black lights. October the 31st was a busy night on the hippie calendar, and many of those who attended the party were on their way to or from another celebration. Bill Kirchen of the psychedelic band The Seventh Seal, and later Commander Cody, perhaps best sums up the ambience when he points out that DMT was the dominant drug that night especially. Of all the drugs I've ever done, that was definitely the one that most made you worry you'd done something permanent to your brain. You'd have to have someone hold the pipe for you and rest your head back on something so you wouldn't fall over when you did it. It was so gnarly. Dozens of people drifted in and out of the band's debut party. Most of Ann Arbor's beautiful people were present, including, and it just lists the people. The room was festooned with tapestries, the aroma of pot hung heavy in the air, and the noise when it started was casual. Iggy sat cross-legged on the floor, playing a Hawaiian guitar with every string tuned to E. Ron played his bass through a variety of effects boxes, while Scott maintained a basic Bo Diddley beat. Dave Alexander's role was restricted to twirling the amplifier dials or smashing Ron's custom amplifier against its cabinet, sending reverberating roars echoing through the room and surrounding neighbourhood. For the volume at which they played was, everyone agrees, simply staggering. There were long instrumental pieces, and it must have been like being badly beaten to listen to them, Iggy reminisces fondly. Bill Kirchen was unmoved by the spectacle. I thought this will never play, he says. But the people the band needed to impress were convinced. The disorientating mix of pharmaceuticals was exacerbated by the oral onslaught. Ron and Scott's rhythmic backdrop occasionally faltered as Ron's overloaded amp kept blowing fuses, while Iggy moved from the Hawaiian guitar to coax noises out of a more improvised instruments, including a vacuum cleaner and the appropriately named Osterizer, which was a whirring blender half filled with water into which he'd insert a microphone to produce a rippling white noise like a waterfall or a theremin, the ethereal spooky sci-fi instrument familiar from Beach Boys' Good Vibrations. Jim saw the Doors show at the university when they played there, and was entranced by Jim Morrison, who staggered around drunk, howling like a gorilla, and enraging the frat boys, so Jim later quotes. His antics and provocation of the audience inspiring Jim to become a singer, with Ron switching to guitar and Dave Alexander on bass. So it's actually seeing Jim Morrison and the Doors that inspired Iggy to start being a frontman, which is really cool, actually. Jim convinced Jimmy Silver to become their new manager, and he and his wife moved into a farmhouse with the band near Ypsilanti, which became the Fun House. Intelligent, forceful, and charismatic, Jimmy Silver, aided by his wife Susan, proved the ideal person to steer the psychedelic Stooges. He was a paternal figure who could impose some degree of organisation. He could negotiate their always complex relations with what became their big brother band, the MC5, and sweet-talk often reluctant local promoters into booking his charges. So he basically took over from Ron Richardson at this point, who kind of was running out of patience and ability to deal with the band. He even ministered to their nutritional needs, improving their health with a macrobiotic diet, which he and Susan had researched. But it was still a tough job, like herding cats, he recalls. They were completely immature in most ways. They could drink alcohol and take drugs and get even further over the wall. Jim was both a leader and a follower to his bandmates. He learned from his fellow Stooges and frequently, as in the episode with Bob Costa, which the book talks about, set out to outdo them to validate his membership of the gang. Hence, he was quite capable of being, as Jimmy Silver observes, a willful and destructive child. But in quiet moments, particularly during the occasional weeks when Jimmy and Susan would wean him off drugs and alcohol and nurture him on the macrobiotic diet to eliminate his asthma, he demonstrated the preternatural insight he demonstrated back at school. One of those days when we were looking after him, I realised what a brilliant analytical mind he had, says Jimmy Silver. He had an ability to identify what attracted people and what would make them want to do what he needed or wanted. After some months, Silver realised that in some respects he was the one being managed. that Jim would set aside quality time to nurture their relationship, to bond with Silver, or allow me to feel like I was bonding with him, he says. Yet Jim did it in such an honest, open fashion that it never felt calculating or manipulative. Only in retrospect did Silver realise how Jim had managed to entice him into managing the Psychedelic Stooges by offering him the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. Intuitively, he'd worked out what was the driving force of Silver's life. So from early '68, Jimmy and Susan lived with the Psychedelic Stooges at close quarters, moving in with them to what would become the fabled Funhouse, a large wood-framed farmhouse some way out of Ann Arbor toward Ypsilanti, which had been spotted by Ann Ashton. The farmhouse was up for rent at a bargain price because it was due to be demolished to make way for a highway. In forthcoming years, its owner, Farmer Bayliss, aka the Bear, would drive over and mournfully survey its increasingly decrepit condition. It would become the seat of the Stooges' empire and was christened Stooge Hall, or the Funhouse, which would later become the name of the second Stooges album, Funhouse. The name was appropriate, for it was a location that local girls and boys couldn't wait to visit, although the girls in particular faced the prospects of being chased around the farmhouse in complete darkness to the music of Harry Partch, a fiendish sensory deprivation technique that today would doubtless qualify as cruel and inhuman treatment. Yes, there was some crazy goings on, as it appears, in the Stooges' households. In those early months, the Psychedelic Stooges worked fitfully, spending perhaps half an hour in the evening rehearsing at mind-boggling volume. Jimmy Silver, who heard all their practice sessions, observed that they possessed a surprising musical sophistication, demonstrated by their brilliant pastiches of their Ann Arbor rivals. And he quotes, "They could perfectly mimic the style of bands like Bob Seger, The Rationals, Ted Nugent, but they sounded even better than those bands could sound themselves in their own style." Silver thought that surplus material could become a lucrative sideline and tried to persuade them to demo their material for other bands to record, but his suggestions were rejected. Instead, Jim and Ron concentrated on developing music that bore no relation to any existing style, music that existed on a completely unconscious, unmediated level, unrestricted by conventional structure. It would be the perfect collision of highbrow and gonzo. Jim drew on all the avant-garde precedents he'd learned about from Bob Sheff, while Ron and Scott drew on their honest rock and roll dumb aggression. Yet that interaction was rendered more complex because, as Jim points out, Ron has an elegance as an instrumentalist and a writer that I lack. Although in later years there would be disputes about who had written what in the Stooges, with Iggy Pop claiming to have written every single note of the music, it's clear that most of the early songs derived from Ron's ideas and riffs. Ashton's guitar style was simple, its intelligent minimalism and intense delivery heavily influenced by the ultra-violent guitar assault he'd seen Pete Townsend unleash back in London. He saw Who. But sculpting songs out of the chaos of ideas was a slow process. As Jimmy Silver recalls, the band's musical stamina was such that even rehearsing for more than 45 minutes was a strain, and they couldn't physically play for more than 15 minutes, 20 at the most. Yeah, so their first proper shows were at Detroit's Grand Ballroom in January and March '68. Yeah, their debut, in fact, was on 20th January, replacing the Amboy Dukes on a bill, blah, blah, blah. The hippie kids and heads attending that evening could have no clue what was about to hit them. For the first grand dates, Jim Osterberg finally left the Hawaiian guitar at home and made his debut as a frontman. Jim himself describes those early performances as being naive, heavily derivative of his heroes Mick Jagger and Jim Morrison. He says, "That's who I wanted to be. In fact, it was so obvious that they should have called me Mick Morrison." But Jim Morrison never appeared on stage in a white Victorian nightdress, wearing a homemade metallic silver wig and white makeup, towing a vacuum cleaner in his wake. It's very true. Indeed, the Psychedelic Stooges looked so ludicrous that on the 45-minute drive to the gig, according to Ron Ashton, several rednecks attempted to run them off the highway, while the security guard at the Grand took one look at Iggy, bedecked in his aluminium finery, and asked, "What is that? Some kind of mechanical man?" Once at the venue, the owner, Russ Gibb, was nonplussed by the singer's costume, and listened patiently as Jim Osterberg explained the practical difficulties of amplifying the Osterizer, the blend of the water that he uses, which Russ thought was some kind of toilet bowl. Open-minded and enthusiastic, always ready to indulge anything that the kids might go for, Russ came out of his office to watch the band open their set. He found it thrilling. Based around high-energy rock and roll in the vein of The Who, Hendrix, or indeed the MC5, this was way more freeform. Iggy would sing into the vacuum cleaner, vocalizing lines that were then picked up by Ron and Dave in long, repetitive, loping riffs, while Scott Ashton kept up a Bo Diddley-influenced tribal beat, bashed out on 55-gallon oil cans, augmented with a set of timbales and battered cymbals. They started to play other small clubs scattered around the Michigan area, the band signed to Elektra Records on October the 4th, 68, changing their name officially from Psychedelic Stooges to The Stooges. The band members at this time referred to Jim as Pop, after Jim shaved his eyebrows one time, and they thought he looked like an Ann Arbor character named Jim Pop, whose hair had fallen out. For professional purposes, they always referred to him as Iggy Stooge. So in the house, he was Jim or Pop, but at gigs and stuff, he's Iggy Stooge. Danny Fields flew the Stooges to New York to show them. Oh yeah, because he's basically the dude from Elektra who's come and discovered them. So Danny Fields flew the Stooges to New York to show them the sights and venues, including Andy Warhol's factory and Max's Kansas City, where Iggy would become like a regular. Jim met Nico, who was connected with the Velvet Underground, at Steve Paul's The Scene. She came back to Detroit to stay at the Funhouse for a couple of weeks while she was sort of dating Iggy, and they shot a video for her called one of her songs, Evening of Light. And I recommend, if you want to see something crazy, look up Nico Evening of Light and see like a young, crazy looking Iggy Pop in that video. It's mad. Jim briefly dated Paulette Benson and had a son by her, who was born on the 26th February 1969. Just another biographical point there. Paulette moved to California to raise a child alone, and Jim wasn't involved in his life until later on, because he wasn't really in much of a mature mental state at that point to be raising a kid. Over the spring, the band would work on songs for their debut album, which is what we're going to jump to. Now, I'm going to show you this on the laptop. Forgive the quality of how this appears, but that there is the Stooges' first album. Again, if we were doing this like I did it before on Wikipedia, I'd have just shown you on here, but you've seen it now. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the making of that album. Over the spring of '69, the Stooges worked on developing enough songs for the debut album. John Cale had agreed to produce the band on the basis that they make the record and forget about what's on stage. For that reason, apart from tantalising clues, no true record remains of early Stooges performances, and those early freeform songs, including I'm Sick, Asthma Attack, Goodbye Bozos, and Dance of Romance, were abandoned or reworked. In 3 months of 20-minute rehearsal sessions, minimal songs were sculpted, piece by piece, from the primordial matter of those early riffs. The standout song was crafted from the fragment of a bird's riff that Ron had first heard on his last acid trip back in April. It would become the perfect illustration of the maxim talent borrows, genius steals, for the Byrds' simple two-note guitar line was lifted wholesale to become the basis of 1969, which opens the album. But where any other band, including the Byrds, would feel the need to embellish something so simple, the Stooges unlocked its primitive beauty simply by leaving it unadorned. The song was remarkable as much for what was left out as what was included. Where convention would suggest augmenting the song's basic two-chord structure, or resolving it by escaping to a third chord, the Stooges simply repeated themselves, another year for me and you, another year with nothing to do. That's the lyric. The musical dead end, trapped within two chords, perfectly expresses the boredom and claustrophobia of the song's deadpan disaffection. I Wanna Be Your Dog, another song on the album, one of the big songs they're known for, was carved out of another riff that Ron had started playing in his room. Jim had instantly spotted, that's a goodie. It was another simple motif, similar to a standard blues riff from Yusuf Lateef's Eastern Market, a staple of the Stooges' listening. But set against a musical drone, it transforms into something elemental, inexorable, and far more malevolent. Jim would later claim that its basic lyrics were romantic, expressing the simple yearning to lie in a girl's lap, but the song's sadomasochistic overtones undoubtedly betray the influence of the Velvet Underground's Venus and Furs. No Fun, another song which the band were playing live by the spring, was based on a simple chord change familiar from Question Mark and the Mysterians' garage staple 96 Tears. In this instance, though, it was shorn of its seventh chords to make it, as Danny Fields put it, unblues. Meanwhile, the dirgy Dance of Romance, what would today be called a classic stoner riff, gained a lyrical romantic opening, a vehicle for Jim's desire to sing the words I love you. It was given the title Anne, partly in tribute to the ever-tolerant and motherly Anne Ashton, although the gossip at Hill Street, according to a guy called Hiawatha Bailey, was that it was inspired by Anne Opie-Wera, the charismatic blue-blooded doyenne of Ann Arbor's avant-garde scene. And he quotes, "She was an amputee, had lost one leg to cancer, and when Jim would see her stranded in the audience, he would drop his wild man persona and carry her tenderly to where she needed to be." So it was possibly written for the Ashtons' mum and possibly for Anne Opie-Wera. As the Stooges worked with what was, for them, unstinting zeal, there was troubling news from New York. At the end of January, Danny Fields was gossiping in the company's New York office about the company vice president Bill Harvey, a man who had always been Fields' nemesis. "He was a good art director, but the opposite kind of person I found attractive on this earth," he says. Harvey heard Fields speculate that Bill's daughter's upcoming marriage was a shotgun wedding and smacked me in the head, he says. "He had been waiting for the opportunity to sack me for a long time," and he did. With Fields gone for a new job in publicity at Atlantic Records, his major signings, because he brought them on board to Elektra, had no one to champion their cause at Elektra. Stooges' many detractors would not have been surprised to know that the band's first recording session started on April Fool's Day at New York's Hit Factory at 1 in the afternoon. The studio was situated on Times Square over a peep show, according to Jim. There was conflict from the off when an engineer told the band their Marshall amplifiers were too loud, and that Hit Factory owner Jerry Ragavoy always had his soul musicians record with smaller amps. Iggy's negotiation tactic was to have a tantrum. He says, "I took a deep breath and I said, I don't care who the fuck Jerry Ragavoy is. You don't know anything about this. And that was always my attitude. Stay away, get back." And then we set up the full stack. So there you go. Had their way anyway. Ron Ashton remembers the band stage a sit-down strike and sat in the corner smoking hash until John Cale suggested they turn the amps down from full to 9 in order to get the performance on tape without too much leakage. But still there were problems. It was very hard to get those tempos up, Jim remembers. With an audience, the tempos would come up because we were nervous. In fact, we'd all be shit in our collective pants. But without the audience, the dope took over. Finally, Iggy and Cale realised that if the singer danced in the studio as the backing tracks went down, the band would speed up somewhat from their pot-induced torpor. The Stooges had arrived with 1969, No Fun, I Want to Be Your Dog, and Anne prepared, and realising that this would be insufficient, worked up the dirge-like We Will Fall, which is a long kind of mantra-type song that goes round and round, based on a chant by Indian guru Swami Ramdas, whose biography Dave Alexander had borrowed from Jimmy Silver, because Dave Alexander was really into Eastern mysticism and stuff like that. In addition, they also recorded a freeform jam, a chaotic assemblage of wah-wah guitar and wordless moans that would languish in the Elektra vaults for many years and is quite possibly a version of Asthma Attack. Each song featured a lengthy freak-out, and together the 6 songs made up well over half an hour, plenty for a vinyl album, thought the Stooges. But Holzman disagreed after hearing the first mixes and asked if there were any more songs. "I said, yeah, we've got more," said Ron, and the band returned to the Chelsea Hotel and wrote Little Doll, Not Right and Real Cool Time in an hour, according to him. That was the magic Stooge time, when I could just sit down and come up with shit. In every case, the lyrics were drawn from the Stooges slang. Little doll, real cool time, those were words we used every day, says Ron. Real cool time and not right recycled the basic chords of I Want to Be Your Dog to great effect. Little Doll was a straight lift from a bass line that appears halfway through Upper and Lower Egypt by Pharoah Sanders, the ex-Coltrane sax player and new jazz pioneer who coincidentally shared an interest in ancient Egyptian anthropology with the Stooges singer. According to Cale, the recording sessions at the Hit Factory were too frenetic for Nico to visit for long, the girl that Jim was seeing. But Jim still retains a memory of her sitting in the control room with a very severe expression, knitting, while Cale sat there in a Transylvanian black cape. It set up an atmosphere. Although Cale was undoubtedly the dominant presence at the sessions, the first-time producer was actually slightly nervous. "I was wet behind the ears running a studio session, and it was really difficult. I found myself just wanting to be part of the band." Jimmy Silver remembers Cale as being committed, communicative, and full of suggestions. Jim describes the sound he wanted, and Cale goes, "That's a Cuban instrument called a güiro. There's a 24-hour music store near here. Do you want me to send out for one?" Then they got into the Stooges mentality, and it was, "Oh, that's too much trouble, don't bother." Nonetheless, Cale managed to get the Stooges' monosyllabic slab of noise, as it was quoted, on tape, while adding his own more literate European sensibility. But when he attempted to bias the mix to give Iggy's voice more of a Kurt Weill art edge, there was a confrontation. "I was trying to characterize Iggy's vocal, make it a little more evil," confesses Cale. "I decided I was going to work the mixing board and went after this idea to the horror of Jim, who was sitting there listening to his vocals get thinner and thinner. For a studio novice, Jim was very specific about what he wanted. In fact, today he maintains that after a major fallout, he remixed the whole album himself, without Cale, assisted by Elektra boss Jack Holzman. Cale remembers he abandoned his approach and that engineer Louis Merenstein helped broker a compromise mix. Today, Holzman has no memory of a remix, while Louis Merenstein, a celebrated producer in his own right, concurs with Cale. It is as John said, I certainly know that without John the album would not have happened. Nonetheless, Iggy would later claim John Cale had little or nothing to do with the sound. He shouldn't have been there, a sentiment that Danny Fields dismisses as unworthy. And that's another thing you get in this book. There's a lot of sort of argued opinions of like, well, he said, she said, basically. So some of it you have to take with a pinch of salt, but the truth is somewhere in the middle of it all, as it so often is. As it was, Cale demonstrated commendable commitment to his charges, who overran on their 5-day booking at the Hit Factory and had to move to Mastertone Studios on 42nd Street. Richard Bosworth and his band Jennifer's Friends were booked into Mastertone and were forced to sit and wait as this session overran. John Cale refused to relinquish the studio. He was a very intimidating presence, and no one was going to argue with him, but there was a big confrontation, a fistfight, because John wouldn't let their recording time be cut short. One of the first people outside the Stooges privileged to hear their debut recording, Bosworth's reaction would anticipate that of most of the American public. It seemed totally alien, disturbingly different, raw, with screaming vocals. It was very, very different from anything I'd heard before, and I remember thinking, this won't fly. Iggy's subsequent denunciation of Cale was a classic Oedipal sentiment. I need to prove he was superior to his mentors, but in many respects the Stooges, Jim included, were not as worldly wise as they would later make out. Joel Brodsky was commissioned by Bill Harvey to shoot the album cover at the beginning of May. Once the band arrived at his studio on 27th Street, he found them uncommunicative and unresponsive, but he'd heard that the singer Iggy was physical, and asked if he fancied jumping up in the air for the shoot. Okay, no problem, was the reply. Brodsky finally captured an image of Iggy leaping in the air with no thought of how he would land, while Ron and Scott winced at the prospect of his imminent fall, which was inevitably flat on his face. Brodsky rushed the singer to St. Vincent's emergency room, where he had 5 stitches put in his chin. The stitches were airbrushed out of the final album cover, which was a straight rehash of Electra Sleeve for the Doors debut LP. And I'm just going to skip to, there's some pictures, if I can find them. Here you go. So there's Iggy taking a dive, where the other's like, oh, he's going to land on his face. And then it shows him with like his face looking puffy from the stitches and how they airbrushed that out for the cover. That does look very similar to the Doors cover, actually, of their first album. So then in the summer of '69, the Stooges became regulars on the festival circuit, playing their first gigs outside of Detroit. On 23rd May, they played the Grey Chapel, a student union venue in Delaware, Ohio. And I've marked that as a note because it's an interesting description of their early gig. On the 23rd of May, Ben Edmonds, a fan of the MC5 who'd heard about the Stooges via Danny Fields, persuaded the Delaware, Ohio Student Union to book the Stooges at the Grey Chapel, a large college venue that held 2,500 people. The Stooges walked onto the huge stage to see around a dozen people in the entire auditorium. It was a magical performance, says Ben Edmonds. The 3 Stooges just stood there on this huge stage, where you could see Iggy checking out all that space and working out what to do with it. Dressed in cut-off jeans and a page boy haircut with no shirt, Iggy launched into his dance, and the small crowd, not one of whom knew the band's music, were transfixed. I didn't know any of the music and couldn't distinguish any songs apart from one that went "No Fun, My Babe," says Edmonds, which is obviously no fun. But I was totally mesmerised by Iggy. I'd never seen anybody move like that before. The singer seemed transfixed by the elemental music, so much so that at one point he picked up the shards of a broken drumstick and started scraping it almost absent-mindedly over his chest. He apparently increased the pressure with each stroke, remembers Edmonds, because red welt lines soon became visible, which then discharged trickles of blood down his torso. I was dumbstruck. And this would become a theme of their live gigs. He'd end up like cutting himself. After the show, Edmonds watched as the singer donned a white t-shirt and blood began to ooze through the fabric. Watching that made me more queasy than even committing the act, says Edmonds. This was mild compared to the damage he'd later inflict on himself, but this, it turned out, was the first time he'd ever done such a thing. So I thought that was noteworthy because it's the first time he ever did that. One audience member who was also shocked by the spectacle came up to speak to Iggy after the performance. Her name was Wendy Robin Weisberg, 19 years old and ex-girlfriend of Panther White. She came from a wealthy suburb, and it just talks about her and how she was kind of struck and mesmerised by his performance. The Stooges album was released and got good reviews, but was largely ignored by radio and the general public, though the Stooges were making a name for themselves with their raw live shows. In late '69, the Silvers moved out of the Funhouse while the band started working on material for the next album, which would become Funhouse. On April 21st, 1970, Iggy's 32nd birthday. It's amazing to think he was like that age, even at that point in the Stooges. Like, his career has spanned so long. He's in his like 70s now. But it's just amazing career he's had. I know he's had some serious like setbacks and like downfalls, but he's always like risen from the ashes like a phoenix, man. So for his birthday, the band flew to Los Angeles for a stay at Tropicana to record Funhouse, which is this one. So you can see my slideshow there, but I'm not using. So yeah, Funhouse is a cool album, and we're going to learn a little bit about it now. Indeed, where the Stooges had struggled to come up with enough material for their debut album, the new songs came thick and fast. The object, says Jim, was to forge ahead. We realised we had another album to do, and I wrote them all one by one. Down on the Beach, written as a love song for Wendy, was reworked after her departure into Down on the Street, while the Savage guitar riff of 1970, which is a wicked song, was written by Ron, as was Loose. Although in his more megalomaniac moments, Iggy would claim to have written every single note of the band's set, he later described the material as all essentially variations on a theme by Ron. But over this period, the band's compositions, like their lifestyle, were totally communal. Even roadie Bill Cheatham was drawn into the musical mix, recruited as a kind of apprentice to Ron. If you remember earlier, he was in a band called Dirty Shames with Ron and Scott before. The two would practice on guitar together up in Ron's first floor apartment, which had been inherited from the Silvers and given an Ashton makeover. They would work on intricate guitar voicings, which allowed Ron to perfect his overdub parts for the imminent second Stooges album. Although Elektra had taken their sweet time arranging the band's debut, with the MC5 gone, Jack Holzman and Bill Harvey paid a little more attention to the Little Brother band, and the sessions for a follow-up were being planned by January 1970. The choice of producer was critical. In typical Stooge fashion, the band, Iggy in particular, were already bad-mouthing John Cale's work on their debut, and Elektra's first two suggestions, Jackson Browne and Steve Miller keyboard player Jim Peterman, were rejected after cursory consideration. The third contender, who'd recently been recruited by Jack Holzman as a producer based in the label's West Coast office, was Don Gallucci, who ends up becoming the guy, who'd just racked up his first production hit with Krabby Appleton. A charming, diminutive Italian-American guy, Don's expensive suits and impressive vocabulary were both a surprise, considering his first musical break was playing keyboards on the Kingsmen's proto-punk classic Louie Louie, which became a staple of the Stooges set as well. In February 1970, the Stooges were booked for a two-night run at Ungano's, a hip club on the West 70th Street, named after its founders Arnie and Nick Ungano. It was the band's first New York gig since an August 1969 showcase at the State Pavilion with the MC5, which the Stooges had been overshadowed by their big brothers, as it were. Jack Holzman sent Gallucci a plane ticket just a few days before the show and told him there was a band he needed to check out. No more information was forthcoming. Neither Gallucci nor most of the audience had any clue what would hit them. Many of the Max's Kansas City crew were present to see the boy they'd met in the back room, because Iggy would frequent the back room of Max's. Every one of them, boy and girl, wanted to know what it would be like to be with him, basically. As the Stooges hit the stage, Gallucci was mesmerised by the sheer wall of noise. Up to now, every band he'd ever seen had decorated their music with lots of chords or flash solos. But he thought this sounded like machine music, a deconstructed minimalist slab of sound. For the past 4 months, the Stooges' skills had been honed by an intensive performance schedule booked by their agency, Detroit's DMA, and their playing was at a peak. The momentum of Ron, Dave and Scott's instrumental onslaught did not let up for a moment. Iggy, sporting his new customary outfit of threadbare Levi's, black boots and elbow-length silver lame gloves, confronted his audience from his first moment on stage. As the band broke into Loose, inviting them to take a ride on the pretty music, most of the audience were transfixed by the lascivious lyrics. Over March 1970, when Marsh was staying at the Funhouse, a new Ann Arbor musician was pulled into Osterberg's orbit. Steve Mackey was the most in-demand sax player in the city, playing with Bill Kirchen and Commander Cody, Vivian Shevitt's Charging Rhinoceros of Soul, as well as leading his own avant-garde duo Carnal Kitchen, which occasionally featured ex-Prime Mover and future stooge Bob Sheff. One night he looked up from a Carnal Kitchen performance at a Beaux Arts ball to see the Stooges singer in the audience. A few weeks later, Jim walked into Discount Records, where Mackey now works, because obviously Jim used to work there, and invited him out for a coffee. He's already got Funhouse written in his head, says Mackey. He knows there's going to be sax on it, and he already knows he wants me to take me to Los Angeles to record, but I was the last one to know. Mackey played one performance with the Stooges and was given the obligatory nickname Stan Sax. In mid-April, Jim called to tell him they were leaving for Los Angeles in 2 days. He postponed his college exams, convinced he'd be back in a couple of weeks. For the Stooges, their followers and their publicists, the recording of Funhouse was the most blissful period of their existence. The band flew into Los Angeles on Jim Osterberg's 23rd birthday, 21st of April, and promptly moved into the Tropicana, a universe of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, in one shanty motel. Situated on Santa Monica Boulevard by the heart of the Sunset Strip, the Trop was owned by legendary Los Angeles Dodgers pitcher Sandy Koufax. It was LA's premier down-market rock and roll location. Andy Warhol was a regular. Jim Morrison had only recently moved out after a 2-year stay, and the day the Stooges moved in, Ed Sanders was on site writing The Family, his disturbing, shockingly detailed story of the Manson murders that had horrified Los Angeles only the previous summer. The four main Stooges commanded a suite each round the central swimming pool, where Jim would spend the early mornings building up an impressive suntan. The rest of the entourage, including new boy Mackey, road manager John Adams, plus roadies Bill Cheatham, Leo Beatty, and Zeke Zetner, shared crummier $6 rooms at the edge of the motel. The first night at the Tropicana, Scotty found a sap in his room. Jimmy Silver found a gun in his rental car. In the evening, after the grueling recording sessions finished, the band wandered the garish, neon-lit strip, or wandered down to Long Beach, where Scotty got a tattoo, hung out in diners and picked up actresses who aspired to the Hollywood big time but paid the rent doing porno flicks. Andy Warhol stopped in to say hello. Jim obliged, although most of the other Stooges thought he was creepy and avoided him. The place was full of groupies and people who had good and bad drugs. Whoever you saw, girl or boy, the possibilities were endless. You walked down Santa Monica Boulevard to pick someone up and said, "I have any named drug, let's go back to your suite," remembers Danny Fields, who still helped out the Stooges as a publicist, despite the fact he was now employed by Atlantic. The whole place was like that, freewheeling. Every afternoon, the band would tuck their guitars, drumsticks, and saxophone under their arms and walk the few blocks to the Electra West Coast offices on La Cienega. Don Gallucci, the man who had initially refused to record the Stooges, would work them hard, right from their preparatory rehearsals at SIR Studios on Santa Monica. But he would also, along with engineer Brian Ross Meyering, show heroic dedication in his mission to record the unrecordable. The Electra Sound Recorder studio, situated within the company's West Coast office, was a cozy bleachwood setup, perfectly suited for Electra's wistful folk troubadours, but it was hopeless for recording scuzzy rock and roll. The floors were draped with tasteful rugs and the walls were covered with baffling to deaden the sound and ensure acoustic instruments could be recorded with utmost clarity. Holzman's interest in audiophile technology also meant that the mixing desk was a state-of-the-art Neve all-transistor design, which gave a totally clean, clinical sound. The moment the band set up their Marshalls and started playing, Gallucci shuddered and realised this is a nightmare. Gallucci is a talkative, voluble soul, although today he describes himself as naive. I'd started young and I missed a whole lot of emotional cues. He was also faced with a remarkably truculent, uncommunicative bunch of musicians. Where Jim Osterberg was normally the conduit between the outside world and the Stooges. During these sessions, Gallucci mostly dealt with Ron Ashton and found the Stooges singer twitchy and nervous. There was a simple explanation for these communication problems. Iggy had decided to celebrate recording the album by dropping a tab of acid at the beginning of every day's work. That'll do it. In the face of such mutual incomprehension, it was quite remarkable that Gallucci elected to throw the rulebook out of the window and the sonic baffling and rugs out of the studio. After a couple of days of trial and error, he allowed the band to set up all their equipment in the same room so they could feed off each other's performance. Finally, in an unprecedented move, Gallucci and Ross Meyering decided to record the entire band live, with Iggy singing through a handheld microphone and amplified through a PA system set up on the studio floor. For Gallucci and Ross Meyering, a respected British engineer who had just come from a Barbra Streisand session, This would ordinarily have been anathema, but for the fact that if they tried recording the band in conventional fashion, it simply sounded stupid. There's no other explanation, is what they say. By now, according to Jimmy Silver, there was a certain amount of bonding going on, thanks to Don Gallucci's wife, a white witch with that gothic look nearly twice as tall as Donnie, as a quote, who took the band to see Bela Lugosi's old house. By 11th May, the band had progressed to recording a set of promising run-throughs. The sonic leakage contributed to an unrelentingly intense onslaught of sound, while Iggy's voice was simply electrified, distorted and fiery like a Chicago blues harmonica. Thereafter, Gallucci dictated the band should work like a jazz outfit, recording one song per day in the order of the Stooges' live set. A couple of days into recording proper, the Stooges took a weekend out for a trip to San Francisco to headline for 2 nights at the New Old Fillmore, supported by Alice Cooper and the Flaming Groovies. So it says about how Iggy got a taste for cocaine during this period. He'd been given his first taste of cocaine by Danny Fields early in the sessions, but told his publicist, "I don't feel anything." Then a few days later climbed in Fields' motel room window to beg for some more, before hoovering up all his supply. Towards the end of their stay, freelance photographer Ed Carafe came in to shoot the album cover and photograph the band sprawling around the studio. And it was, "Oh, you want the band to look perky for the shoot," says Steve Mackey, "so we all took a whole bunch of cocaine." Jim Osterberg today recalls the charming hippie photographer fondly, as well as his pink cocaine from Peru and psilocybin in pill form, although today Carafe recalls no cocaine during the sessions. For Iggy and John Adams in particular, cocaine soon became an obsession. John Adams being the guy who moved into the Silvers' home and sort of took over looking after the band for a little bit. Okay, so on Monday the 25th of May, the band recorded 12 takes of Dirt, deciding the final one was The Keeper, before embarking on the final song, a freak out that they generally referred to as the hippie ending or occasionally Freak, and would eventually be titled LA Blues. The hippie ending normally followed on directly from the song Funhouse, but rather than attempt to record 20 minutes of material in one go, Gallucci decided they should record the freak out as a standalone. To get in the mood and to celebrate the album's conclusion, all 5 Stooges bar Ron dropped acid. Ross Myring rolled up his shirt sleeves and manned the board. "You could tell the Edge Patrol was finally getting to him," says Gallucci, but still he figured, "If we're going out of the box, let's go all the way." Steve Mackey still remembers lying on his back on the studio floor, wailing away on the sax, feeling out on a limb, looking over at Iggy Pop, and feeling freaked out. "Does he hate me? This is scary," all that stuff, you know. Finally, the Stooges had recorded the unrecordable. So that is the recording of Funhouse. So according to several denizens of the Funhouse, when Jim got back to Ann Arbor, when Jim hit Ann Arbor, so had cocaine, almost as if it was planned. In some respects it was. Nixon's Operation Intercept, launched in late September '69 to cut down the supply of marijuana, had inspired Michigan grass smokers to seek out alternatives, initially opiated hash sourced from Canada, then cocaine, and finally heroin. Within a few weeks, even his fellow band members were calling Iggy a coke whore, after he started hanging out at a local dealer's, Mickey B, washing her dishes in the hope of scoring more white powder for free. So yeah, over that summer, the Stooges seemed untouchable. Major stories in Rolling Stone, Cream, and Entertainment World. On 30th of June in Cincinnati at the Summer Pop Rock Festival, the band reached their zenith, performing their Funhouse set at a peak of intensity. Iggy, who had taken to wearing a dog collar, which emphasised his blending of choir boy innocence with animalistic depravity, plunged into the crowd again and again in a glorious, exhilarating interaction. No performer had ever been this open, this confident, and singer and audience collaborated in an unforgettable event. Lifted above the crowd, Iggy laughs, sings, poses, and at one point takes a tub of peanut butter and throws its contents at the audience. Iggy had practiced this impossible feat at Cincinnati just a few months before, but now there were TV cameras present to prove this was real and not just a figment of overwrought fans' imaginations. Broadcast by NBC as Midsummer Rock at the end of August, a tantalisingly brief snippet of film just over 5 minutes in length remains the best record of the Stooges at their height. And you can find that on YouTube, because I found it on there. It's a brilliant little piece of live footage. It really just shows them at their manic best. It's really good. I think if you just search Midsummer Rock Stooges, it should come up. As if to seal that compact with their fans, the release of Funhouse in August would be the grand statement of the original Stooges. It would be one of the most uncompromising albums of the 70s, an assault on the senses that remains exhilarating today. The album sounded dense and claustrophobic, with Iggy's distorted vocals fighting to be heard above repetitive, almost funky guitar and saxophone riffs that would occasionally explode into thrilling climaxes. Where their debut was an all deadpan restraint, Funhouse was aggressive, outgoing, and at times almost expansive and cocky. For a group whose technical prowess was often derided, the musicianship was deft, spooky and gothic on Dirt, strutting and greasy on Funhouse, lame-brained and thuggish on 1970, which is one of my favourites of it, actually. 1970 is a wicked track. Today, Funhouse is the Stooges album most consistently cited by musicians, for instance Jack White of the White Stripes, who reckons, in my mind, Funhouse is the greatest rock and roll record ever made. I'll always feel that. Eventually, this music would spawn the dark gothic rock of Nine Inch Nails or Jane's Addiction, but for many contemporaries, Funhouse seemed to prove the Stooges were simply deluded. There was impassioned support from Cream's Lester Bangs, who wrote a huge feature on the album that was serialised over 2 issues and many others. Even industry Bible Billboard weighed in on their behalf, although the positive review must have irked the singer by crediting Steve Mackey and his magic saxophone as the leader. Even so, the album was generally reviled, in particular by the radio industry. Steve Harris, Senior Vice President in charge of marketing at Elektra, was a fan of the Stooges and pushed the record hard, but received an unequivocal reaction. "Oh my god, isn't Elektra a company of beautiful and wonderful and classy music? What are they doing with this?" The end would be swift, but not particularly merciful. There were several portents. The first came from the city of Ann Arbor, who in June 1970 served notice that Stooge Hall, the funhouse, would be demolished in a year to allow Eisenhower Parkway to be turned into a highway. The same month, Jimmy Silver was offered a job at a food company. He felt drawn to the challenge, believing the Stooges were now in a good position and that his old friend John Adams was well placed to take over, as I said a minute ago. The third attempt was Goose Lake, a hellish festival on 7th, 8th and 9th August 1970, which well and truly telegraphed that the 1960s were over. Most people who were there described the atmosphere as post-apocalyptic, like something out of Mad Max. Bill Cheatham, finally promoted to rhythm guitar, remembers the show as a blur. There was a huge amount of cocaine around. Bill Williams, a music fan, was working security and saw vendors openly dealing heroin from trays slung around their shoulders, as if they were cinema usherettes selling ice cream. Hell's Angels were dispensing a range of drugs from their bikes backstage. Roadie Dave Dunlap saw one boy who was so high he was picking up mud and eating it. Leo Beatty saw another kid fall from the PA stack, bounce on the ground, then get up and start dancing. The Stooges' performance was similarly on the edge, thanks to an order from the promoters that the singer was not allowed to dive into the audience. Williams and another 19-year-old security guard were ordered to restrain Iggy, and as the singer headed for the fence that separated him from the audience, they grabbed him by the arms and pulled him back. Iggy retreated to the stage, and as the Stooges' riffing rose to an almost psychotic intensity, started screaming, "Tear it down, tear it down." Williams was terrified. 200,000 people were there, and they were going nuts. They were ripping planks off the fence. We were trying to hold on to it. It was insane. At some point, no one seems to agree on when or how, Stooges' bassist Dave Alexander simply became overwhelmed by the spectacle and lost his place. Some say he lost the beat, others, including Iggy, say he forgot every song. The singer felt naked, exposed, and after the performance demanded that Dave was sacked. The others objected, according to Ron, then finally gave in. So the first of the Dum Dum Boys, as they were referring to themselves, was gone. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but at the same time, Jim Osterberg announced that his professional name was no longer Iggy Stooge. From now on, he would be known as Iggy Pop. So there's a line in the sand there where he becomes officially Iggy Pop in 1970. Some of the Funhouse residents thought that Dave's mess-up at Goose Lake was just a handy excuse, that Jim was irritated by Alexander's reclusiveness or even by his physical frailty. Years later, sitting outside his beautiful, peaceful house in Miami, the singer ponders his decision. "I've been reminded since that at one point I said, no, I won't work with Dave anymore on bass, and that the whole thing began to slide apart. But there I was out on stage and there was no bass. He just had a complete mental lapse, was too stoned, he didn't know what he was doing. And that's traumatic for somebody that I was serious." He goes, "I was serious about this shit." So there's sort of like a break, and then he says, "I was serious about it." So he continues, sadly, the group never had a focus after that. 11th of August, just as Alexander was being ousted by his old high school chums, Iggy was a guest on DJ Dan Carlisle's radio show. On the recording, the voluble, talkative Jim Osterberg is absent. You can hear Dan Carlisle losing the will to live as he attempts to extract a coherent sentence from the distant, uncommunicative Iggy Pop. There is a disturbing lassitude about him. The singer sounds flat, as if in the grip of depression. It's likely that Jim was already beset by drastic emotional swings, an affliction familiar to many musicians or artists who speed towards the deadline on an almost manic high, then hit a trough of despondency when the work is finished. I can relate. Those emotional swings were undoubtedly exacerbated by Iggy's ingestion of acid, hashish, and cocaine, and the latter was, as Iggy's close observer, writer Nick Kent points out, absolutely the worst drug for him. It sent him absolutely crazy. And the same thing would happen to David Bowie at a later date as well. A few days later in New York, another connection was made that would intensify the evil miasma that was gathering around the Stooges. So it kind of builds this portent of like a darkness building around the Stooges that would eventually bring about their demise. The demise of the band, anyway. The band was booked for Ongano's for a 4-night run in mid-August to showcase Funhouse, with roadie Zeke Zettner promoted to playing bass. When the band hit New York, their acting manager, The Fellow, which is John Adams, I believe, had a single obsession, scoring heroin. It was all Adams could talk about. Most of the junior Stooges with whom he hung out were unenthusiastic, but the fellow kept at it, telling them, no, you don't understand. This is the best high. Adams described the effects of heroin, saying, says Billy Cheatham, as if it was Coleridge. It was a place he wanted to be. Adams shared a room at the Chelsea Hotel with Steve Mackey, the saxophonist, and as the band checked in, there were twin drug obsessions. Iggy wanted cocaine, John wanted heroin. Chatting with Mackey, Adams told the sax player, a weird thing happened to me. I was standing on the corner waiting for a connection for junk, and I found one. That evening, John Adams returned to the loving embrace of heroin, sharing a snoot of his new haul with Steve Mackey. Meanwhile, Iggy approached Bill Harvey of Elektra and explained that if the Stooges were to perform, he needed $400 to buy cocaine. Although Harvey usually seemed hip to the presence of soft drugs, and is said to have had an official lawn-keeping allowance to purchase the other kind of grass, such effrontery was guaranteed to enrage him, and he was no fan of the Stooges. Reluctantly, Harvey handed over the $400, but although the band had the cash, their dealer was late. Showtime came and went. Finally, they decided they could wait no longer and made for the stage, only to run into the dealer on their way through Ongano's kitchen. Then it was zoom back to the dressing room, says Mackey, where the Stooges gleefully opened up a huge tinfoil package, snorting up a mountain of cocaine, before they finally hit the stage, hopelessly late. That night was, by most accounts, a good show, all glistening and sparkly, says Mackey, which featured lengthy improvisations, including a new song, Going to Egypt. A recently discovered tape of one of the Ongano shows sounds terrific. The following night's performances were apparently inspired too, memorable for more than just the sight of Iggy exposing himself. I'm going to skip some of this, but over the same period, the Stooges headlined over the MC5 in Asbury Park, went on last and demolished their one-time big brothers. But as Scotty Ashton puts it, the evening in New York finally woke up John's worm, as it were. And it was like a sledgehammer in the head, memories after that, because it was all downhill. All of a sudden, heroin was cool. In the autumn of 1970, heroin was starting to flood Detroit. As the MC5's leader, Wayne Kramer, points out, one day heroin was like some exotic jazz musician's drug, and the next day everybody could get it cheap. It was plentiful and it was potent. The MC5 succumbed to heroin just before the Stooges. For Wayne Kramer, it eased the pain of the awareness that MC5's career, their hopes and dreams were on the wane. For Jim Osterberg, heroin brought welcome ease. By the way, don't do heroin, kids. It's not good. Just saying, don't do it. I always felt, this is Iggy Pop, Jim Osterberg speaking, I always felt the group could work harder. I always felt it incumbent on me to do certain things for everyone, and there was a resentment. It became a weight, and a great excuse, and it's only an excuse. Honestly, there were tensions at that time. The amount of acid I was taking, things like this. It became a burden on the psyche, frankly. Heroin was a great way to calm down, and it was around. So his main excuse for taking heroin was that all the acid was kind of taking a toll on the psyche, so he took some heroin to calm it down. Not a good idea, guys. Just saying. In the early days of the Stooges, it had been Jim Osterberg who turned up for rehearsals and struggled to get his fellow Stooges out of bed. Now it was Ron who attempted to keep the band together, like a mother hen. In the grim heroin roll call, Adams and Mackey went first in New York. Then Adams had a package of heroin sent to the Funhouse, and Jim went next, following his first experience of mainlining back in San Francisco. Scotty and Bill followed, sniffing first, then skin popping, as it calls it, which means injecting, basically. followed at some point by Zeke. Inevitably, the band split into factions, with the Ashton brothers on opposing sides. It seemed that Ron was irrevocably sundered from his singer, and worst of all, his brother. There was no relationship, says Ron. Scotty was in the Iggy sphere. I was totally shut out and alone. So this is the beginning of like a kind of a fracture in the band, where like the two Ashton brothers, who were like a solid unit, are being split up by the drugs that, you know, Iggy and he are taking and that Ron isn't, and it just starts to get a bit fractured from here on in. When Jimmy Silver handed over the financial reins, with John Adams taking day-to-day control while Danny Fields oversaw operations from New York, there had been a healthy surplus in the Stooges' bank balance. Within a few weeks, the money was gone and the band was being paid in drugs. Instead of their weekly $50 in cash, Mackie and Zetner were given $15 plus a bag of weed and a dime bag of China white heroin. Mackie was not so stoned, however, to ignore that he, like Dave, was being ousted. But when the call came from Iggy Pop, it was a merciful release. There was never a job I ever wanted to be fired from more than that one, he says. I'd got to snort and smack every day for maybe 2 weeks. Then when I got frozen out of the band, I lost my connection. For about 2 months, I couldn't sleep through the night. I had these pains in my arms, so I went through a minor withdrawal. If they'd sacked me 2 months later, I'd have a full-blown habit. So it might have saved his life that he was kicked out. As it was, Mackie managed to persuade the Discount Records boss to give him his old job back. With Mackie gone, the funhouse was becoming a charnel house. Ron would turn up for the rehearsals and sit there alone and brooding. Sometimes on their mostly weekend gigs, the band would get paid in heroin. Occasionally the singer would flirt with danger by openly snorting heroin on plane flights. But Iggy was a good actor. When he got on the phone to Danny Fields, who was still attempting to oversee the Stooges while holding down a publicity job at Atlantic, he could always convince him that he was straight and change the subject to the new songs he was writing. And there were new songs, for as Iggy maintains, even as we were falling apart, we were coming up with great riffs. One such song, an anthem of dumb defiance, was I Got It Right, which is one of my favourites. Brilliant song. Anytime I want, it's just the lyric, anytime I want, I got it right to sing. It was one of Jim's first entirely solo compositions. That's if you don't count Doc, his incontinent parakeet, who sat on his shoulder as Jim worked out the tune. For a variety of reasons, most fundamentally that one of them was a junkie and the other wasn't, Ron and Jim's songwriting partnership was at an end. And sometime in November 1970, the man who would take Ron's place arrived on the scene. When you talk to the dozens of people who knew the Stooges in 1970, the word dark appears again and again. Often it describes the general atmosphere, often it describes a person. So the book kind of creates a... The thing is, I think you should take this with a pinch of salt, because it kind of discredits James Williamson, who became the next guitarist of the Stooges. And I think it does him a disservice a bit by making him sound like this dark cloud who came into the band. But actually, he created some amazing music with the Stooges and with Iggy as a writing partner, particularly. So when it says like the word dark appears, often it describes general atmosphere, often it describes a person, James Williamson, the hotshot guitarist who joined the Stooges just as they headed for self-destruction. And yeah, and people are sort of, it makes some comments that people made about like it being a bad idea, but I think it continued then, because who knows what would happen if he didn't join. And then it goes on. Before I read some more, let's mix it up by showing you a record, because obviously I've been doing this sort of bit by bit, this recording, but I reckon we're probably somewhere over a good hour now. So we talked about I Got It Right. So here, courtesy of my dad, who's given me some of his rare Stooges LPs, is I Got It Right. Now this record features songs by Iggy The Stooges recorded in 73 to 74 with James Williamson. Extracts from the and it talks about Kill City, which we'll go into later. So I'm showing you a little bit early, but I'm just trying to mix it up a little bit. So this has tracks. Some of them were Stooges, like I Got It Right was Stooges demos, and others are what would become Kill City, but we're going to get into that later. So there you go, first record, only an hour and something in, finally seeing a vinyl. But yeah, this is wicked. Got some cool shit on this. Okay, so let's talk about James Williamson then. James Williamson was intense, intelligent, talented and troubled. Born in Casterville, Texas on the 29th of October 49, James had lost his father at the age of 4. His mum remarried an army colonel who hated long hair and rock and roll. After moving to Detroit, James had briefly joined Scott Richardson's band, The Chosen Few, but then the colonel gave him an ultimatum: cut your hair or go to a juvenile home. A big fan of Bob Dylan, James did what he figured Bob would have done in the same situation and told the colonel to get lost. At the juvenile home, they cut all his hair off on the first day. James had been schooled in guitar by Oklahoma country musician Rusty Sparks, who'd invited him on his TV show. At the juvenile home, he was schooled in rebellion, and when he finally joined the Stooges, according to Scott, he was a wild, on-the-street, speed-shooting, guitar-playing maniac. In fairness, by the time James Williamson replaced Bill Cheatham on guitar, who reverted to his role as a roadie, every one of the participants in the Stooges psychodrama had a whole zoo full of monkeys on their back. For as Williamson points out, few of the people who found him so threatening ever got to know him properly. And with respect to the heroin usage, I got in the middle of the situation, I certainly wasn't leading it. Williamson accepts that he was an intense person who focuses on what he is doing at the time. To that degree, I was also pushing the band to do better, play better, be better. So if that makes me a villain, then so be it. I don't see it that way. And it was Iggy, desperate to find any way forward, who engineered Williamson's ascension to notoriety, spotting that the young Texan's psychotically intense guitar playing represented a new direction, and inviting Williamson into the band to play alongside Ron on guitar. Iggy had become frustrated with what he saw as Ron's laziness, which is, only Iggy's opinion. He would say later, but there were undoubtedly simpler pharmacological reasons for their growing estrangement, which is more likely the reason. Yet even in his narcotic fog, Iggy kept pushing, encouraging Williamson to work on a stuttering, vicious guitar riff that became the song Penetration, which is on what would become Raw Power. That Christmas, Iggy took a brief trip to Jamaica with a tape recorder, Framus bass, and a Moss-Wright guitar in an attempt to clean up and write an entire new repertoire. By the beginning of '71, Ron Ashton's alienation from the rest of the Stooges was increased when Scotty, Iggy, and James moved to University Tower, a newly built high-rise in the centre of Ann Arbor, which made a more convenient stop-off for the band's dealers. Ron says he was an outcast because I was not going along on the death trip. Zeke Zetner had now been sacked, replaced by Jimmy Wrecker, who'd played with James in The Chosen Few. Leo Beatty and Dave Dunlap had left back in December when no paychecks had materialised for Christmas presents and roadies with better drugs connections were recruited to replace them. It was all a bit cold on that side of things, with the roadies and that. While a penniless Ron and Jimmy Wrecker lived on vegetables grown in the Stooge Hall garden, his brother and the other band members lived out their rock and roll drug fantasies. Scott and James were now close buddies and shared a room on the 7th floor. Iggy was on the top floor, and it was cool, says Scott. We had a great time. We had 2 maids that came in once a week, both of them foxes, to clean the apartments. It was happening, man. We were on top of the world. Well, we weren't on top, but we were on the 7th floor, bro. It was cool. And we were both supporting habits. On his regular phone calls, Fields continued hearing glowing reports from the singer. Although it was uncool to address people's drug habits back then, Iggy had the knack of leaving Danny encouraged as he put the phone down. In truth, Iggy was, as his bandmates put it, a tough little son of a bitch survivor, overcoming disaster after disaster over the course of '71. He'd built up a lucrative heroin dealing business with Wayne Kramer. Kramer knew a source in Detroit, while Iggy provided the customers in the form of his heroin acolytes. Then one day Kramer returned from an MC5 tour to find the singer in the hospital, presumably recovering from an overdose. The heroin and the money were gone. Determined to wreak his revenge, Kramer enticed Jim to Inkster, a notoriously heavy area of Detroit, and told him to bring some cash. Then Kramer pulled out a gun, took the money, and left Iggy penniless and stranded, and wearing, some say, a pink tutu. It was a dark time, says Kramer, but that's what people with the mental disorder of drug addiction do. That's what Kramer says. Many times Iggy went into convulsions at other people's hangouts, including one near fatal overdose at the apartment of MC5 bassist Michael Davis. Then there was a gig at the East Town Ballroom in May when Scott was driving the equipment out of Ann Arbor and decided to drive the 12-foot high rental truck under a 10-foot railway bridge on Washington, just near University Towers, peeling the top of the van like it was a sardine can and smearing Scotty and 2 roadies over the road. I missed getting under that bridge by a clear 2 feet, laughed Scott. I hit that sucker so hard it wasn't until I was laying out on the road and stopped rolling that I realised what happened. With Scotty in hospital, the band called Steve Mackey to play drums in his place. So obviously like multi-instrumentalist Steve Mackey, because he was playing sax on the previous album. Struggling to master a new set with an unfamiliar drum kit, the sax player had to endure the drawn-out humiliation of Iggy Pop stopping in the middle of each song to complain about his drumming. Meanwhile, there's this hometown crowd, he says, and they're screaming, "Come on, Iggy, you effing junkie. Come on, let's see you puke." It sounds like a bad time, doesn't it? In some regards at this point. James Williamson points out that it was hard to distinguish my own chaos from that of the band, while sanguinely noting that the Stooges' desperate straits didn't preclude the presence of a constant stream of women. Eventually, Danny Fields had a moment of realization at a Chicago show in April '71. Iggy's supposed to be on stage and you're pulling a needle out of his arm and there's blood squirting in your face. Meanwhile, Alice Cooper and his band are adjusting their false eyelashes and powdering their noses in the same room. And I'm thinking, those Alice Cooper guys are not as good as this band, but they're pros. That was sort of the metaphor. Both bands are playing for $1,500, and there's one that looked poised for stardom and one poised for the floor of the bathroom. Some Stooges diehards enjoyed their final shows. Lee Black Childers, who was also involved in David Bowie's career, savoured the infamous performance at New York's Electric Circus in May '71, where Iggy looked particularly psychotic, covered in baby oil and glitter. Some of Danny's live recordings, too, show that when the band got their act together, they were still potent, the music based around incessant headbanging, high-energy guitar, and by now they had developed a set of all-new material, including songs titled You Don't Want My Name, Fresh Rag, and Big Time Bum. I've got to say I haven't heard any of those tracks, so I don't know if they ended up on a recording or not. Although Elektra Records were aware of Iggy's drug problems, Jack Holzman wrote to Danny Fields recommending a rehab clinic that had presumably been patronised by some of his other artists. Danny believed there was still a good chance that the company would pick up their option for another Stooges album. It was not to happen, but the decision had little to do with the band's collective smack habits. Instead, much of the responsibility for Stooges' sacking would not lie with heroin, but with the Third Reich, it says, which is Ron Ashton had a collection of Nazi memorabilia in his room. It's not fully explained why he was into that stuff in the book. But it comes up again and again, and it was one of the reasons for their being dropped from their label. As far as the Stooges were concerned, the man responsible for dumping the band from the Elektra label was Bill Harvey, arch enemy of Danny Fields. But in reality, the decision fell to another Elektra executive, who by supreme irony was also the producer who had nursemaided the band's greatest recording. For according to Don Gallucci, who went with Bill Harvey to listen to the Stooges' new material at the Funhouse, it was he who made the decision to reject the band. Today, Gallucci runs a successful real estate. Although he looks back on his production of Funhouse as one of the finest moments in his musical career. But in '71, the album was anything but a feather in his cap. Gallucci was, he explains, emotionally naive but politically adept. He was acutely aware that the album he produced with the Stooges had not troubled the Billboard Top 100. Yet he also knew no opprobrium attached to him for this failure. For the decision to press the button had been Jack Holzman's. But if Gallucci elected to produce the band a second time, the responsibility for failure would be his alone. When Don Gallucci and Bill Harvey arrived in Ann Arbor to audition the band's material, they were aware of the band's drug abuse, and the two of them took Steve Mackey for a drive to pump him for information about his bandmates, or ex-bandmates. Mackey was non-committal, and as Gallucci tells it, he had no conception that the Stooges were involved in anything worse than the hashish he had seen them smoke incessantly at the Elektra studio, so he covered for him. Gallucci didn't want to be out in Michigan, which he considered a godforsaken location, nor in a falling down farmhouse with a bunch of people with whom he felt little rapport. But he had to go through the niceties, and in any case enjoyed the company of Ron Ashton, whom he considered the most reach-out and PR savvy of the Stooges. Consequently, he was happy to join Ron on a tour of the Funhouse until they reached Ron's room, and this is what I was talking about. For Gallucci, the slick savvy exec in an expensive sports jacket was horrified by the Nazi uniforms, the books on concentration camps, the swastikas, lightning bolt logos, and the photos of atrocities he says he saw in Ron's living quarters. Shocked, he asked Ron why he was fascinated with the Nazis. Ron explained that when he was a child, Ann Ashton used to wash and then blow-dry his hair, says Gallucci. And then Ron said, in the noise of the dryer going whoosh, whoosh, I could hear voices going, "See Kyle." That just sounds crazy. Whether that's true, it's probably more likely to be part of a sick sense of humour, him saying that, but... So it says, yeah, and it says that what was perhaps typical Ashton black humour completely weirded Gallucci out, unsurprisingly. And then he sat down to listen to a couple of Stooges numbers played live in the Funhouse. James Williamson remembers Harvey and Gallucci being appalled by the music, but the producer maintains that while the music perhaps seemed derivative of their earlier material, That was the last thing on his mind. I thought I was in Nutland. I hated the whole Michigan middle of nowhere thing and I wanted to get out. And now we're going to do another album where the first one didn't make it. And I think I said some fairly unkind things in front of them to Bill Harvey, something like Cream is the London Philharmonic compared to these guys. Something really arsehole. Gallucci's abandoning of the Stooges' cause gave Bill Harvey ample justification for telling Danny Fields that as far as the new material went, I hear nothing. The label would forego its option on the Stooges' next album. More seriously, on 21st June, Elektra demanded the return of $10,825 that had been advanced to the band. According to Jim Osterberg, Jack Holzman was apologetic that things hadn't worked out and gave him a Nikon camera as a farewell present. But over the same period, Bill Harvey was writing to Danny Fields demanding that all the fees for Stooges' live performances be paid directly to Elektra to recoup their debts. Holzman, it transpired later, was interested in retaining the services of Iggy Pop as a solo artist, but the loss of all their income from live shows was the death sentence for the Stooges. The band failed to show at dates booked over late June and early July. Ron Scott and Jimmy Rucker played one last show at Wampler's Lake, enlisting Steve Richards from Riverview, Michigan, to sing in place of Iggy. Meanwhile, James, who had contracted a nasty case of hepatitis, went to recuperate at his sister's in Detroit. As his band finally splintered, Iggy was making plans with a junkie's deviousness. Although the band's Elektra bank account had been closed, Iggy would regularly walk over from University Tower to Discount Records, brandishing the band's checkbook. Steve Mackey, who was behind the counter, was suspicious, but Dale Watermolder, was the boss, was sufficiently starstruck by Discount's famous ex-employee, because obviously Iggy used to work there, to allow him to cash the check. For 10 days, Iggy kept returning, each time with a check for around $200, until finally the bank informed Watermolder that all the checks, over $2,000 in total, had bounced. A shamefaced Jim Osterberg finally came in with his father, who paid all his debts, saving his son from facing any criminal charges. So Jim moved in with Danny Fields, who was delighted to resume the "don't worry, I'll take care of everything" regime, to which they'd both become accustomed. They were both watching TV on 7th September 1971 when the phone rang. It was Lisa Robinson, the rock writer, who, with producer husband Richard, made up Max's hippest rock and roll couple. She told Danny, "We're here with David Bowie." "Oh, David Bowie," Fields drawled in reply. "He's the only person outside of the States who's ever heard of Iggy." Danny registered something about the fact they were on their way to Max's Kansas City and David wanting to meet Iggy before he dozed off again. Appropriately enough, David Bowie had discovered Iggy on his first trip to America the previous February when he'd alighted in San Francisco, according to writer John Mendelsohn, who'd been persuaded by a friend at Mercury Records to write a feature on the then unknown English singer. Mendelsohn felt protected towards this exotic, fragile creature, carrying his luggage and accompanying him to San Jose for a radio interview. After a brief, unenlightening chat with the disdainful hippie DJ, Bowie was asked to choose a record to play. Mendelsohn spotted a copy of the Stooges' debut album and suggested they cue up No Fun. Bowie was instantly amused. That December, he nominated Iggy as his favourite singer in Melody Maker. When he hit New York early in September, Bowie was absolutely intrigued by Iggy, according to Robinson, who was at the centre of this social nexus. The phone rang again. Again it was Lisa and Richard telling Danny they were waiting for him. Danny dragged Jim away from the TV movie he was watching, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, cajoling him, "Come on, he's been nice to us, we'd better be nice to him," and they stepped outside for the 4-block walk to Max's. Now, if you want a full account of Iggy Pop and David Bowie's collaborative career, as well as reading the book I've been reading from, you would be well advised to pick up this, David Bowie, A Life by Dylan Jones, which is like it's written in quotations, really, the whole story of David Bowie from start to finish by people who knew him. He's interviewed like a bunch, like 180, from 180 interviews he conducted. He builds through the story, the life of David Bowie, through people's quotes about different periods of his life. And it covers a lot of ground about him and Iggy as well. So that's another one worth reading. But to get back to this, no one could work the back room at Max's like Iggy. And when he walked in to sit down at a table with David Bowie, Tony DeFries, who was his manager at the time, and Tony Zanetta, with Richard and Lisa Robinson looking on, there was no doubt as to who was the high-voltage character. Iggy Pop was living like a cat, staying on couches across town, trying to kick heroin. His girlfriend had just split after being accused of stealing a prominent New Yorker's jewellery, which it talks about in the last chapter, but I've kind of glazed over because it wasn't really important to what we're talking about. And he was on top of the world. He walked into the room ready to impress, according to Tony Zanetta, who was sitting with DeFreeze. He knew they were waiting for him, and he was up for it. He was immediately entertaining. He practically did a tap dance there and then, was the quote from DeFreeze. For the first time, but not the last, Iggy Pop showed himself unbowed by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. In fact, he traded on his travails, turned them into his own narrative, one in which he was the indefatigable hero. The last time David Bowie had visited the US, he had been an apparently fragile creature travelling alone. This time he had an organisation with him in the form of Tony DeFreeze, a one-time solicitor's clerk, who boasted the brilliant improvisational management style to hit the Big Apple in years. DeFreeze had an acute mind and a fearless negotiation technique. He would go straight to the chief executive of whatever company he was dealing with, unintimidated by anyone's reputation, would score a great deal, and make the other guy feel good about it too. Earlier that evening, DeFreeze had blitzed through the social scene of New York, wining and dining RCA's executives at the Ginger Man restaurant, guided by the proprietors of all that was hip in New York. Writer Lisa Robinson and her husband Richard, the producer, who as A&R at RCA, too many acronyms, had brokered the deal with Bowie. At the Ginger Man, DeFreeze and Bowie had also met up with David's other American musical obsession, Lou Reed, and talked about a production deal. Because Bowie would end up producing albums not just for Iggy Pop, but he produced one for Lou Reed as well, Transformer, which he talks about in the other book. That night at Max's, David Bowie seemed low-key in comparison to Iggy and DeFreeze. He was sympathetic, curious, a good listener, very canny, self-possessed, and a not unkind person was Iggy Pop's first impression. David asked intelligent, incisive questions, drawing out the star-crossed singer in a manner that was almost innocent. In comparison, Iggy was the one who seemed more calculating, but that impression was counterbalanced by the fact he was so engagingly honest. He simply enjoyed charming people, as has been noted throughout the book and in the earlier part of his life as a kid at school as well. To Tony Zanetta, who'd met Bowie and DeFreeze while playing Andy Warhol in a London production of the play Pork a few weeks before, and had instantly been recruited to what would become the Main Man Circus, it seemed like David was trying to impress DeFreeze with this exotic, exciting creature, almost as if Iggy were a work of art the two could add to their collection. In retrospect, to many people, this meeting seemed calculated, a collaboration hatched via mutual exploitation. It would indeed profoundly affect the lives of both David Jones, who is David Bowie, and Jim Osterberg, who is Iggy Pop. In reality, there was an innocence about the encounter between the two 24-year-olds. So they were only 24 at the time, and they were like right in the zenith of their like creative abilities. One seemingly down and out, one on the way up. On Bowie's part, there was an almost naive enthusiasm, a fascination for rock and roll and theatre, and Iggy represented a one-stop shop for both of those interests. For Iggy, the main attraction was that of joining the circus and simply seeing where it would take him. So he readily agreed when DeFreeze and Bowie asked him to come round the next morning for breakfast at their 10th floor suite in the Warwick Hotel. The next morning, over one of DeFreeze's habitual drawn-out English breakfasts, he'd sit around half-dressed, smoking cigars, taking several phone calls at once. The manager made his pitch. Iggy's performance was as classic in its way as anything seen at Ungano's or the Electric Circus. DeFreeze was a tower of strength, an operator who left his audience in no doubt he could take care of business. Iggy was flip, entertaining, and knew instinctively how to trade on Bowie and DeFreeze's fascination with Americana, telling them how he grew up in a trailer park or describing his methadone treatment in minute detail. Bowie in turn discussed the music and how he could find Iggy a new backing band over in London. Even before DeFreeze was fully dressed, the manager guaranteed he could negotiate a new record deal, and Iggy agreed to sign to Gem, the management company for which DeFreeze handled business affairs. DeFreeze instructed Jim to return to Ann Arbor and continue his methadone treatments, and that he would be summoned when a record deal was imminent. Linking up with Bowie and DeFreeze was a risky throw of the dice. Bowie had enjoyed just one quirky hit single at this point, Space Oddity, which obviously we all now know is a massive hit in the UK, and star status in America for such an unconventional artist was anything but guaranteed. But there was an irresistible energy about DeFreeze, his love of showmanship, his conviction that he could beat the system, and a showman loves a showman. Ironically, at the end of September, Jim Osterberg was sent a letter from Bill Harvey, care of Danny Field, telling him that Elektra wanted to retain his services as a solo artist. Elektra's move was possibly a reaction to DeFreeze's interest in Iggy, but by the time Danny received the letter, it was irrelevant. Jim was back in Ann Arbor, plotting his main man career with James Williamson. Ron Ashton would hear the news just a few days later when he'd gone into town to see a Fellini movie, but ended up instead at a party for the SRC. His friends James and Jim were there, but they avoided talking to him. Later in the evening, he heard that Iggy had a new contract with David Bowie's people. He told his informant, "Someone take a shotgun and blow my head off," before walking home crying all the way. For Ron and many of his Ann Arbor buddies, Iggy Pop's abandonment of his high school friend was a cold-hearted betrayal which would take decades to erase. It would mark the point at which Iggy first became a solo singer rather than a member of a band. This move was partly inspired by Tony DeFries, who only dealt with singers. His plan was to build a studio of stars like MGM, and in this plan, musicians were expendable, mere technicians. For Iggy, dropping the Ashtons was simple pragmatism. He had a musical manifesto to advance. Still, one senses echoes of the ambitious child who dropped his elementary school pals when they'd outlived their usefulness. In the meantime, Jim and James plotted together. Iggy had not mentioned Williamson at September's breakfast meeting, but the two agreed that Iggy would go to work on persuading DeFries to bring over his new songwriting partner. So Iggy was still fully intent on working with James Williamson, who he'd only just brought in to the Stooges. Over that autumn, DeFries worked at fulfilling his guarantee. They would find Iggy a record deal, and his best prospect turned out to be Clive Davis at Columbia. Davis was well on his way to becoming a legend in the American music industry. He had doubled Columbia's market share with a raft of new signings, including Santana and Janis Joplin, and would later go on to found Arista Records. It was an easy sell. Iggy was well known in New York, and the notion perhaps broached by DeFries that Clive Davis could succeed where Jack Holzman had failed appealed to the Columbia boss's ego. DeFries sent Jim a plane ticket to New York so that Davis could meet Iggy in person. Iggy would dine out frequently on his description of how he won over Davis, recounting it thus: "David, will you do Simon and Garfunkel? Pop, no I won't. Davis, will you be more melodic? Pop, no I won't. Davis, will you do what anybody asks you to? Pop, no I won't, but I can sing, wanna hear?" At which Iggy sprawled over David's desk crooning "The Shadow of Your Smile," which seems to be a recurring theme actually, that he would croon this song, "The Shadow of Your Smile," that he probably heard when he was a kid, with his dad listening to like Sinatra and stuff on the radio. Iggy maintains that at that moment Davis called his legal advisors and told them to draw up the paperwork, but according to Zanetta, who was present, the meeting was a formality. This wasn't Iggy the operator on high voltage. When we walked in, it felt like it was a done deal already, that it had already been sorted between DeFries and Clive Davis. So again, it's a bit of he said, she said in this book that you have to kind of take with a pinch of salt and make your own kind of mind up about what you think is more likely. The Columbia advance, which was for Iggy Pop alone, with no mention of the Stooges, was widely quoted as totaling $100,000, but this was typical DeFries grandstanding, for that figure was almost certainly an advance against several albums. Over the next couple of days, Zanetta babysat Iggy in the Warwick Hotel while DeFries attended to other business. Although DeFries wasn't particularly interested in Iggy's music, he focused on emphasising his star quality and gave Zanetta $500 to take the singer out and buy him a pair of silver leather pants DeFries had spotted uptown at North Beach Leather. Then the two sat around for a couple of days in a suite at the Warwick before DeFries concluded his business and was able to spend more time with Iggy. It was probably during this trip that Iggy persuaded his manager to let him bring James Williamson, the only man who understands me, on his trip to London early the next year. So, in 72, in the spring, James Williamson and Iggy go to London. London in the spring of 72 was thrilling, sleazy, glamorous, and stoned on mandrax and hashish. David Bowie and Mark Bolan were together sprinkling the final touches of fairy dust to what would become glam. The charts were also full of the pompous college whimsy of outfits such as Jethro Tull, while in the clubs, bands like the Pink Fairies and Hawkwind purveyed trippy but tough hippie rock. A new boy on the scene, Iggy Pop, walked the streets convinced he was better than any of them. New Musical Express writer Nick Kent, who had been in awe of the Stooges ever since he'd heard their debut album on John Peel's BBC Radio 1 show, wangled an introduction to his hero and realised that Iggy's sense of self-belief was staggering. There he was, walking around London, working out his plan to take over the world. He's one of those people. He believed he had this manifest destiny to throw his shadow across the world on a major level. It seemed appropriate that James Williamson, rather than the sweet, laid-back Ashtons, would become Iggy's accomplice for his new assault on the unsuspecting music industry. Like Iggy, James had become even more intense since the dying days of the Stooges and was determined to leave his own imprint on the world. Tall, thin, pale-skinned and black-haired, with scars from childhood acne, James reminded a few people of Keith Richards' more evil, more manic twin. He wasn't the product of a warm, loving environment, but he would get his own back. He had no track record, but was hell-bent on building one. So they're both like real ambitious guys, basically, at this time. Iggy and James were roomed together at the Kensington Gardens Hotel, a sprawling stucco-fronted Victorian building set in a leafy West London square. They spent their time writing songs, chasing girls, or watching TV with equal intensity. On a couple of occasions, they were invited to David and Angie Bowie's Gothic headquarters in Beckenham, just outside London. Jim was impressed with Bowie's eclectic arts lab style operation. Angie was also somewhat taken with James Williamson, although as time went on, she'd come to resent Iggy's demands on DeFree's time and, as she saw it, David's money. Occasionally, James and Jim would drop into parties or gigs, surveying London's counterculture with general disdain, loftily dismissing most musical rivals apart from Mark Bolan. Back in the hotel, Williamson would sit in their room, continuously spitting out riffs on his Gibson B25 acoustic guitar, a six-string stream of consciousness. When he hit on something memorable, he'd play it to Jim for his approval, and together they'd work it into a song. As always, Jim, the boy with a knack for a memorable phrase, seemed adept at crafting arresting lyrics, although over this period his style changed, becoming perhaps more conventional, but certainly more intense, with more powerful imagery packed into every line. David Bowie was true to his word, calling around London's leading rhythm sections and asking them to audition for Iggy. Often, like Pink Fairy's drummer Twink, they would call up and be told the vacancy had already been filled, for as far as Williamson in particular was concerned, no English rhythm section was aggressive enough. Early in '72, ex-child actor Michael DeBar was preparing his own grandiose rock and roll project, Silverhead, at the subterranean Kings Road rehearsal complex, ACM, when he encountered Iggy in the studio corridor. With bare-faced effrontery, Iggy asked him magisterially, "Do you want to watch my rehearsal?" DeBar walked into the damp, dingy studio with old Pink Fairy's posters peeling off the wall, and was dazzled by the sheer noise and spectacle. It was truly a life-changing moment. He was standing there in jeans, no shirt. He grabbed the microphone. Then this raw, this three-dimensional noise hit me. Where London's decadent cliques affected a kind of Edwardian dandyism, to DeBar this was a much tougher spectacle, delivered with unprecedented oral brutality. They made everything else sound effete. DeBar was just as taken with the image of James Williamson, who was determined to make his mark. He was an unbelievable guitar player. Williamson, according to most who met him in London, was more openly arrogant than his singer. According to Jim, it was Williamson who invariably objected to the musicians Bowie suggested, telling the singer, "These English people wear funny clothes, they're not serious musicians, there's no groove." By now, David Bowie's career was taking off in the wake of Hunky Dory, and DeFreeze was maddeningly distracted, branching out with his own artists, principally Bowie, to launch Main Man, a DeFreeze-owned offshoot of Gem, in which Gem owner Lawrence Myers retained a slice of the turnover. But by the early summer, Main Man were planning a showcase performance for all their acts, with Iggy Pop playing back-to-back with Lou Reed's first performance in London. And it was James's idea, fatefully, to reunite the Stooges by bringing Ron and Scott Ashton over to London. James had been close to Scott. They had been, after all, drug buddies at University Tower, and was taken with his musicianship, if not his brother's. Then I suggested that Ron get moved to bass, says Williamson, so this is where there's sour grapes about it from Ron's perspective, but at the time he was damn happy to have a job. So this is kind of an important thing that happened in the Stooges. So while James and Iggy are in London, the Ashton brothers get flown over to basically reform the Stooges under this new contract that Iggy is under as a solo artist, technically. But the Stooges are still going to be his band. So that's where it becomes Iggy and the Stooges, rather than just the Stooges. And as it said there, Ron gets demoted to bass, which he kind of has sour feelings about, as he was the main guitarist and riff maker up until that point. But at the same time, he is still in the band and an integral part of it. So that's where they're at this point. The demotion of Ron Ashton from guitar to bass would be devastating for the one-time lead guitarist of the Stooges. "It was chump city for me and my brother. We were reduced to being sidemen in our own band," he says. Yet it would also kickstart a period of hectic creativity. On 6th June, Ron and Scott were flown over from Detroit. Scott brought his own supply of toilet rolls, convinced there was a shortage of them in London. For all their misgivings about London plumbing and band politics, the Ashton brothers loved being in the city. The band borrowed Lawrence Myers' house in Little Venice, which was of course eventually trashed, and by the end of the month were rehearsing feverishly at Underhill Studios in Greenwich, a favoured venue for Gem's acts as it was en route to the Bowie's Beckenham HQ. Lou Reed was rehearsing his own new band, The Tots, in the studio the same month, while the Spiders from Mars, Bowie's band, were also preparing their July shows. London band England's Glory, who I'd never heard of until I read this, were rehearsing in the adjacent studio, and drummer John Newey was struck by this unknown band. You knew they weren't English, says Newey. No English rhythm section was as aggressive as that. They were playing with such intensity, the same super heavy riffs played again and again, getting it down perfect. The night before Iggy's first ever show outside of the USA, Lou Reed made his London debut at the same venue, King's Cross Cinema. James and Iggy went to see their rival, whose show was attended by Roxy Music and other members of the Glamourati. Lou was clearly out of it on tranquilizers or alcohol or some combination thereof. Iggy and James could be seen snickering at each other, especially the moment when Lou's sequin trousers started to fall down. James was nudging Iggy and Iggy looking at James, and they pointed to it, says Nick Kent. It was, "Ha ha, Lou, you aren't so cool. We're going to kick your ass." So Nick Kent says. It's just a bit of kind of like, I guess, like, kind of band-to-band sort of competition, I suppose, like that. Iggy Pop made his public debut the following night, 15th July 1972. In keeping with main man's concentration on stars rather than bands, the billing read Iggy Pop x Iggy and the Stooges, interestingly. Cream's Dave Marsh was one of several writers who'd been flown over to see Bowie's Aylesbury show in a pioneering main man propaganda operation, and managed to watch Iggy too. He'd seen the old Stooges, but found this performance in the black-painted theatre that had been recently converted from a sleazy porn venue far more dark and forbidding. All the things that I never took seriously in my id were coming to life, and there was no Buffy in sight to slay the vampires, he says. The show left many onlookers shaken, disturbed, or inspired. Mick Rock, who was then just starting out as a photographer, had to track the singer in his silver leather pants and silver hair like he was chasing a big cat over its home territory. He was stunned by the attitude and physicality of the singer and the sheer rawness of the sound. The crowd was smaller than that for Lou, but possibly more influential. A 16-year-old boy called John Lydon attended with his friend John Gray. Mick Jones, later a founder of The Clash, thought... So that was, by the way, that was obviously John Lydon from the Sex Pistols was influenced by this show. And Mick Jones of The Clash. Basically all of what would become the punk bands of like the 80s were watching Iggy and the Stooges in the 70s. So Mick Jones, later a founder of The Clash, thought the full-on quality of the Stooges was great, like flamethrowers. Music industry press officer Richard Ogden was contentedly observing the show from his seat in the balcony when suddenly Iggy climbed up and deposited himself in his lap, pulling Ogden's hair, bellowing into the microphone and splattering sweat and melted makeup over his mortified victim as London's journalists giggled at Ogden's discomfort. Which is just another typical like Iggy and the crowd participation kind of thing. Iggy always jumps in the crowd. Williamson's guitar playing was rough in places, but Nick Kent, for one, felt that this was the most cataclysmic show he'd ever seen. A lot of new genres were created that night musically. One song was the first time I ever heard what became known as thrash metal. This was where I understood what rock and roll was all about, because it simply dripped from their fingers. 2 days after the King's Cross performance, the Stooges went into London's Olympic Studios with engineer Keith Harwood to record more rehearsals. Together with other early demos from Trident Studios and tapes from R&G Jones Rehearsal Studio, where they'd start at midnight and play until dawn, they'd document a period of insistent creativity and a sound that was profoundly different from the previous Stooges. Any vestiges of art rock or the avant-garde were gone, replaced by a more conventional but infinitely more aggressive bug-eyed guitar assault. At times the recordings simply dissolve into white noise as Williamson's Wagnerian rumble drowns out Iggy on songs like I Got It Right, which I showed you the record of that one. Psychotically intense, taken at a dizzying pace, the song vindicated Nick Kent's assertion that he'd witnessed the birth of thrash metal. On other songs, the music is simple and sweet, notably Sick of You, a croon dissection of Iggy's relationship with his girlfriend Betsy, set over limpid arpeggios that lull the listener into a false sense of security before the sucker punch of Williamson's rattling power chords launch a nasty rant that makes the Rolling Stones Under My Thumb sound sensitive and retiring. The recordings, magnificent as they are, capture the work of someone almost literally manic, obsessed with being faster, louder and treblier than any magnetic tape could capture, an impression Jim Osterberg would bear out recently, pointing out how my insanity bar was raised so high at that point that nothing sounded bent enough, ever. For the other Stooges, those early days in London were comparatively idyllic. Ron, for all his change in role, felt blissful that the band was reunited, and spent much of his time wandering around Lambeth's Imperial War Museum. Scott recalls an eclectic drugs regime, which included the odd grain of pure brown heroin, the strongest, best I ever had, he says, beer, hash, mandrax, quaaludes, and Valium. According to Ron, Williamson also appreciated the fact that in the UK, codeine was available over the counter. Many times they would call a limo to take them down to DeFreeze Gunther Grove apartment to hang out. The studio flat, with its impressive mezzanine and inevitably colourful inhabitants, was the centre of the main man empire, which by now included Mott the Hoople, Dana Gillespie, and Wayne County. But the main man circus, for all its flash, was a slow-moving operation. In January, David had unveiled his Ziggy Stardust persona. The fact that this grandiose rock superhero was openly based on Iggy was flattering, as was the fact that Ziggy had attempted to emulate his hero by walking on his audience's hands at Imperial College in February, only to tumble to the floor. So that makes direct reference to the fact that for all, for as big an icon as like the Ziggy Stardust image became, it was based on Iggy's presence, which is, I think, quite important to remember, that like Iggy has been the forefather of so many different things, like musical genre-wise and image-wise as well. But as the Ziggy Stardust album started to take off following its 6th of June release, it was obvious that this fictional creation was occupying all DeFreeze's attention, Tony DeFreeze, that is, much to the resentment of the real people left standing in the wings. Today, Angie Bowie attributes cynical motives to her then-husband's championing of Iggy. If he had all the people that were cool, then did that not make him more cool than the most cool? Yeah. Many others credit Bowie with a more sincere respect for Iggy's music, but by now the Ziggy bandwagon had a momentum of its own, and the Stooges, for better or worse, were left to their own devices. Mainman director Hugh Atwell block-booked London's rehearsal studios for them, but there was a limit on how much time they could spend rehearsing, and for a group of characters devoted to watching midnight TV screenings of Night of the Living Dead, the British way of life, notably the fact that television shut down at 10:30, seemed cruel and inhuman. Those who first met the Stooges in June found them chipper and optimistic, but Nick Kent, one of Jim and James's few regular visitors in the early days, noticed that even though the two had kicked serious drugs, Jim would talk about his heroin days, James would too, and there was a longing in the way that they addressed the subject. Kent sensed an inevitability that Iggy would follow that route again, and he would be proved right. In July, Angie Bowie was allotted the task of finding the Stooges a new home, and selected a Muse house at 19th Seymour Way in Kensington, 5 minutes from Mainman's office, which belonged to novelist and screenwriter Frederick Raphael. Angie also demonstrated her efficiency by managing to recruit a maid who was also an expert macrobiotic cook. On the summer afternoons, Iggy would walk around Hyde Park in shades, wearing his leather jacket with the cheetah on the back, reading magazines. During one such ramble early in September, after he noticed the Time magazine features headlined "Search and Destroy," Iggy snorted several rocks of Chinese brown heroin and decided the phrase would make a great song title. The song's inspiration was the search and destroy missions of the Vietnam War, which was constantly in that summer's headlines. Ironically, the subject of the article was the global depredations of heroin. The lyrics featured as its narrator and hero a street-walking cheetah with a heart full of napalm. The phrases perfectly fitted a scything James Williamson riff worked up at R&G Jones. It was the perfect manifesto, the war cry of the world's forgotten boy. But the subtext was obvious to the Stooges singer, if no one else. Search and destroy missions were a notorious failure. For all his bravado, Jim Osterberg felt his new venture was doomed. "I knew we were going down, and I knew no one was going for this," he murmurs today matter-of-factly, because there were all sorts of weaknesses. The lyrics to Death Trip are my way of saying, I know what is happening to us, I know what we're doing, here's why, and I'm going to sing about it. So again, this is my dad's copy, but it's Iggy and the Stooges, Raw Power. One hell of an album. You have to forgive the condition of the back. This was in a garage that got somewhat drenched in the water from the gutter and messed up a lot of my record covers. Thankfully, not many of the actual records. I also have the more modern mix on CD as well, and it is a brilliant album. It's just, when I first heard this, I think I was about 19 years old when I first heard this, and I was just blown away. There's not anything else like it. This is all you can really say. Is this, I'm sure there's much more in-depth theses on this album, but it's you have to listen to it to get it, really. It's one of those. When Iggy first arrived in London, David Bowie had offered to produce what would have been his solo debut, which he later did. But Iggy had declined the collaboration for now, which might well, as with Mott the Hooples, Bowie penned All the Young Dudes, have yielded a hit. Although he later yielded lots of hits for Iggy, so he didn't miss out in the long run. Instead, Iggy had insisted on producing the album himself along with Williamson. Today, Williamson concludes the insistence was probably a mistake. The two of them, for all Iggy's claims that he, rather than John Cale or Don Gallucci, had produced the band's first two albums, were inexperienced in the studio and overlooked many basic errors and sonic glitches. But from the moment the session started on 10th September at CBS's studio on Whitfield Street, just under London's sparkling futuristic post office tower, the entire band were focused on their task and worked doggedly to ensure that, even if this war was their last chance, they would go down fighting. In retrospect, it's apparent that with the album that became Raw Power, Iggy and the Stooges were attempting to stick to certain conventions. Unfortunately, for their commercial prospects at least, they were simply incapable of doing so. The album follows a completely formulaic structure. See, I have to admit, this book at times says negative things about stuff that I actually think is brilliant, like this book. I'm not going to get into his solo albums in this book, in this video. But there's some of the albums that it really pans that I actually really enjoyed. So it is like, a lot of it you have to take with a pinch of salt and just be like, well, actually, listen to them rather than take someone else's word for it is the answer. But yeah. The album follows a completely formulaic structure suggested by Tony DeFries, up-tempo opener for each side, followed by a more romantic ballad. So let's actually look at that then. So up-tempo opener for each side, so I guess we're looking at Search and Destroy. Actually, the record will give me a better idea of what was... Yeah, so Search and Destroy on the first side, Raw Power on the second side, both brilliant songs. And then, what does it say? So, followed by a more romantic ballad. So you got Gimme Danger, amazing song. And I Need Somebody on the second side. Again, another brilliant song. Then a classic rocker. So you got Your Pretty Face Is Going to Hell, originally told Hard to Beat. And on the other side, Shake Appeal, which used to be something else, I think. It's on the other recordings that I've got in the other records of theirs, sort of demo rehearsal recordings. Because instead of like Shake Appeal, I used to say Hey Lucille on the intro. But yeah, that's obviously when they worked up to become a different song. And then a moody, significant closing number, such as Penetration on the first side and Death Trip on the second side. But yeah, just that whole track listing, just an amazing album. Many elements were far more conventional than anything from the band's first two albums, that at least is true. 12-bar blues form, rockabilly references and chugging riffs that bore the influence of Mark Bolan. But for all that, the Stooges remained deliciously warps. Their romantic song Gimme Danger was based on a luscious, intricate, Stonesy guitar riff, but the lyrics detail how Iggy wanted to feel your disease. One song's glammy strut resembles T-Rex, but where Bolan's chorus went get it on bang a gong, Iggy's lyrics informed his girl that your pretty face is going to hell, while his vocal performance is simply deranged. Opening side 2, Raw Power, is introduced with a belch before James Williamson's exquisite sledgehammer guitar makes its entrance. The album's closing song, Death Trip, sketches out Iggy's past and his future in an almost documentary fashion. I'll stick you, you'll stick me, we're going down in history. This was music from people on the edge. Bolan or Bowie were happy with a veneer of decadence to update a musical structure based on the Yardbirds and vaudeville values shared with Lionel Bart, the composer of Oliver, another DeFries client. The Stooges were decadent right through to their sweet Midwestern hearts. And that is the difference for them. They were the real deal. By 6th October, Raw Power was finished, only for nothing to happen. Because I always assumed that record was a hit right from the off, but it took ages for it to actually become a cult-followed record that's now seen as like one of the greatest of all time. On 10th September, David Bowie had sailed for New York on board the QE2. He'd famously become terrified of flying after his plane ran into an electrical storm on the way back from Cyprus in December 71. Tony DeFries flew over a few days later to oversee Bowie's tour from the main man New York office, which had been set up, literally including painting and decorating, by Tony Zanetta. Jim flew over to Detroit in pursuit of Bowie and was met by Lee Childers, who'd been co-opted into the main man operation as a photographer, manager, and babysitter, and given the title Vice President, Main Man USA. A few days later, after visiting Jim's parents and rendezvousing with Bowie, who was playing Detroit's Fisher Theatre, Lee and Jim flew to Los Angeles to stay with Bowie and his entourage, who were all ensconced at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Jim arrived, the stress of recording well behind him, looking bright-eyed, blonde-haired, happy, and on a healthy vegetarian diet. He was different from the early days, more self-sufficient, less wide-eyed. He was calm and optimistic, but it wouldn't last, says that chapter. Also, while we're on the subject, I'll show you another one this is another one of my dad's records. This is The Stooges' Rubber Legs, which is a fan club record, and it's basically got tracks again like the I Got a Right record. It says these tapes are studio rehearsals recorded in 73 and 74 between Raw Power and Kill City, and it basically has songs on it. Again, a couple that were just that are Stooges demos that didn't make an actual official album, although I think a couple of them, like Open Up and Bleed and Cock in My Pocket, Head on a Curb, made Metallic KO, which is their last live album, which I don't have, unfortunately. Which I really should have, actually. I will get it at some point. I've listened to it, obviously, but I've not got my own copy of it. So yeah, that's another record from the collection. In their short, messy career, the Stooges had been assailed by many perils. They'd survived ridicule and hostility, but they couldn't handle being ignored. So they went crazy, like bored suburban housewives stranded in a swanky house high up in the Hollywood Hills. The first clue to what would happen when employees dropped off the main man radar came with the fate of the remaining Stooges. Before Jim had flown off in search of Bowie, the remaining Stooges were told to keep rehearsing, and then were simply abandoned. For a couple of days they trucked down to subterranean rehearsal studio in Blackheath before deciding to stay home and get high. Frederick Raphael's tasteful muse home was trashed. Hugh Atwell had to placate the irate author about the fag burns and unidentifiable stains on the carpets before Angie Bowie took pity on them and flew them back to Ann Arbor on RCA's dollar. She and James briefly became lovers. In Ann Arbor, Angie Bowie met the SRC's Scott Richardson, became enamored of him and took him back to England. A few days later, the Stooges followed their singer to Beverly Hills Hotel, where James was just in time to drop in on Jim and David Bowie, who were mixing Raw Power at Western Sound in Hollywood. In the years to come, Bowie and Iggy would engage in public sniping about Bowie's mix of Raw Power. Iggy, down and nearly out a couple of years later, would allege that he sabotaged his album that Bowie did. Bowie himself would mock Iggy's production technique, maintaining that of a 24-track master, just 3 tracks were used, one for Iggy's vocal, one for James's lead guitar, and the remaining one of the band, all mixed together. Without a doubt, Bowie's version of events was closer to the truth. Both the pre-Bowie mix and Iggy's own remix of 1997, which I believe is the version on the CD I've got, bear the same murky, confused imprint, with Ronan Scott's bass and drums submerged under a wall of battling guitars and vocals. By any conventional standards, the eventual results were a mess. As Cub Coda points out, no one could work out how, even if you took that much drugs, a record could sound that bad and still get released. But it's awesome, man. It's an awesome record. The Stooges' debut had been a masterpiece of minimalism and simple eloquence, like a Picasso squiggle on neatly framed white paper. Raw Power was, in comparison, a sprawling, abstract, expressionist canvas with sound splattered over every square inch, which is a brilliant description of it, actually. Raw Power would be the album that, more than any other, defined the inarticulate assault of punk rock, its raw excitement deriving both from the wealth of ideas and the confusion with which they were expressed. Bowie's mix, a touch of delay from an exotic device called the time tube, the sudden emphasis on shouted backing vocals, added a quirky edge to that confusion, which in hindsight was as much as anyone could have done, says James Williamson. I could never stand the guy personally, he says, but I wouldn't hold it against him. I was one of the people saying I didn't like the mix, but in retrospect it was actually a good job. By now the pressure was telling on Bowie too, for he had to squeeze the 3-day remix into a punishing live schedule, with dates dotted apparently randomly across the US right through until 10th of December, when he sailed back to England on RHMS Elitness. His trip was fruitful, both the huge press interest, which established the foundations for future superstardom and the inspiration he gained for his next album, Aladdin Sane, including Panic in Detroit, inspired by Jim's stories of the 1967 Detroit riots, and the tale of the screaming and bawling Genie, who was based partly on Bowie's increasingly troublesome protege, so again influenced by Iggy while he was around him, to then use his influence on the next thing he would release. With Bowie and DeFreeze gone, RCA eventually bridled at the huge hotel bills being run up by the Stooges, and the band was given its marching orders. Rumbled, DeFreeze ordered Lee Black Childish to find a place where Iggy and the band can live, an apartment, because we're going to open up Main Man's West Coast office. Childish started searching for a suitable location, Iggy telling him, "If I'm to rehearse, I need a swimming pool. I can't write without a pool." Thinking to himself, well, this is California, Childish went to view several apartment complexes, only for Iggy to point out that this would create problems with noise. Finally, the singer upped the ante such that Jim himself located a spacious 5-bedroom house on Torreyson Drive, rented for $900 per month. By Christmas, Jim, James, Ron, Scott, and Lee were happily established in the sprawling low-rise building atop the Hollywood Hills, from which they could see the twinkling lights of Los Angeles spread out below. Each stooge had his own room, while Childish could monitor comings and goings from his bedroom over the garage. The pool at the rear of the house was the centre of most of the social activity. For 5 years now, Iggy had forged on, often distracted, often confused by a haze of hashish, acid, or heroin. He'd still maintained the drive that sustained him from the very first days of the Stooges, when he'd taken the early bus from the trailer park to rouse Ron and Ashton from their slumbers. Now, with an album ready for release, Raw Power, and a new set ready to be unleashed on an audience, he was forced to sit and do nothing. Many evenings Jim would talk late into the night with Childish, analysing his predicament. It was impossible to know for sure whether he was being pampered or punished. In the early days, DeFreeze had appealed to Iggy and James's natural arrogance, make yourself unavailable, make yourself mysterious. But that cover story was now becoming less and less plausible. In the meantime, the Stooges threw themselves into rehearsing at Studio Instrument Rentals, a huge complex on Santa Monica Boulevard, where Lee had negotiated a cut-rate deal from the starstruck management. Day after day, they would step in the Mayman Cadillac for the 15-minute drive down Mulholland, spending hours rehearsing on the 6-foot-high stage in front of a huge mirror as Iggy and James directed their efforts. Poignantly, for a band who would eventually be celebrated as born losers, their work was unstinting. Even while their existing album languished in limbo, they worked towards a new one, before emerging in the evening and wandering down to Rodney's English Disco, a couple of minutes away on Sunset, for a little R&R. Over the spring of '73, they continued piecing together songs like Head on the Curb, based around an intricate riff lifted from The Doors' LA Woman, and Cock in My Pocket, a fast Eddie Cochran-style number that, with its salacious lyrics and traditional blues structure, may well be the only Stooges composition obviously indebted to Bowie and the Spiders. Later came Joanna, a song about Iggy's main girlfriend, with whom he was involved in a bizarre heroin menage a trois, and Open Up and Bleed, the name of this book, a dark and sombre epic. The song's conversational delivery paralleled the Stones' sympathy for the devil, but where Mick modelled himself on Satan, Jim was playing Jesus. In earlier interviews, Jim had already compared his audience to the first Christians, the world's downtrodden. Now his message seemed even more overtly messianic, that he was offering himself up as a sacrificial victim in the belief that his music would somehow endure. But if Jim Osterberg really felt doomed, he felt little self-pity at his predicament. If he did get maudlin, it was when he was drinking, says Childish, but it was never why me, it was about the world being messed up. As the weeks went by, the Stooges household took on a warped little routine of its own. From his apartment over the garage, Lee watched as the scene came to resemble a Hollywood movie set, with teenage girls running round, visitors being thrown in a pool, a motley assortment of drug dealers and teenage runaways, coming and going in flash cars. Ron and Scott's demotion to mere sidemen by now seemed to absolve them of any responsibility for their singer, and many times they would look on indifferently as Iggy floated motionless in the pool. Lee Childish realised it was down to him to rescue Main Man West Coast premier star, drag him out of the pool, and ensure he was breathing. It happened so often over those 12 weeks that Lee learned to swim in the process. By March, rumours of the band's increasingly debauched behaviour were getting back to Main Man's New York office. Cherry Vanilla, who was kind of like the main person there, like, I can't really describe what her role was. She's mentioned in that Bowie book a lot, but she's kind of like not just receptionist, but like main go-to person, like PR. She's covered a lot of bases for Main Man. She started to get suspicious about incessant requests for money to buy new equipment and other vague expenses. When Wayne County dropped by, with even his extensive knowledge of excess gained in the back room at Max's, he found the situation surreal. Before Wayne arrived, Lee briefed him, "Whatever you do, don't bring any drugs. Don't give Iggy money. Don't give him alcohol. Don't give him anything." Iggy's fellow Stooges apparently believed that his increasingly erratic behaviour derived from his craving for attention. Reassuringly, he could still keep his act together in the rehearsal studio. But Nick Kent, Jim's confidant from London, wangled his way over to Los Angeles to interview his hero in the middle of March and was shocked at what he saw. Physically, Iggy seemed in the best of health, tanned, with centre-parted bleached hair, looking like a Californian Brian Jones. But Kent observed Iggy going into crazy states, and it wasn't even the quantity of drugs he was taking. Sometimes it would take just one quaalude to completely bend his mind, and other times he'd take 20 and they'd do nothing to him. He had a nervous system that had been shot, and he'd never taken the time to mend it. Several people who hung out with Iggy on Sunset share the same memory of watching him lost in his own reflection in the mirror at Rodney's English disco, coiling and uncoiling like a snake wrapped in a narcissistic dream, or adrift on planet heroin. Jim's mental state was plainly careening out of control, and no one close to him was immune to the effects of his alarming mood swings. But there was one segment of his life that Jim still seemed to hold inviolable: the music. Sometime in February, he had called Bob Sheff, pianist from the Prime Movers, who was now teaching at a music college in Berkeley, to ask him to augment the Stooges lineup, adding a rootsy edge with his blues piano stylings. He was to be ready for the band's Detroit homecoming on 31st of March, the first of a projected three or four shows. They spent a long time chatting, overlooking Errol Flynn's house, and Jim was plainly ambitious about his music, even as he talked dreamily of the temptations of heroin. Throughout March, the band worked intensively in SIR. On some songs, they were obviously attempting to move the music in precisely the opposite direction of Jim's original musical manifesto, towards heavy blues rock, evidence of a readiness to experiment or perhaps desperation. Jim was excited about the forthcoming release of Raw Power, so it was finally getting released after all this just stagnancy of nothing happening with it. Taping tapes of his earlier mix to WABX for the Detroit radio station to give the album its first public airing. By 18th March, Jim and the band were back in Ann Arbor, rehearsing at the recording studio on Morgan Road that the SRC had sensibly brought with their first advance from Capitol Records, ready for their flagship show at Detroit's Ford Auditorium. For all the frustrations of waiting for the main man machine to lurch into operation on behalf of the Stooges, everything seemed set for a triumphant return. Cherry Vanilla was calling her contacts to send round acetates of the new album, and a couple of days before the Detroit performance, Iggy appeared on Mark Parento's afternoon radio show on WABX to preview the album. Iggy seemed positively joyous, Parento thought, and after a couple of songs started to sing along with the album that he'd waited so long for the world to hear. In between they chatted, fooling around in a tiny studio converted from an old dentist's office up on the 33rd floor of the David Stott skyscraper. After 2 or 3 songs, Iggy undid one button of his bright red trousers, revealing he was wearing no underwear, stepped out of the pants and started to dance as he sang along. Parento started giggling uncontrollably as he realised that Iggy's member flapping against his stomach was clearly audible over the radio. Every now and then he caught sight of WABX admin and other staff peering through the narrow strip of glass in the studio door as Parento hinted to his radio audience what was going on. After the show finished, Parento had to sit and listen meekly as WABX general manager John Detz declared the singer would never be allowed on the radio station again. To some of the main man staff in Detroit who were well aware of what the Stooges had been getting up to in Hollywood, the radio show became another example of Iggy's unreliable behaviour. Cherry Vanilla, who by now was keeping
DeFries informed of the shenanigans at Torreson, observed that the main man Supremo was losing his enthusiasm for Iggy, as he had once fondly termed him. Jim and James conspired to accelerate that process. According to Jim, James forced him to approach DeFries immediately before the Ford Auditorium show and tell him James is strung out on heroin and we want to move the band to Florida, where James's mother lived, because we're strung out and we need to kick. Today, Williamson describes Jim's account as ludicrous. I wasn't strung out, and furthermore, my mum lived with the evil colonel, like his stepdad, who would never have done a thing for us. Lee Childers, who detested the guitarist, maintains Williamson soured the Stooges' relationship with Main Man and that the guitarist was difficult and unprofessional. It's a view few onlookers seem to share. Again, this he said, she said stuff. For in the later days, Williamson seemed by far the most together Stooge, but Childers would get an opportunity to vent his spleen. That evening's show, according to all who attended, was a triumphant homecoming to a crowd of die-hard fans, including Jim's parents. who packed the swanky all-seated venue with its wood-lined interior and chandeliers which normally housed the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Augmented by Bob Sheff, with James Williamson clad in full Mick Ronson attire, most notably a pair of towering, thigh-length silver platform boots. The band played a set drawn mostly from raw power, augmented for the occasion with Cock in My Pocket, which Iggy announced was co-written by my mother. Iggy looked live and fit, and although perhaps the presence of Tony DeFries imposed some restraint, the singer dry-humped a girl in the front row, spat on some of his fans, and used a lot of sour language. Some fans remember. The audience's response to the show was ecstatic, although there was irritation and a few catcalls when the Stooges, at DeFries' insistence, refused to do an encore. It was probably Iggy's frustration not being allowed to perform an encore that soured the atmosphere at the lavish after-show party. DeFries worked the room as if he was a major politician or local union boss. Nick Kent looked on as Iggy greeted his fans. Then one girl, slightly the worse for a couple of drinks, came up cooing, "Iggy, you look great," before attempting to give her hero a hug. Irritated, the singer pushed her away towards a nearby staircase. "She almost went backwards down a whole flight of stairs," says Kent. "This caused a bit of a ruckus in the house because she was a friend of one of the people giving the party. It was a horribly despicable thing to do as well. It really shocked me." DeFries was mortified by Iggy's behaviour, which nearly turned a triumphant show into a disaster, but it was James Williamson who was made a scapegoat. Lee Childers hated the guitarist, and when James had a messy argument with Lee's friend Serinda Fox after getting her pregnant, Childers set out to claim Williamson's scalp. On the band's return to LA, Childers persuaded DeFries that Williamson was the cause of the Stooges' behaviour, and the main man boss gave Jim an ultimatum: either James was sacked or the Stooges would be dropped. The remaining Stooges and Lee Childers all voted. Lee went first, then the Ashtons sheepishly sided against their nemesis. And then finally, Iggy agreed to sack his friend and songwriting partner. James was thrown out of the house, not allowed even to take his guitars or his platform boots. Distraught at the betrayal by his friend who'd pushed me under the bus for the sake of his career, he says, James disappeared to Hollywood, where an employment centre directed him to a job working as a projectionist at a porno flick joint. Iggy was apparently undisturbed by the loss of his collaborator. Rick Frystack played in a blues band called Moonfleet and had gone to Westchester High with Danny Sugarman, a fast-talking 18-year-old who hung around the Doors office and later assisted with their press. Sugarman was very aggressive about getting involved with Main Man, says Frystack, and pushed his friend to audition with Iggy. After a brief chat, Iggy suggested Frystack bring his guitar to the house. On the appointed day, Ricky showed up to see Iggy reclining by the pool, cradling a glass of Courvoisier, with Sun Ra's Atlantis album being played at cacophonous volume over a huge PA system. It was a total eye-opener, says Frystack. We jammed for a couple of hours, then hung out for a few more. Iggy seemed in his element, really happy, living out the ultimate rock fantasy life, hanging by the pool. Iggy, in fact, was investigating many potential new partnerships. Earlier in March, Tony DeFries had chatted with Kim Fowley, record producer, Lurch lookalike, and celebrated denizen of Rodney's English disco, and there had been vague talk of Fowley working on an Iggy solo album. For a time, Fowley became Iggy's confidant, and they worked on a set of songs that would have been Iggy's second album for Main Man, including a new composition called She Creatures of the Hollywood Hills. Fowley was asked to cast around for a replacement for Williamson. The lanky, droll-faced producer picked on Warren Klein, who attracted a modest amount of attention on the LA scene with Fraternity of Man, a psychedelic blues outfit in the vein of Moby Grape. Their biggest claim to fame was getting one song on the best-selling Easy Rider soundtrack. Klein was a Tony Curtis-looking guy with a shoe salesman personality, according to Fowley. The guitarist kept quiet but laughed in all the right places when the lead singer spoke. This, together with his rootsy blues style, apparently qualified him for a job in the Stooges. To give him a little more glam cachet, Warren was renamed Tornado Turner, and he was hurriedly enlisted into the Stooges. But if it was Tony DeFries' belief that eliminating James Williamson would make Iggy and the Stooges behave, he was soon disabused of that notion. Early in April, DeFries had joined Tony Zanetta in Japan for Bowie's tour there. The bad news, that by now flowed in a steady stream from the Torrison Drive house, became a constant preoccupation. Zanetta heard reports of a robbery which they assumed was a put-up job to score more money for drugs, and demands for money for an abortion for one of Iggy's teenage girlfriends, which was almost certainly a fiction, although it's impossible to know who made up the story. And every phone call there was another disaster to sort out. Tony DeFries had reached the end of the road with Iggy Pop, the all-American boy who had once charmed him. As Childers points out, Tony always fell a little in love with the people he worked with, until, like a love affair, it starts to go sour, and then it really goes south fast. Then it was fury like a manager scorned. In Detroit, there had been little DeFreeze could do about Iggy's behaviour. He'd signed him at Bowie's behest, and he couldn't drop him without David's assent. Now, just a few days into his first tumultuous Japanese tour, David was forced to sit and listen as his manager explained why Mayman would have to drop his friend. DeFreeze was talking and talking to David about it, says Zanetta, and David felt bad because he really didn't want to let Iggy go. But he was on the brink in Japan and preoccupied. There really wasn't anything he could do. So reluctantly, he agreed that they should let him loose. Let them loose, as in the Stooges. Back in LA, Lee Childers informed the Stooges that they had been dropped. He expected a scene, but like naughty children who know they've been rumbled, there were no complaints. Lee jumped into the pool and paddled around forlornly as he watched them gather their clothes and leave. Just to break this up a little again, this is another CD that has those demos or different versions of some of the songs between Raw Power and what became Kill City. It says, the Stooges' story appeared to have come to an abrupt end when they disbanded amidst chaos in '74. But over the next few years, a wealth of legal and illegal releases featuring completed but previously unreleased songs, demos, and rehearsals hit the shops with alarming regularity. The quality of those released varied dramatically, so here for the first time we put together the best of those tracks for your listening pleasure. And it's got starts. Again, it's like half of what's on Kill City and half of it's not, like stuff like I Got It Right. I know I Got It Right might be on there. No, it isn't. Yeah, I Got It Right is the one from the Stooges demos. There's a few, there's various things on there, but yeah, there's another little Stooges demos. So, we're going to power on with our Stooges story. I know it's a long one, so if any of you are still watching at this point, thank you for sticking with it. Okay, so the slow, painful, heroic death of the Stooges started with humiliation and ended in a hail of bottles. The humiliation hurt more. In early '73, there were still a few Iggy fans scattered around Hollywood, and one of them was Danny Sugarman. Jim Morrison's death in July '71 had left a void in Sugarman's life. Iggy looked to be the man to fill it. And after the main man axe fell, Danny was keen to start hustling on behalf of the Stooges. The band also lucked into a heavy-duty manager in the 5'6", pugnacious form of Jeff Wald, who had been turned on to Iggy by rock critic Lillian Roxon. Wald was husband and manager to singer Helen Reddy, who, like her friend Lillian, was an Australian expat and committed feminist. Her husband Jeff was in contrast a coked-up tough guy from the Bronx, whose typical opening line in a business negotiation might go, "Don't F with me or I'll hurt you." Before he could sign with Wald, though, Jim had to undergo a ritual humiliation at the hands of Abe Summers, the Doors business attorney who witnessed the contract. "You should count yourself lucky that a respected businessman like Mr. Wald would even consider representing you," Summers told a mute, listless Jim. "You're not worthy even to kiss his feet." Faced with such a tirade, Jim's legendary charm for once deserted him, unsurprisingly. This was the first time Sugarman told his friends that he had seen Jim cry. Others observed the psychic toll of such humiliations, and Nick Kent, for one, believed that over the spring of '73, Jim suffered some kind of nervous breakdown. A lot of bad things had happened to him, and his nervous system simply couldn't take any more. The fact that the main man money supply had finally dried up did have one positive consequence. Jim no longer had the money to maintain his renewed love affair with heroin. The bad news was that he would eventually become a trash can drugs user using whatever was going for free or for cheap, most notably the Quaaludes that seemed to be freely available in Hollywood at the time. There was another humiliation to come in the form of a Chicago show, probably booked by Main Man, on 15th of June, which featured their new guitarist, Tornado Turner. Those who attended retained vague memories of a performance that was utterly professional and unbelievably tedious. Ben Edmonds, then an editor at Cream, was a Stooges fan and had driven all the way to the Aragon, a faded ballroom rather like the Grand. The performance was so dull that the only standout memory was of Tornado Turner's moustache. There was nothing there. It was like watching a bad covers band. Both for the cash and for their self-esteem, the Stooges needed to work. Jim threw himself into fevered activity, acknowledging that with Turner, the Stooges' magic was gone. As Jeff Wald hit the phones, hustling for live shows and calling Clive Davis to ensure the Columbia boss maintained his commitment to the Stooges, Jim swallowed his pride and called James Williamson, who was staying with Evita and her mum. James still believed in the music, but knew their relationship as friends was over. He doesn't apologise, he just goes on with things. So did I, but from now on I was watching my back. So James Williamson gets back involved with the Stooges after a brief being let go of. Basically, obviously, like he says, watching his back at this point. When Bob Chef got the message that the Stooges were playing again, he sensed the change in their circumstances without needing to be told. Meeting Jim a few days later, he noticed that his old friend looked tired. The beautiful house was gone. Most of the little heroin moles that had been hanging around had disappeared. There were rumblings about record company debts, and the road manager made a habit of going into the bank to cash checks with a gun in his jacket pocket. An accommodation for the hired help now consisted of a crummy room at the Tropicana, and later even sleazier accommodation with garish wallpaper at the Riviera Motel, a rundown joint full of hookers and other shady characters where James and Avisa had their wallets stolen one night as they slept. Still considering what he'd been through, James Williamson seemed to be keeping things together. The guitarist and his girlfriend treated Bob to a meal, talked about astrology, and discussed the progress of the rehearsals at SIR and an imminent live tour that would start with a residency at the Whiskey A Go Go on Sunset Boulevard. Where Iggy seemed to be running the show back at the Ford Auditorium, this time round James was taking charge. The band's run of shows at the Whiskey started on the 20th of June, 2 shows a night. In the 3 years since the band had last played the West Coast, it seemed like they'd picked up a huge new following. And the opening night was packed with younger kids who later formed the backbone of LA's punk scene. Many of them were dumbstruck by the spectacle of this band, who were now living on the edge, but whose power was undiminished. On the opening night, Bob Chef had decided to unveil his own alter ego, the avant-garde creation called Blue Jean Tyranny. He wore ripped clothing and a string of red light bulbs in his hair that twinkled brightly. Backstage, a couple of observers who were high became paranoid that he was on fire and attempted to bat out the flames. Chef hit the stage first, pounding out the opening chords of Raw Power on a decrepit piano, stuck up in a corner above the Whiskey stage. Then Williamson, the Ashtons, and Iggy walked down across the gangway behind a movie screen showing a silent loop of Lee Marvin assassinating Ronald Reagan from The Killers, and strolled onto the stage. The guitarist and drummer joined Chef, beating out the monstrous repetitive riff. Iggy stood at the front of the stage, glaring at the audience as a couple of girls crouched in front of him. When he got bored of their attentions, he simply kicked one of them out of the way before picking up the microphone and launching into Raw Power. Life was imitating art. He'd written about being doomed but for a driving rock and roll beat, and now he was living out that message. But those pile-driving chords couldn't sustain Iggy forever. The main act was expected to play 2 sets a night at the Whiskey, and within a day or so Iggy was simply too exhausted to complete the second performance. By the second night, Bob Chef realised he had lent so much money to the other Stooges that he had only just enough cash left for his plane fare back to Berkeley. Chef told road manager John Myers that he needed his pay for the show or he'd have to quit and fly home before he was stranded with the Stooges for eternity. Myers' response was to offer him a lift to the airport. Chef fled and never spoke to Iggy again. The Stooges played without a pianist for the next 3 nights. Reports of the later performances are garbled like messages from a battlefront, but several images linger. One is of Iggy threading the microphone stand for his bikini briefs and humping it for 15 minutes without singing a note as the crowd dwindles to 20 frazzled onlookers. Another is of Iggy being passed around by an ecstatic audience in a joyful reminder of the Stooges' legendary Cincinnati performance. Still another was a backstage glimpse of Iggy passed out in the dressing room, his head cradled in Sable Starr's lap. She was a groupie at the time. As each Stooge sat mute in his own corner long after they were supposed to hit the stage. We went backstage because we were so frustrated waiting for the second set, remembers Don Waller, a fervent fan who saw practically every Whiskey show. We're scratching our heads and couldn't work out what was going on. We didn't understand that they were that messed up, that Williamson and Iggy were spiking so much, as in doing heroin so much. Columbia had finally released Raw Power in May. It took them ages to release that record, which was credited to Iggy and the Stooges, but without the prospect of being linked up with a hot management company like Main Man, the record company made little pretense of commitment. Steve Harris, who'd had the job of promoting the Stooges at Elektra, found history repeating itself when he became a vice president at Columbia and again attempted to infuse a boardroom full of indifferent staff. This time round it was markedly worse. The reaction was, haha, Iggy, the guy's a joke. Columbia were making more money from the 3 years old Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel than from the Stooges. But Harris persevered, concluding that the only way to make New York radio stations take notice of the Stooges was to underwrite a series of shows that he termed Iggy at Max's at Midnight. At first, Jeff Ward was suspicious. "You expect me to send Iggy to New York?" he roared. "It's junk city out there." Once Harris assured him he would watch the singer's every move, it was agreed the band would start a four-night residency on 30th of July. The Max's dates were strung together with a few Midwest and Canadian shows to make a ramshackle tour, for which the Stooges decided they needed to replace Bob Sheff. James Williamson again took charge, calling up Scott Thurston, a keyboard player he'd met whilst rehearsing at Capitol Studios during his exile from the Stooges, joining him in LA for a brief run-through of the songs and giving him a copy of Raw Power. A few days later, Thurston was on a plane with road manager John Myers for a show at the Ice Arena on St. Clair Lake, just north of Detroit. Scotty's first meeting with the band was the ride to the arena. That night he shared a stage for the first time with Iggy, who was dressed only in knee boots and bikini briefs. He was stunned. He remained stunned for some time. That evening was the beginning, according to many Stooge connoisseurs, of an era of unparalleled comedy. Fans could enjoy their chaotic shows as much for Iggy's ludicrous clothing and bizarre antics as for the interminably thrilling music. They were funny, hysterically comical, remembers Michael Tipton, a friend and fan whose tapes documented many of the band's final shows. You could fill 1,000 pages and still not capture all the insanity. Although the Stooges themselves were comparatively oblivious to their leader's troubles, seeing them as self-inflicted, other close observers like Tipton and Natalie Schlossman eventually realised there was a black underbelly to the comedy. It did become obvious Iggy needed professional help, says Tipton. It got to the point where people around almost feared him. At St. Clair Lake, Iggy dressed down for the show in black Soho knickers, a souvenir from his amblings around London's tourist haunts. It was a baking hot day and the band had been eating watermelons backstage. As the Stooges, Thurston included, blasted out the opening chords of Raw Power, Iggy ran out on stage and hurled a watermelon into the crowd. It hit a girl in the audience who was apparently concussed, causing ructions with the promoter later. A few songs in, Iggy felt an irresistible urge to empty his bowels and ran behind the Stooges' Marshall stacks to take a dump. Tipton watched Iggy run back on stage and start throwing stuff at the crowd. Obviously a low point there. Once he'd exhausted his ammunition, he took a cup of ice and emptied it down his Soho briefs, then fished it out piece by piece, sucking it provocatively or throwing it at the audience. Thurston was shell-shocked by his debut with the Stooges, understandably, transfixed by the power of the band in performance and appalled by the increasingly obvious hopelessness of their predicament once they left the stage. He would hang with James Williamson, the one band member attempting to be positive. He was circling the wagons like we were under attack in a western, the kind of western where everyone gets a bullet, but maybe you can shoot somebody on your way out. But no one, not even James, could change the path down which the Stooges were heading. Nobody was in control. It was complete anarchy. Eventually, Thurston got used to the doomed glamour of his new outlaw life, arriving at venues without any equipment, borrowing amplifiers from the support band, leaving hired Marshall backlines at venues to avoid paying rental fees, and skipping out of hotels through the back door. Once the band hit New York around 20th July, however, it felt like the good old days were back. Columbia gave the band free run of their rehearsal studios in Midtown, a sedate, comfortable building that usually hosted acts like Tony Bennett. It was overseen by a union attendant who looked on impassively as Iggy danced on the grand piano. One by one, old friends came in to meet the band, getting ready for their prestigious engagement at Max's. Natalie Schlossman and her friend Pat, who had a thing for Ron, turned up. James's girlfriend Vita flew in from LA, and a bunch of people. Oh yeah, Scotty's girlfriend. Dave Alexander as well, the original bassist. Dave looked healthy and slim and sat in on rehearsals, telling the others how he was making a fortune playing the stock market. Over several days, the band worked on their set, augmenting their Raw Power material with new songs including Heavy Liquid and Open Up and Bleed, to which Thurston added a wailing harmonica part. Jim himself seemed in decent shape, optimistic, working the band through the new material, although there were the usual lapses. The open night at Max's was packed with old friends like Danny Fields, Lee Blackshoulders, Lenny Kaye, Alice Cooper and Linda Robinson in attendance, and a huge queue outside the club. There were problems with the PA, which meant Iggy's voice was swamped by the huge wall of sound generated by the rented guitar amplifiers, and James's guitar was occasionally out of tune. Some Stooges' old hands sniggered at the cliched makeup and at their ludicrous costumes crafted by Hollywood designer Bill Whitten. James wore a glammy Star Trek outfit, while Iggy appeared at one point in a campily ridiculous gladiator costume. Despite the technical problems, the band was magnificent. Bob Zukowski, Night Bob as he's called, was hired for the Max's show to look after the amplifier backline. His job was to get the clang, the ringing, physically brutal noise that would help beat the audience into submission. Night Bob sat in for every Max's rehearsal and show, and realised that even though everything was really raw, you knew there was something going on. That's why we wanted to work for them. This wasn't a bunch of fading groovers who were going to fall into oblivion, that's what he said. In the confined space of Max's, the New York audience was transfixed with both excitement and fear, for as Babe Buell, the Ford agency model and celebrated girlfriend of Todd Rundgren, points out, there was that element of danger because everybody had heard about his antics on stage. And he ends up having a brief fling with Babe Buell, who also was with Aerosmith's Steven Tyler as well. In fact, she's the mother of Liv Tyler, the actress. The second night at the club was again packed, and as Iggy walked over the tables and chairs, glaring at the crowd, one chair either wobbled or was pulled from under him. He slipped and fell onto a table full of glasses, which shattered under his weight. As Iggy got up again, Nightbob saw cuts on his chest and chin and a puncture wound by one of his ribs. As Iggy staggered to the side and crashed into him, Bob noticed his own shirt was covered in blood and shouted, "Let's pull it, let's stop it, man, you can't do this." Iggy kept singing, the blood dripping down his chest. He discovered that if he pulled his left arm back, blood would spurt out in a continuous stream. It was horrible, like a Roman arena, says Wayne County. I kept running up the stairs to look, going, ah, then running out again. Babe Buell remembers we didn't see him go down, but when he got up, there was an enormous amount of blood gushing from what looked like, from where we were sitting, a massive gash. Night Bob recalls, we had this saying that a piece of gaffer tape will fix anything, but he was bleeding so bad the tape wouldn't even stick. As Jim Osterberg explains today, the cut just happened. It was an accident. But wherever singers would have left the stage, Iggy finished the band's 7-song set, and the blood trickling down Iggy Pop's chest would become a defining image in his career. The streams of blood seemed the culmination of a process that had started the first time Iggy had been booed by Cream fans back in April 1968. In those days, his confrontation of the audience had recalled the savage, physical theatrics proposed by Antonin Artaud in his Theatre of Cruelty. Like Iggy, Artaud believes one could achieve a kind of purity by violently confronting or terrifying a desensitized audience. Yet now reveling in his physical injuries, Iggy seemed to be going further still into the realms of performance. Artists like Chris Burden, who had famously had himself shot in his 1971 art piece Shoot. Burden was later celebrated by Bowie and Joe the Lion from his Heroes album. Without doubt, some of Iggy's behaviour was calculated, but in his volatile mental state, there was no way of knowing how this escalation of confrontation would end. Within days, it would be reported that Iggy had slashed himself over a star-crossed romance with Babe Buell. As far as some long-time Stooges fans like Dave Marsh were concerned, the celebration of Iggy's blood was such a cliché. It was like, have we really come to this? Scott Thurston remembers the band's reaction as shock. I felt bad for Jim and felt mad a little bit. It was kind of a protest against himself. After this initiation, Thurston realised it was kind of the band vibe to be relaxed under any circumstances. It wasn't like we panicked, but it felt bad and it was definitely a low point. But there were plenty more low points to come. As the Stooges finished their set, Alice Cooper pressed his way into the dressing room and insisted that Iggy needed professional medical attention, delegating his press agent, Ashley Pandell, to take him to the hospital for stitches. Jim, stitched and bandaged, returned to the club later that evening, quite possibly to see Babe Buell. Later that evening, photographer Lynn Goldsmith snapped a photo of the two together, with Jim staring adoringly at the lofty wasp beauty. It's more than likely that the vulnerable singer exploited his injuries to enlist Buell's sympathy, and even encouraged the rumours that he had slashed himself over his unrequited love for her, which, given that they first met at the Max's performance, is a little far-fetched. However, Jim pursued his new love interest with his trademark combination of indefatigable charm and a certain craftiness. Jim's injuries meant that the next two Max's shows were postponed, but rather than recuperate, the wounded singer wandered off to see the New York Dolls at Madison Square Garden's Felt Forum the next evening. The Dolls were fast emerging as claimants to the Stooges' status as preeminent icons of decadence, and that evening Iggy looked a forlorn figure. He collided with a glass door, cutting his head, and New York literati were literally stepping over him, laughing at his condition. Fortunately, Babe Buell had persuaded Todd Rundgren also to see the Dolls, and she saw the stricken hero leaning against a wall. She kneeled down to minister to him, tenderly wiping off the blood with a towel, as Babe's companions, Serinda Fox and Cindy Lang, giggled at her concern, while Todd was plainly getting irritated. His concern was justified, for by now Buell had concluded that Iggy was totally effing gorgeous, and just lists what she thinks about him, basically. Rundgren finally tugged Buell, tottering on her platforms, away from the scene, but in their brief conversation, Babe had mentioned where she and Todd lived, confident that in his confused state, Jim couldn't possibly remember. The next day, a few moments after Todd stepped out of their Greenwich Village apartment to replenish his sock supply for a trip to San Diego, Babe heard a knock at the front door and ran down to open it. Thinking her boyfriend had forgotten his wallet, and there, bouncing with vitality, was Jim Osterberg in a thin t-shirt and pants, smiling. "You said 51 Horatio, right?" Not long after Jim sat down and explained, with almost excessive politeness, how he had no money and needed a place to stay, Todd returned from his shopping expedition. Rundgren was rightly suspicious of the rival musician, but it was too late to cancel his trip, a trip on which Babe believed the revered producer and multi-instrumentalist was planning his own romantic assignations. Unable to do more, Rundgren issued a stern order to Babe: "Do not under any circumstances leave him in the place by himself. He will steal everything we've got to buy drugs, and whatever you do, lock up the third floor and don't let him anywhere near it." Assuring her boyfriend he had no reason to be concerned and that she wouldn't let Jim near the third floor studio where Todd kept his guitars and valuable studio gear, Babe bade him farewell. She settled down with Jim to what would be a romantic few days, going to see Paper Moon, that summer's feel-good movie, walking around Greenwich Village, sitting in the park or eating burgers laced with Tabasco at PJ Clark's, the bustling mahogany-panelled saloon over on the Upper East Side. Jim was fortunately the same build as Todd, even if he was a good few inches shorter, so Babe cut the legs off the guitarist's pants so that her new beau would have fresh clothes to wear. On 6th of August, the Stooges returned to Max's Kansas City to fulfill their two postponed midnight performances. Night Bob had spent the intervening time assembling a huge PA system, and for the last shows, Iggy's voice was finally audible, and the band were brutally honed. Their energy level was almost unendurable in the confined space of Max's upper floor. Whatever Ron's disenchantment at being demoted to playing bass, he was one of the greatest exponents of the instrument before or since. Melodically inventive, ruthlessly aggressive, he locked in faultlessly with brother Rock Action's clattering Sturm and Drang, his bass guitar leading the assault for extended instrumental passages during which the adrenaline never flagged. Over those 2 nights, the Stooges were in their pomp, their magnificence undimmed by their obvious travails. They were at their peak, like an American Stones in their Exile on Main Street period, says Bob Schakowsky. Over those final 2 midnight performances, they continued to develop their new material, still in hope of working towards another album on Columbia. By the final night, Open Up and Bleed was reworked with new lyrics and became an anthem of the band's turbulent residence. It was something special, muses Steve Harris, who relished almost every aspect of what would be the band's last appearance at Manhattan. But what's important was that it didn't make a dent in record sales. Nonetheless, the shows were seen as a triumph, widely praised by critics, whose reviews Jim always studied minutely, although some of the New York writers, and particularly Lenny Kaye, did have a sense that the Max's shows indicated the Stooges couldn't go much further except by damaging themselves. There was the odd dig, notably in Rock Scene, the hip photo-heavy magazine. Those in the know could infer the influential editor's feelings about James Williamson by the fact his photo was captioned Jones Williamson. In the wake of the shows, Jim enjoyed a blissful New York summer, holed up with Babe Buell at Horatio Street. Todd was an influential figure in the New York music industry, but Jim and Babe were oblivious to his inevitable wrath. They were like awestruck adolescents, enjoying moments of what seemed like rare purity amid the chaos that threatened to engulf Iggy. So this talks about his and Babe's brief fling. So Jim left for a string of Stooges shows in Canada and Arizona. Babe and him kept in regular touch on Todd's phone bill, for which there would of course be more recriminations, planning a rendezvous before the Stooges show at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. on 19th August. Jim mentioned to a few people that Babe would be attending the show. It caused some concern, for as Natalie Schlossman points out, it was playing with fire getting together with Babe. I was worried about it. Everyone knew how influential Todd Rundgren was. The Kennedy Center was a beautiful, prestigious venue. Babe's mum, Dorothea, was coming to the show, which was headlined by Mott the Hoople, while the Stooges savoured the fact they were staying at the Watergate Hotel complex, scene of Richard Nixon's notorious bugging of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Babe and Jim arranged to take the train together out of Manhattan, a plan that Jim seized on, believes Buell, because he fancied the thrill of an illicit get-together on the train. Unfortunately, Babe arrived with a woman she'd met by Alice Cooper's girlfriend, Cindy Lang. When they arrived at the plush modern theatre complex, Jim was still frustrated at having his fancy thwarted. So the Stooges play a string of dates across the East Coast in Canada and then make their way back to LA. But with no base from where they could work, their lives were increasingly fractured, and Jim moved around from location to location, finally ending up at the Hyatt Continental, which had become famous as the Riot House during Led Zeppelin's excess-fueled stay there in June. And he was hanging with Johnny Thunders from the New York Dolls after they arrived in LA on the 29th of August. Thunders' dalliance with heroin was infinitely more serious than that of Iggy, who always liked to boast of his physical indestructibility. Thunders' life would soon follow an inexorable downward spiral. The guitarist was rarely off heroin or methadone thereafter, and would die in New Orleans at the age of 38. By this point, scoring smack was a constant obsession of Iggy's. Late one evening, Annie Apple, who'd seen Jim around Rodney's, answered the phone to hear, "Hi, I think you know me. This is Iggy Pop." Credentials established, he asked if she had any money, trading on his celebrity with relaxed ease. At around 3 that morning, he knocked on her door at the Coronet, a once magnificent Mediterranean revival apartment building that had housed the House of Francis, an upmarket brothel back in the 30s. Now it was ramshackle, full of drug dealers, hookers, and artists, and was handily close to the Hyatt. Iggy was accompanied by Stan Lee, later the guitarist with LA punk band The Dickies, and Max, a well-groomed, suave European who was the main celebrity drug dealer in Hollywood at the time. It soon transpired that Iggy was planning to sell Annie his celebrated cheetah jacket, in which he'd posed on the Raw Power sleeve, for $25, and Annie handed over the cash before Max realised what was happening. "You're not hawking your jacket," Max informed Iggy, before taking the jacket and returning Annie's $25. I'll just show you the jacket as well. That jacket there, that's the one he's talking about. Max informed Iggy that he wasn't hawking his jacket before taking the jacket and returning Annie's $25. "Thanks for helping me out," Iggy told Annie politely before the three of them disappeared into the Hollywood night. By now, Iggy's freeloading was notorious. There was even an urban legend that he used to stand beneath a huge Columbia billboard for Raw Power on the Strip, pointing to his photo as he panhandled for dope. But there was also a keen intelligence to his behaviour. During his brief visit to Apple's apartment, Jim had recognised the potential of the Coronet, also known as the Piazza del Sol, which was managed by Jerry Flanagan, an eccentric character who used to write hectoring letters to his tenants in exquisite longhand and signed them the Corporation. Apple had been planning to move out of her apartment, number 404, but after returning from a short trip to San Francisco, she opened her front door, painted in sky blue with cheery white clouds, to discover that Flanagan had given the keys to Ron Ashton. Apple managed to retrieve a few of her meagre possessions, but left the Stooges with her pots and pans, and even her little brother's sleeping bag, which Jim commandeered sleeping on the plywood floor. It gave her an excuse to drop by every now and then and survey the activities at the Coronet. After James Williamson and Evita moved into their own apartment at 306, the rundown building became the Stooges' base of operations. After their 2-week layoff, the Stooges returned to the Whiskey on 3rd of September for a run of shows that by now were being poorly attended. According to Don Waller and fellow fan Fast Freddy Patterson, who put together Backdoor Man magazine, "When he came back in the fall, there weren't nearly as many people," says Patterson. "Some days we'd go and there was just us and a couple of others. Where on the previous runs the crowd had been so packed they could pass him over their heads, this time Iggy could dance out on the floor, just a few people around him. Just doing his Iggy thing," says Patterson. "At one point Iggy poured melted candle wax down his chest, just like the old days." Still, say Waller, Patterson and others, the band are on fire, playing more new songs including Heavy Liquid, as well as basing the audience most evenings. One evening Iggy announced, "We can't be bought, not even in this town. Not by all the money in Israel." It's tempting to speculate that Danny Sugarman and Jeff Wald made up the Jewish contingent in the audience that night. In any case, Wald decided to drop the Stooges over the course of their whiskey run, disturbed, he says, by Iggy's erratic antics, and worried that he would be tainted by their fast-growing reputation as losers. "You were judged by your success, and they weren't a success. I didn't want them to be my calling card, the artist by which they judged my management abilities. You could say it was a ruthless decision. I would prefer the word cold." Although Wald always insisted on firing bands in person, he wasn't the kind of manager who left his underlings to perform brutal tasks. He remembers Jim as being composed and not particularly surprised. However, there were still a fair number of bookings dotted across the US, and a few days later the band returned to their Detroit home turf for 2 shows at the Michigan Palace starting on the 5th of October. There was something about the venue's atmosphere that the band disliked, but the old theatre was packed, and by now the band were in their element. The Detroit audiences, more than anyone, appreciated the Stooges' desperate take-no-prisoners attitude and in-your-face aggression, and that night they received a raucous, enthusiastic reception. with the audience invading the stage at the end of the show. At some point, Iggy invited the crowd back to the band's hotel, the Detroit Hilton, for what might well have been the band's most gloriously depraved night in the city. Michael Tipton and Natalie Schlossman, two of the band's closest friends, were staying at the Hilton, but like most of the hotel guests, got little sleep that night. At one point, Michael Tipton was chatting with Scotty Thurston in his room when James Williamson knocked on his door, walked in with two friends, one male, one female, explained that his own room was packed with people, asked if he could use Tipton's bathroom, and the three of them disappeared inside. 20 minutes later, Natalie Schlossman arrived in search of James and knocked on the bathroom door. After a pause, James and his friends emerged, apologising to Tipton for the mess. Tipton looked in the bathroom and saw the walls were splattered with blood. A couple of hours later, Natalie got a call from Ron Ashton asking for a chat. She was about to take a shower and forgot to go down for some time. When she knocked on Ron's door, it swung open and Ashton told her, "Come on in, it's cool." Inside were Ron and Scotty Thurston, both naked from the waist down, with one woman wearing an exotic wig and nothing else. The guitarist and mild mannered keyboard player were both kind of having a go with her. Later in the morning, Natalie heard her phone ring twice, called the operator, and heard two messages from Jim telling her, "Come on down, pick me up, and let's go eat." She was already going for breakfast with Michael Tipton, and the two of them stopped at Jim's room on the way downstairs. When the door opened, Natalie and Michael saw approximately 20 people in the room in various combinations with each other. Jim stood there with shirt but no pants, a girl holding onto his legs. Politely, he told the pair, "Sorry, I've changed my mind. I think I'm going to crash." 10 minutes later, Tipton and Schlossman were tucking into their morning coffees when Jim bounded into the restaurant. "I got rid of him," he whispered, before sitting down for breakfast. So just crazy goings on, really, in the hotel. The following night's show was triumphant too. The new, harder rocking set went down better with the Detroit audience than the comparatively restrained Ford Auditorium's show 6 months earlier. One Detroit fan photographer, Robert Matthew, remembers, "We all loved Cock in My Pocket. It became quite a local anthem for a while." A few days later, the band settled into a residency from 8th to 13th October at a small club called Richards in Atlanta, Georgia, for what James Williamson regarded as a string of their best performances. Several of the band's fans, including Ben Edmonds of Cream, conspired to raise their morale with an endorsement by Elton John. Elton was sweeping across the US on a hugely successful stadium tour that significantly outgrossed the performances by his friend and rival David Bowie, with whom Elton was engaged in a semi-friendly sniping. Elton decided to signal his support for the Stooges, plus his own general zaniness, by renting a gorilla suit and planning a one-ape stage invasion during the Stooges' stint. Cream had prepared a photographer for the stunt. Unfortunately, no one had prepared Iggy. The previous night he had disappeared with some girl, and early in the morning she brought him back to the band's hotel unconscious. He had gobbled down her entire supply of Quaaludes. Scott and Ashton and a friend of the band, Doug Curry, were called to lift his dead weight out of her Corvette. Carrying him into the hotel, they dropped him and were overcome with a giggling fit, seeing him peacefully sleeping, sprawled over a spiky Mediterranean bush. He was still hardly conscious that evening when Doug and Scotty carried him into the club. God knows what the poor club owner thought, says Curry. And after a quick discussion of what to do, Doug announced he had some speed. James Williamson managed to find a syringe, and they duly shot their singer full of methamphetamine sulfate in order to get him on his feet. Unsurprisingly, during the performance for which Elton had planned this jolly jape, Iggy was, he says, unusually stoned to the point of being barely ambulatory, so it scared the hell out of me. For a couple of seconds, as Elton emerged from the wings in his gorilla suit, Iggy thought he was hallucinating or else a real gorilla was invading the stage. The Cream photograph documenting the event is hilarious, showing James Williamson transfixing the uppity ape with a malevolent gaze that signals, he says, his intent to take him out. He lucked out because he was smart enough to take his head off to let people know who he was just in time. Once Elton discarded the ape mask and revealed his cheery face, Iggy realised what was happening and danced around with the fur-clad Elton for a song or so. And the event was duly plugged in Cream, with Iggy telling the magazine, "Elton's a swell guy." Off the record, he would tell people that Elton had only pulled the stunt because he wanted to get into tough guy guitarist James Williamson's pants. Yet, although there would be ongoing discussions with Elton's manager, John Reed, and his record imprint, Rocket, the encounter failed to lift the Stooges' spirits, and soon the band was becoming more obviously frazzled. Around this time, it seems many of the Stooges clung to pathetically poignant lucky mementos. Iggy had a pet cuddly rabbit. Drummer Scott had a lucky towel, which he would wrap around his head at times of acute stress. Guitarist Ron had a treasured pillow, which his mum had embroidered. If any of his fellow band members hit it, he went mad. By the end of the year, bookings had started to fizzle out, so the band switched agencies to ATI in New York. Rumours spread that the Stooges were about to split, or had split already, as the various members dispersed around Hollywood. In LA, regulars at Rodney's English Disco started claiming that Iggy was asking a New York promoter for a $1 million fee to commit suicide live on stage at Madison Square Garden. Andy Warhol announced the event would happen at the Stooges' end-of-year show at New York's Academy of Music. The story reached the band themselves, but their reaction, according to Bob Schakowsky, was, "We don't think he's strong enough to commit suicide." Instead, the evening was remarkable mostly for Iggy's announcing every song as Heavy Liquid. It was telling that by now no one, whether band or road crew, knew if he was putting on an act or was under the influence of a new drug or had literally lost his mind. With increasing regularity, outsiders who caught sight of the Out of It singer before the shows would ask the road crew, "Do you really think he can make it?" The answer would be, "Well, he always does." But the New Year's Eve show marked a turning point, says Night Bob. Before that, everybody seemed to be happy, and now everybody seemed to be unhappy. You could see the signpost up ahead, "The end is near." News of the death of one-time Stooges bassist Zeke Zentner from a heroin overdose on 10th November further darkened their mood. Up to now, James Williamson had been the one force attempting to push the band forwards, but even he was losing heart. The fact is that I already knew this, but I had to be taught many times about how unreliable Iggy is. That band could have been a real success, and instead it was becoming a flop. By the time the Stooges returned to the West Coast in January 1974, for 4 shows at a club called Bimbo's in San Francisco, their audience had dwindled, with just a few dozen fans in the 700-capacity club, all of them clustered around the stage. Joel Selvin was there to review the show for Chronicle. He remembers that despite the tiny audience, the band was ragged but on the rampage, and that Iggy was as committed as ever. When the Stooges hit the Midwest again, despite the fact that supporters like Natalie Schlossman were there to look after him, Jim seemed to be in an even worse state. Physically, he was in decent condition, still slim, surviving on a diet of burgers with Tabasco or even raw meat, which he loved to order in restaurants, freaking out the waitresses. Now, though, his face was puffy and careworn, glammed up with makeup and blonde hair. He looked scary rather than androgynous. Mentally, he was tired and listless. Columbia had recorded the end-of-year Academy of Music show with a view to releasing it as a live album, but in January they decided it wasn't worthy of release and that Iggy's contract would not be renewed. In Toledo, Ohio, the band was supporting Slade, who played good old-fashioned brickies glam rock and detested the Stooges. Before the show, there was nearly a fight when the Brummy roadies insulted Natalie and her friend Pat. Scott Ashton threatened to take them all on, and the Brummies backed down. When it came to the show, Iggy, wearing pale makeup and a little bow tie, launched himself into the audience twice. Each time the audience parted like the Red Sea and looked on smugly as he smashed into the floor. The entire band were depressed by the audience's indifference. Jim was particularly disturbed, and that night Ron asked Natalie to look after him and put him to bed. Ron had hidden Jim's clothes in the hope that this would curtail his habit of cruising the hotel corridors for drugs in the middle of the night. Natalie spoke to him gently and reassuringly as if to a child until he fell asleep. After waiting another 20 minutes to make certain he was okay, she left. An hour and a half later, there was a disturbance in the hallway. Michael Tipton and Scott Ashton ran out and saw Jim cowering naked as Slade's roadies pulled the fluorescent light tubes out of the elevator and threw them at him. It is Ron who describes those last months as never-ending torture. Jim Osterberg today displays very little emotion about his physical and mental travails, but by January 74, this ambitious, driven man was regarded by everyone, even his closest bandmates, as a failure and a liability. And whatever drugs he was taking, says Michael Tipton, Jim knew exactly what was going on and was suffering greater mental torture than any of his bandmates could comprehend. Everybody thinks he's not 100%, but even when he's high, the little man thinks a lot. He knew. Over the next 2 weeks, the Stooges continued zigzagging across North America from Wisconsin to Toronto to Long Island. A few days later, on Monday, 4th of February, the band was booked into a tiny club on the far west side of Detroit, on the way to Ypsilanti, the Rock and Roll Farm in Wayne, Michigan. It was a tiny bar with a capacity of 120 or so that normally hosted blues or rock and roll revival acts. The road crew started complaining the moment they realised how difficult it would be to cram the Stooges' amplifiers onto the tiny stage. Several fans who turned up early started feeling worried when they saw how many bikes were lined up outside the venue. Robert Matthew was standing in the parking lot smoking a cigarette in the freezing cold as he worked out how to blag his way in for free. Matthew brought a camera to most Detroit gigs, but knowing the venue, he'd left it at home. He knew that this wasn't a place where people were going to see the band. This was more like the Stooges were playing their bar. Bob Baker, another Stooges fan, had arrived early and found himself a good vantage point at stage right on the edge of the dance floor. He too started feeling uneasy when he saw how many bikers were filling the bar. There were several dozen scattered around the audience, with a huddle of 6 or 7 at the edge of the dance floor. Heavy-set, bearded guys, aged around 30, most of them in dark denim jackets, several of which were decorated with the colours of the Scorpions, a West Side Detroit biker gang. Baker loved the Stooges. This was the first time he'd seen them since the Ford Auditorium. This time round, the music was more cutthroat and malevolent, and their look was far more extreme too. Iggy was prancing in a leotard, while James Williamson was a dark, powerful stage presence who also seemed bizarrely androgynous. If you were too drunk, you might not be sure he was a man. It was not a combination calculated to appeal to the typical Michigan biker, and even as the Stooges launched into their set, which still opened with raw power but was now augmented with more new songs, including another poignant doomed anthem, I Got Nothing, which ended up on Kill City. There were scuffles at the back of the venue. Robert Matthew and his friend Mark heard shouted threats and the word motherfucker being uttered from the stage, and that is not a word you should say to a biker because they tend to take it personally. As the violence continued randomly across the crowd, it was impossible to see what was happening. Matthew and his friend Mark decided they'd had enough and left. Then at some point during the set, the group of 6 or 7 bikers produced a carton of eggs and started throwing them at the stage. What happened next would be heavily mythologized by the Stooges, especially their leader. The reality witnessed from a few feet away by Bob Baker was perhaps even more scary. He was used to seeing Iggy surge out into the audience as the mood took him, and he saw the singer head straight towards the biker gang. In Iggy's own retelling of the story over the years, his encounter would have an almost ritual air about it, as the crowd parted to reveal his nemesis, dressed in the studded leather gloves like Goliath confronting David. As Baker watched from a couple of feet away, the flurry of violence seemed more hurried, nastier, and altogether more brutish. Iggy came into the audience, went right up to one of the bikers. This guy was big and heavy, and the biker just nailed him right in the face, and he went flying backwards through the crowd. It's just a law of physics. If you weigh 300 pounds and you punch somebody, that punch carries a lot more wallop than a 100-pound guy punching you. So when he hit Iggy, he just flew backwards through the room like something in a movie, and then they all just laughed. I've heard how the biker was supposed to be wearing studded gloves or a knuckle duster, says Skip Gildersleeve, a teenage Stooges fan who saw his favourite singer being punched out. He didn't need one. As Iggy staggered back onto the stage, he shouted, "That's it, we're gone," and the band scrambled out of the venue. "We all thought we were going to die," says Evita, who'd come up for the show, but they managed to face down more bikers as they cleared the dressing room. Speaking today about the violent, scary confrontation, Jim sounds philosophical, as if conscious of the inevitability that one day his confrontation of the audience would invite revenge. But to his fellow Stooges, who had come to believe in his invincibility, the shock seemed more profound. "It did change everything," says James Williamson. "The invincibility of the band was shattered. Think about all the gigs we played, and Iggy always did this crowd interaction thing. Then somebody just knocked him down. It basically shattered our world." The Wayne show was on a Monday. It had been a mere stopgap to earn a little more money before the Stooges played a much bigger show at the Michigan Palace, the once ornate but now rapidly decaying 1920s movie theatre on Bailey, just off Grand River Avenue, on the Saturday, 9th February. In the days after the Rock and Roll Farm Show, phone lines around Detroit burned red hot with conflicting rumours. More predictions of Iggy's suicide, boasts that the Stooges would enlist another biker gang's assistance, speculation that Stooges wouldn't show. In reality, there was no doubt that the Stooges would appear at the Palace. Every member of the band and crew desperately needed the $5,000 plus share of the gate they were being paid for the show. What would later look like heroism was in fact more like simple destitution. The band was upset, scared, and simply fed up, but that didn't stop them from appearing on Detroit's WABX radio station and challenging the Scorpions to show up at the Michigan Palace. Jim Osterberg was known for his physical courage. Just as he'd stood up for kids who were being bullied at school, there was little doubt that he'd show up for his encounter at the Palace, but he knew he was fast running out of road. Throughout the previous 5 years, even though he'd abandoned friends like Ron Ashton or James Williamson when it seemed expedient, he'd stayed true to his music, refusing to compromise even when it would have made his life easier. Now Jim, more than anyone, was aware that his music was becoming a parody of its former self. Although there were still flashes of brilliance like I Got Nothing, songs like Rich Bitch were forgettable jokes. However, any confrontation of reality was surely momentary if a rumour from that time was true. Michael Tipton says, "We heard that when the band came home for a rest before the last hurrah, Iggy somehow conned some people that were working at the University of Michigan, giving monkeys cocaine for a medical test. He took all the monkeys' cocaine and was doing all of it, and the monkeys were living on sugar water. Whoever it was got fired. In the weeks running up to the Rock and Roll Farm performance, there had been something close to contempt among the Stooges for their singer, the man who'd commanded them imperiously for so long, but who now seemed to be blowing every crucial show. Yet as they approached their Saturday night show at the Michigan Palace, there was renewed sympathy. James Williamson, an ambitious man, had seen Iggy trash his best shot at the big time. Despite the bravado he showed others, Williamson felt he himself was a failure. But as the Stooges prepared for the Michigan Palace, he felt the singer's plight was worse than his own, and he, like Jim, had quite simply had enough. We were all fed up with the rock and roll thing. We'd been on the road for months and months and months, hand to mouth, and it wasn't working. I think for everybody this was it. Scotty Thurston knew that the band was lost people without resources mentally, financially, or physically to try to group back together and make anything happen. There was defiance as the Stooges took the stage, apparently uncowed by their travails. Nothing would change about the Stooges' act. James still wore his slightly camp Bill Whitton Star Trek costume, but by now it was dirty and a little threadbare. Jim wore his leotard and ballet shoes, with a shawl wrapped around his waist. The evening was dank and depressing, with the sidewalks of Grand River Avenue coated in dirty slush. But still the hall of around 1,200 capacity was full, ensuring the Stooges would at least command a substantial fee. Hundreds of the Stooges fans had turned up to champion what was, with the slow and messy demise of the MC5 over in England, Detroit's last great hope. No Scorpions seemed to have turned up, so for their final show, the Stooges wouldn't even have the dignity of meeting a formal enemy who'd set out to destroy them. Instead, those who came to mock did so purely to indulge Detroit's traditional FU attitude. It was nuts, says Skip Gildersleeve, who'd followed the band around since their full auditorium performance. They were people that you thought lived out in the woods and only came out once in a while. It was like Charles Manson's followers. The Michigan Palace at that time was always plagued with sound problems and power cutting out and little heat. It was frightening and it was cold. All the psychedelics and the grass that had sustained John Sinclair's attempted revolution were gone. Instead, all the survivors turned on each other, fueled on Jack Daniels and Quaaludes. The Detroit biker attitude was to give the Quaaludes to the chicks and drink the Jack Daniels, says Robert Matthew, who notes that the more sophisticated clientele would have been dropping THC. He gave a nice solid buzz. I believe its history shows it was a horse tranquilizer. Even by Detroit standards, the event was scary, but the Stooges had enlisted the help of God's Children, a biker gang based in Ypsilanti, whose leader, John Cole, had often helped out John Sinclair and the Trans Love organization. Cole looked on coolly at the carnage as the evening unfolded. He'd seen worse. Some Stooges fans, like Hiawatha Bailey, enjoyed the buzz of violence and the crunch of glasses which hurtled over the crowd the moment the Stooges launched into raw power. Robert Matthew went up to the balcony where he could see the crowd throwing projectiles at the singer, who threw them right back. After a while, it became like a theatre. Iggy was definitely prepared for it. Fortunately, the palace's lofty, large stage meant it was harder to hit the band with a bottle, although Scott Ashton and Scotty Thurston, both sitting targets, had more narrow misses. This is when Ron was cut by a flying coin, which gave him a scar he has to this day. Michael Tipton was taping the evening and was convinced that Iggy knew it was all over. That's why he had fun with it, antagonising the crowd. Over the last few months, if a record company executive was in the audience, Iggy could be guaranteed to mess up. Now with maybe half the audience baying for his blood, he revelled in the moment as he prowled the stage in his ludicrous costume, soaking up the hate. The sound was often ragged, the singing just a shout, much of the music simplistic oral thuggery. But the real performance was in Iggy's incessant insulting of the audience. The banter was drawn out, and any odd projectile, a coin, ice cubes, an egg, launched in his direction served only to prolong his speeches. Some fans threw objects as tributes. Bailey tossed an antique velvet neckpiece, which was greeted as a certified cock ring, and a quarter-pound of grass, which John Cole secreted in Rock Action's bass drum. Watching Iggy confront this hail without flinching, a few audience members thought this meant the band would survive. Others, like Bob Baker, who'd also seen the violence at the Wayne show, were convinced it was over. I was extremely depressed. You got the feeling that it was his farewell concert, although you didn't know for sure. It was such a hostile environment, people were obviously trying to mess with his head. I thought, this guy's not going to live to be very old. I thought they'd given up, says Skip Gildersleeve. It was the end of something really good. Part of you was sad, remembers Scott Thurston, and guilty that you've seen something that was probably that probably was worthy of some respect being degraded. Otherwise, you were just worried about getting hit with a bottle. After leaving the stage briefly, the Stooges returned for their last number, Louie Louie. The song's message was that anything more sophisticated would be lost on such a deadbeat audience. Iggy improvised new obscene lyrics to the garage band staple that he'd sung back in the Iguanas. And as the song reached its conclusion, more missiles showered onto the stage, one of them a large Stroh's bottle that shattered on Scotty's piano. You nearly killed me, but you missed again, sneered Iggy, so you'd better keep trying next week. But there was no next week. And that show, of course, was what was captured on Metallic KO, which just kind of, for the event itself, just the fact that it was their last one, as at least originally as the Stooges, they come back much later for some sort of revival albums, but just the atmosphere in it, just that real edgy kind of like the audience are pissed, the band are kind of like come on then sort of thing. Like there's a real sort of like almost like antipathy between audience and band, and like they're throwing stuff, and Iggy, sorry, is egging it on, and it's just like listening to it is something else because you just hear the way he's talking to the audience, like sort of like it is a cool album though. It is cool. I don't, as I say, I don't have it myself, but it's worth checking out. Um, Actually, in the beginning of the book, it talks about how many people were influenced by that album. I'll talk quickly about that. It says, yeah, even as the Doom Singer dropped below anyone's radar, word of the Stooges' dumb, heroic demise was starting to spread. For some, that last stand was a modern-day rendering of Western mythology, the unflinching, dusty heroism of five gunslingers going to their doom in certain knowledge of their fate. For others, the parallels were almost biblical, for soon as English writer Iggy's very own John the Baptist would be on a plane from Los Angeles to Paris carrying a tape of the Michigan Palace show, a religious relic that would soon pass from believer to believer. As each young music fan examined the sleeve of Metallic KO, an album based on Michael Tipton's recordings with its silver and black photo of Iggy laid out like Jesus, they concluded that this music constituted a vital message. This music was the long-awaited antidote to a bland world of overblown progressive pomp, of complacent country rock coziness, of manufactured music controlled by faceless producers and session men. Iggy's Stooges, in contrast, were the real thing, heroic, doomed, and too dumb to realize it. Their frontman became a symbol of animalism, boredom, energy, and lethargy, and of a devotion to his music that very nearly cost him his life, and perhaps still could. And then the young fans who listened to this album embarked on quests of their own. Brian James, a guitarist in a band called Bastard, set out to find my own Iggy, a quest that would lead to the formation of two crucial groups called the London SS, from whose ashes would spring the Clash and Generation X, and the Damned, who would later release the call to action of a new movement that would become known as punk. So really, Metallic KO, even though it was that gig itself was kind of a death knell for the Stooges, the fact it was released on tape sparked something that became punk. Ian Curtis, an aspiring singer from Manchester, would buy the record too, playing it to his friends in Warsaw, later renamed Joy Division. Joy Division's bassist Peter Hook was one of many who enthused that Metallic KO was a real gig, a real live record, the only live album that reflected how it felt at his own fast-rising band's chaotic shows, where everything balanced on a knife edge. Other English kids like John Lydon and Glenn Matlock were listening too, and would adopt the Stooges' songs for their own band, the Sex Pistols, because they used to cover it. They did a version of No Fun. Another evening during one of his first visits to New York, Joe Strummer would play the album over and over as he spent the night with a new lover, immersing himself in its volume and intensity. Even decades later, kids like Anthony Kiedis of the Chili Peppers or Jack White of the White Stripes listened to the Stooges and resolved to follow their musical blueprint. Not every single person who listened to Metallic KO or its predecessors formed a band, but enough of them did to ensure that within a few years the invincible singer was on the rise again, revered by a new audience. It was another incredible twist in a life and career that would always subvert expectations, both in its highs and in its lows. Which is an amazing thing, really, the fact that Iggy literally went like so low, from such a low down place, like destroyed by just drugs and his own antics, and just fate, the hands of fate at times as well. It wasn't all his own doing. He really wanted to succeed, but he turned it around and ended up coming back as a solo artist. Again, in the solo career, he had his ups and his downs, but he really turned it around and now is seen as a real prolific figure. Rightly so. I'm just going to cover before we finish here the making of the album Kill City, and then we'll stop. But so it says there were no decisions, there was no plan. Jim was cast adrift like a piece of flotsam, pushed back and forth by the desires of the people around him, all the while contemptuous of them, yet painfully conscious that he was reliant on them for shelter, drugs, and human fellowship. Worst of all, while still in love with the raw power of the Stooges, he was convinced there was a hex on them. The drawn-out disaster of the band's last tour had left him deeply spooked, and his skyscraper ego was profoundly scarred by the knowledge that he bore the heaviest responsibility for the band's failure. This was a time when the best he could do was to grasp whatever chances came his way. Throughout 1974 and 75, Jim would be reliant on the kindness of strangers. There was no form to his wanderings. He would simply find refuge where he could. Fellow musicians, aspiring managers, kindly groupies, or rich heiresses. It would only be at the orders of the Los Angeles police that he would find some structure to his life, in the dormitory of a psychiatric institute. But before that would happen, there were a few vestiges of dignity that needed to be ripped away. So when Jim returned to LA in February 1974 and holed up with James Williamson in the Coronet, he had not quite abandoned the idea of the Stooges yet, who were, with customary irony, featured on the cover of Cream a few weeks later with their long-term champion Lester Bangs proclaiming that their time had finally come, well, ironically, just as the news filtered out that the band had finally split. Yet Jim's relationship with both of his one-time songwriting partners was crippled by mutual suspicion. Ron Ashton, still seething from the humiliation he'd suffered at his friend's hands, had left brother Scotty in Ann Arbor and returned to his apartment at the Coronet, where he worked on assembling his own band, New Order. Not that New Order, a different, I think it was The New Order. James Williamson, too, was hustling around for ideas, and Jim was content to sleep at his apartment whenever necessary, even though he himself was suspicious of Williamson, who he thought had tried to take over the Stooges as his own personal fiefdom in the band's final days. Still, there was a belief that the Stooges might reform despite all their troubles, right up to the moment when James got trapped in a serious drugs bust. The LAPD had been keeping a dealer's house in Laurel Canyon under surveillance. James drove out there for his supply and was busted on the way home, with heroin concealed in a balloon inside his packet of old gold cigarettes. In jail, facing a charge for dealing with no money for bail or an attorney, Williamson called Evita for help. I had never known him be scared, but this time he was. He was going through withdrawal and telling me, "I'm going to die, you have to help me." Evita's mum was a liberal attorney who, back in 73, had consented to the 16-year-old living with James as long as he dropped her off at Hollywood High School each day. He'd managed it for 2 weeks, following which Evita had abandoned her studies. Mrs. Ardura agreed to defend James on the understanding that he and Evita parted and her daughter returned to school. The couple accepted the deal, and as James's attorney, Ardura even put up her house to stand bail. She got the charge reduced to mere possession, and James was soon back in the Coronet alone. The harrowing experience had at least cleansed him of his drug habit, but from now on he had to be extra careful about hanging around with Iggy, lest he infringe the terms of his probation. Hollywood loves winners, but it's a city where losers are meant to disappear into the background scenery. Yet Jim threw himself into playing a loser with the same conviction he displayed as the glamorous main man star. Indeed, there seems to have been a fascination with plumbing the depths, as if Jim, like his one-time fellow heroin devotee John Adams, revelled in living out the plot of a noir novel. And over the next year, his principal role would be as a kept man, Michael DeBar, who had hit the skids at the same time as the singer he so admires, witnessed some of Iggy's decline, and even back then thought there was a magnificence amid the sleaze. The idea of being a kept rock and roll star was a very 70s one. These people would pay your way to give themselves credibility, and he was still this live, beautiful thing. Occasionally, Iggy could be sighted in upmarket locations like the Sunset Marquee, reading the Wall Street Journal, or swimming back and forth in the hotel pool as a beautiful blonde sat waiting for him holding a bag of cocaine, a scene of almost mythological perfection. The blonde was a well-known character on the Strip who'd left her husband in New Jersey and spent months cavorting with LA rock types until her money ran out and hubby came to reclaim her. Conversely, there would be the same scenario played out in the most pathetic of guises, such as the time that one teenager, a Rodney's regular and friend of Annie Apple, managed to bribe Jim out on a date with the offer of a couple of quaaludes. It was possibly cold-hearted calculation that made him encourage her to down her own supply early in the evening. A neophyte drugs user, she soon fell over and smashed her head on a car door, after which Iggy whisked her off to Apple's house, warning Annie's father, "You see, sir, she's taken some pills," before abandoning the teenager once he'd divested her of the remaining quaaludes. She was mortified, says Annie Apple. She'd been obsessed with Iggy for months. Now she'd blown her big date while he managed to get the drugs and be done with us. Other participants in the increasingly dark drama believed that there were simple solutions to Jim's consistently erratic behaviour. Scotty Thurston found Jim an apartment in Venice Beach near his own and tried working with him on demos for new material. The keyboard player thought that a little stability and focus, a chance to contemplate his own situation, might help Jim understand what was going on. "I did try, but I was naive. There were much deeper-seated problems," he says. Instead, it was a Los Angeles character with deep-seated problems of his own who'd assumed the role of Iggy's new champion. Danny Sugarman had been hanging around the Doors office, the band The Doors, since he was just 14, was an occasional reporter for Cream, ran his own mimeographed fanzine, Heavy Metal Digest, and had pretty much started at the top of the music business by becoming manager of Ray Manzarek, the affable one-time Doors keyboard player. Now that Iggy needed a band, what could be better than to take over his management and team him up with Manzarek? It was a perfect plan, except that Sugarman was fast developing a drug habit of his own and had nowhere near the emotional maturity to deal with the 27-year-old singer. By the spring of '74, Jim was rehearsing on and off with Manzarek's band at Wonderland Avenue, a rustic two-story Spanish abode house that was used as Ray Manzarek's office and practice space, as well as living quarters for Sugarman, and with increasing regularity Jim too, who was at one point on Manzarek's payroll. The keyboard player and singer got along well. Manzarek found Jim Osterberg a well-behaved, intellectual, conversational partner, and had huge respect for Iggy Pop's Dionysian energy. They worked with a small band of hip Hollywood musicians, including drummer Hunt and guitarist Tony Sales, the boisterous, crazed sons of comic Soupy Sales, who'd been playing professionally as a duo since Hunt was 14. Also, the Sales brothers would also go on to record with Iggy on a couple of albums that David Bowie produced, and also ended up forming Tin Machine with Bowie later in the 80s as well. And Nigel Harrison, who'd washed up in Los Angeles after his band Silverhead, led by Michael DeBar, had crashed and burned. The group worked on complex jazzy material, vaguely in the style of the Doors' Riders on the Storm. Interesting to read in here that Iggy ended up teaming up with Ray Manzarek of the Doors, because obviously, like, you know, he'd worked for so long with Jim Morrison and now has another, you know, kind of vibrant frontman, also another Jim working with him all of a sudden. I never even knew that happened until reading this. Manzarek in particular was amazed by Jim's genius at improvising lyrics, and the band worked up material in record time. The songs they crafted included Our Moon's Cafe, based on the bizarre characters who'd hang out at a Venice cafe that was a favourite haunt of Jim Morrison, and Line 91, about the bus journey from Venice Beach to Hollywood. Manzarek thought Jim was affable and easy to get on with, except when he would Iggy out, as he says. As far as Manzarek was concerned, this was a chance to liberate Jim Osterberg, with his versatile singing voice and intelligent demeanour, from his crazed alter ego, but Iggy refused to be erased. Iggying out took many forms, but invariably it required someone having to come along and rescue him. Typical examples were his trips north to San Francisco, where he'd hang out with the Pop Patrol, his own fan club made up of stalwarts from the bimbos and coquettes scene. On his return, Iggy would usually be, as Danny Sugarman put it, feminized, hair dyed black, wearing mascara and foundation and a skimpy dress. The dress wasn't as much a problem as the fact that his San Francisco admirers would ply him with heroin and quaaludes. On one occasion, Manzarek was called by Sugarman, who begged him to come to the Hollywood jail to bail out his new bandmate. The two arrived and found among the usual gang members, junkies and hookers, Jim Osterberg in a long dress with smeared eyeliner, barefooted, drooling and mumbling. Manzarek, the only one with the necessary cash on hand, bailed him out. Iggying out could also refer to his behaviour with Babe Buell, who flew over to see him in April and took him to Hamburger Hamlet in her rented convertible. During a quick trip to the bathroom while the motor was being refueled, Iggy doled her out on a neat line of powder on the toilet cistern, which she inhaled in one go on the assumption it was cocaine, only for Jim to tell her that it was heroin. The pair took refuge in Ben Edmonds' apartment, where Babe was sent off to puke in the bathroom. Jim gently showered her clean while Ben yelled, "Don't you clog up my drains with your puke, goddammit," from the living room. As Jim apologized, Babe shouted at him, "Go fuck yourself," then got in her car and split. Another typical Iggy trick might be to arrive at a practice 2 hours late, then walk into the rehearsal room stark naked. This sometimes happened when Ray was auditioning a new musician. For instance, Alice Cooper's one-time guitarist Dick Wagner. A similar example was the time when Danny Sugarman had persuaded Clive Davis to come and check out Ray's amazing new band. Davis turned up at 2 p.m. as arranged and started chatting with Ray. No sign of Iggy. The conversation continued for another hour or so. Still no Iggy. Finally, it gets to 5 o'clock and Ray's run out of every Doors story he can tell Clive. Then suddenly a yellow cab, which is rare in LA, shows up and it's Iggy in his underwear, totally buzzing on something. Clive Davis looks at Manzarek and smiled. "Well, Ray, I guess some things never change." Ray Manzarek believes the psychological motivation behind Jim and Iggy's behaviour was simple. It was about, who are you? The problem was, I am Iggy Pop, the crazy wild man, doyen of the Coquettes. Or am I Jim Osterberg, the good poet, the good singer? He would have to have put that on the line in front of Clive Davis and choose one of those personas, and I think rather than confront that choice, it was just easier not to appear. When he wasn't crashing at Wonderland Avenue, Jim would find refuge anywhere across the valley. Despite his wild mood swings and eccentric behaviour, he usually seemed conscious of what he could get away with. Some people speculated that despite his apparent confusion, he was simply using Manzarek and Sugarman until something better came along. He was often out of it, says writer and producer Harvey Kubernik, who crashed at the same house as Jim for a few weeks. But you also had the sense you were watching Rommel working out exactly where to place its tanks. Basically saying how calculating Iggy could be as well. Kubernik was staying in the Laurel Canyon home of his friend Bob Sherman, and Jim intuitively understood Kubernik and Sherman's ambition to break into the music business. He charmed them rather than exploited them, and when he cheerily welcomed Sherman with the words, "Hey Bob, let's go get a slab and a beer," Sherman hardly resented the fact that when they ordered their spread at Harry's Open Pit Barbecue on Sunset, he was invariably expected to pick up the tab. By the summer of 1974, Manzarek was openly floating the idea of producing an Iggy album, mentioning the idea to Rolling Stone, and Sugarman was keen to project his new charge as a responsible, reformed individual, despite the massive evidence to the contrary. Over June and July, Iggy guested a couple of times at Manzarek's sets at the Whiskey, singing an old Doors number like LA Woman or Backdoor Man. He cut a respectable figure on stage and a damaged sad one off of it. One night, rock fan Jim Parrott and wife Dee Dee saw a ball of arms, legs, and pink fur bouncing down the stairs of the Whiskey. As the strange apparition hit the bottom, it uncoiled and jumped up to greet them with a cheeky grin. "Hi, I'm Iggy." A couple of nights later, he accosted Dee Dee backstage, asking her, "Hey, want to see me do a somersault?" And obliging, then boasting, childlike, "That's nothing, here's a double whammy." Another time, Kim Fowley invited Iggy onto the Whiskey stage to introduce his latest creations, the Hollywood Stars. Clad in his pink feather concoction, Iggy commanded a beat from the drummer before improvising a monologue. "I didn't used to like the Hollywood Stars, I used to like the New York Dolls. Then I heard them play Satisfaction, now I want to sleep with them." The crowd was impressed until they realized he had no intention of leaving the stage. The Hollywood Stars roadies vaguely attempted to peel him off the microphone stand before the band gave up and allowed him to guest on a couple of songs. After the show, he accosted Jim and Dee Dee once more, his face puffy and lined, asking them... basically, he was out of his mind. The Parrots interviewed Jim for their fanzine Denim Delinquent. In conversation, he was coherent, but his mood was dark and defeatist, and his main hope seemed to be that he would be asked to sing in a reformed Doors lineup. He was so vulnerable, you wanted to wrap your arms around him and protect him, despite the bravado he occasionally projected, says Parrott, who sensed that the singer felt angry about how he was being portrayed, yet he was incapable of doing anything about it. There could be no better indication of the depths to which Jim had sunk than his first full post-Stooges performance. Jim and Ray had been working on a loosely themed piece which pasted together a number of musical movements in the vein of the Doors' Soft Parade. Maybe they'd be acting, talking, girls on stage, says Manzarek. The idea was to keep on expanding it. The first anyone heard of actually staging this extravaganza was when Iggy turned up at Nigel Harrison's apartment just by the whiskey early in the morning, which of course meant he'd been up all night buzzing on something, says Harrison, on 11th of August. He sat down on the edge of the mattress where Nigel and his blonde Bowie look-alike girlfriend Suzette were attempting to snooze, insisted Nigel pick up his bass and started singing a simple riff, telling Nigel to keep playing a drone in F sharp. It transpired that Jim had worked up the song, which was based on the Velvet Underground's Some Kind of Love, and revolved around the lyric Put Jelly on Your Shoulder, with Ray, but that Ray had declined to participate in this premature artistic ejaculation. Ordering Nigel to turn up at Rodney's English Disco at 9 and mentioning he was off to find a guitarist, a drummer, and cryptically a virgin, Iggy disappeared onto the strip. He found his guitarist at the Coroner, knocking on the sky blue front door of 404 to rouse Ron Ashton, telling him, "You still got your Nazi uniform? Good, bring that, and you'll need to brutalize me, so bring a whip too." No one is sure where Iggy found his drummer, but unsurprisingly, he found it impossible to locate a virgin and instead had to settle for a gay youth who was dining at Denny's just down from Rodney's. In the meantime, he ordered Danny Sugarman to phone up every journalist he knew and tell them to expect a landmark performance. At Rodney's that evening, which would be entitled Murder of a Virgin, Sugarman spent hours on the phone telling his contacts, "Your name's on the guest list and you better come because he's only going to be doing this once," flirting once again the delicious prospect that Iggy would commit suicide on stage. Rodney Bingenheimer was delighted at the prospect of Iggy performing at his club. The singer told him he wanted to show the glitter crowd what real rock and roll was about, and volunteered to resume his old job as radio plugger. Rodney duly picked Jim up in his black Cadillac convertible and drove him to KNAC, where they buzzed on the intercom, only to be told that Iggy Pop was not allowed in the building. There was a line outside Rodney's for the show, although once inside the packed club it was impossible to see what was going on unless you were right at the edge of the mirrored dance floor, where Iggy, wearing a pair of Jim Morrison's leather pants borrowed from Danny Sugarman, declaimed in front of a huge drum kit. Nigel Harrison kept up a rhythmic pulse, and Ron Ashton, wearing his Africa Corps uniform, complete with swastika armband, brandished a sconce he'd carefully crafted from a length of electrical flex. The Virgin, who was wearing some kind of sacrificial white robe, looked nervous, but it soon transpired that the victim would be Iggy himself. Iggy had brought along a hangman's noose and started waving a steak knife he'd borrowed from Sugarman's kitchen. "Do you want to see blood?" he yelled at the Hollywood crowd. "Yeah," they shouted back. "Do you really want to see blood?" he asked again. "Yes, we want to see blood," they shouted as one. "Beat me with the whip," he ordered Ron, who instead pulled on the noose to choke him a little bit. "No, whip me, hurt me," he insisted, and Ron laid into him. Then he goes up to a guy in the audience, says Ron, and tried to make him stab him with this rusty kitchen knife. He wouldn't, so Iggy did it himself. Then he carved an X into his chest, said Nigel Harrison. "I was really scared because he'd mentioned he'd wanted to kill off Iggy Pop, but also I was worried he might get blood on my brand new Kensington Market polka dot top." "We were not at all easily shocked back then," says Pamela DeBar, "but that was really, really shocking. We were all very worried, yet it seemed a logical next step for Iggy, letting us in on his anger and frustration. It was all over in 15 minutes. Then they put him in a burlap bag out of the club and into the gutter," says Ron. "It was horrible. He was fried." "I never really planned the blood," says Jim today. "Then as I got nearer, I made the decision to use the knife. It was unnecessary. It didn't really work. It was bad blood. The blood at Max's Kansas City was nicer blood, much less cynical blood. I was desperate." I will also show you, there is some pictures from this, but they are suitable for use on here, so I should think. So, yeah, man, it's crazy. So, this was Iggy at the show, like covered in blood, literally after what he'd done, and that's him being stood on. If you can make that out, he was egging Ron Ashton on to stand on him in his Nazi uniform. It sounds like an absolute insane performance. So yeah, when Jim Osterberg, who created Iggy Pop, his alter ego had been the medium to help him communicate his music. Now Iggy was the message, and the music was irrelevant compared to the spectacle of his ritual self-harm, which at this low point seemed to be all he had to offer. "He sacrificed himself for us at the rock and roll altar," says Kim Fowley, "as they did in the Roman Colosseum every Sunday when the lions would eat the Christians, and Iggy Pop is both the lion and the Christian." Danny Sugarman, the man who had publicised this spectacle, took Jim to the beach so he could dive in the Pacific Ocean and bathe his wounds. I waited like an hour and he didn't come back. What was I going to do? I wasn't going to swim out there looking for him. So I went home, took a couple Quaaludes, and went to bed. The next morning, according to Sugarman, he was awoken by a phone call from a hysterical girl screaming that Iggy was attacking her father's Maserati with a hatchet. Meanwhile, Sugarman too was struggling to keep a grip on his own problems. But when Manzarak called to ask Sugarman how everything had gone at Rodney's, Danny told him, "Great!" The weeks after the sad spectacle at Rodney's continued in much the same fashion for Iggy. Confused living conditions, sometimes hanging with whatever women would give him shelter, sometimes crashing with fellow musicians who by now were used to the sight of a quaaluded Iggy at their door. He'd regularly show up in a yellow mini dress with his dick hanging out of it and would go, "I'm cold, I'm hungry," and empty your refrigerator. Then the next minute he would be trying to crawl in bed with me and my girlfriend. Between us, that's what he was like, laughs Nigel Harrison. Even when he lucked into more luxurious living quarters, such as a wealthy woman called Alex, who had a pleasant house in Stone Canyon, he was still a creative scam artist, sticking band-aids over his face before he left the house, remembers Harrison, so he could hang out at the Rainbow and moan, "I got beat up by two Puerto Ricans, I got no money," hoping to beg some cash or drugs. Unfortunately, real life soon conspired to imitate such scams when Jim turned up to see David Bowie at LA's Universal Amphitheatre at the beginning of September. He'd already suffered the humiliation of trying to find Bowie at the Beverly Hills Hotel, cadging a ride there with Rowan's friend Doug Curry, and realizing his one-time champion was nowhere to be found. Now walking through the parking lot, he and Sugarman were bounced by two surfers who enticed Jim to a quiet corner with the offer of drugs, then beat the two of them up. Ron Ashton saw Jim sitting outside Wonderland Avenue the next morning, missing a front tooth, and complaining that Sugarman had abandoned him to his fate. These weren't the only humiliations over this period. In the autumn, Iggy ill-advisedly popped up on Flo and Eddie's radio show. And if you want to know who they are, check out Frank Zappa's 200 Motels film, because they're in that. And it's kind of a crazy thing to watch, too. The K-Rock DJs were celebrated for their witty lampooning, and when Iggy guested to chat and sing along to records, it was obvious his days of fast-talking repartee were behind him. Flo and Eddie, a hip duo who'd made their name playing with the Turtles and Frank Zappa, were laughing at him, not with him. The same scenario was being played out at locations like Rodney's, the Whiskey and the Rainbow, where, says Jim Parrott, every time we saw Jim, even though people were deferential to him in some ways, they were laughing about him. In October, Nick Kent flew over to see his hero and was shocked to realise that Iggy seemed to have the word loser tattooed on his forehead. I'd have to tell people again and again, this guy's not a loser. This guy's the king of the world. This guy's created a music, you don't even realise it yet, but it's going to change the face of the world. As the two sat and talked, Jim was quite often lucid, but revealed to Kent how spooked he had been by the disasters the Stooges had undergone, and how he believed there was a hex on the band. Kent was shocked by Jim's condition, horrified to see him occasionally sleeping rough or passed out in a parking lot in a dress, zonked out on who knew how many quaaludes. Sometimes Jim would cry about the condition in which he found himself, but although existential despair was sometimes the cause, the tears were just as likely to be inspired by his inability to score drugs. Overwhelmed with sadness at the condition in which he found his hero, Kent resolved to help him, and picked up an open reel tape of the Stooges' disastrous Michigan Palace show in the hope that he might be able to raise some money with it back in Europe. That is the tape of what became Metallic KO. By now, Jim seemed to have made up whatever his last disagreement with Williamson had been. It was impossible to make sense of most of his relationships at the time, says Tony Sales, who had become friendly with James and his girlfriend Evita. I know Jim confided in James over that period, and he also told James to F off. At times we get along, at other times he'd tell me to piss off. A lot of the time it was the drugs talking. One's values and intellect and integrity are challenged by that shit. It's hard to put a marker on something like that and say that's how someone really is. Jim moved into James's apartment at 306 The Coronet, which gave him some stability, even though most of the building's hookers and Hollywood wannabes maintained a sideline in selling junk and quaaludes, refused to speak to him thanks to unpaid drug debts. Earlier in '74, Jim had been so desperate he'd even contemplated making a living playing with pickup bands for Hollywood's jet-set house parties. He'd also at one point arranged to audition as a singer for Kiss, but hadn't turned up. He was, however, mortally offended when Nick Kent asked him if he'd ever considered putting his impressive member to work in Hollywood's thriving porn industry. By the autumn, he was becoming more committed to the idea of reviving the spirit of the Stooges and reuniting with James, which meant a break with Manzarek, for the ex-Doors player and James Williamson had little time for each other musically or personally. However, for the one show Danny Sugarman had actually booked for the Manzarek and Iggy supergroup he was attempting to tout, Iggy insisted that Williamson join the band, despite Ray's misgivings. Iggy sported pristine new front teeth for the occasion, presumably funded by Sugarman or Manzarek. The show Sugarman had booked was a prestigious event that set Hollywood's rock and roll community abuzz. The Hollywood Street Revival and Trust Dance, staged at the Hollywood Palladium on 9th October, will be popularly known as the Death of Glitter. Once the MC Kim Fowley and others got it into their heads that the event would be a modern-day counterpart to Hyatt Asbury's symbolic death of the hippie ceremony in October 1967, as in like the death of like glam, basically. The event was built around the New York Dolls. The Cockettes were also booked, but were banned by comedian Lawrence Welk, who just considered them depraved. And Iggy was determined to show these upstarts how high-energy rock music should really sound. Unfortunately, a hurried rehearsal at Wonderland Avenue the day before meant the band only had time to throw together a set full of cover versions. The show was competent and aggressive, but for many fans it was a disappointment. As Manzarek, Williamson, Scott Morgan, ex-singer of The Rationals, who'd ended up in LA and was called in to guest on harmonica, Nigel Harrison and drummer Gary Malabar stormed through rock and roll staples including Route 66, Subterranean Homesick Blues, and Everybody Needs Somebody to Love. There were flashes of fire and energy, notably when Iggy kicked a stage-invading female fan in the backside, propelling her back into the audience, and Manzarek was delighted, declaring the band rocked like a motherfucker. I'd imagine that'd be an amazing gig to see, actually, even if they did just mainly play covers. But the show represented an end rather than a beginning. Manzarek declared he couldn't work with Williamson. There was no sonic space when you had this guitar turned up to 11 like Spinal Tap, he says. While Jim responded that without Williamson he would lose his audience, to which Manzarek's response, of course, was, "What audience?" Before the show, Iggy had been excited and energised. In the hours before he'd gone on stage, Iggy had discovered that Scott Morgan couldn't get to his harmonicas, which were locked in the room he'd borrowed at the Coronet. As the others discussed breaking in the door, Iggy got into an adjacent third-floor apartment and leapt across an air shaft over a three-story drop to rescue the stranded instruments. After the show, Iggy wandered with Annie Apple, Fred Smith and Johnny Thunders for a bizarre ramble up into the Hollywood Hills before Iggy and Thunders gave the other two the slip around dawn and hailed a cab to Johnny's room at the Hollywood Inn, undoubtedly to score junk together. To Danny Sugarman, who'd brokered Jim's collaboration with Ray Manzarek, its termination seemed another example of Iggy snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. But he was running out of ideas too, struggling to control his own fast fragmenting life and growing reliance on Quaaludes and heroin. The next time he heard from Iggy was shortly after the Palladium show when the phone rang at Wonderland Avenue. "Hello, this is Dr. Zucker." "I don't think I know a Dr. Zucker." "I know, I'm sorry, I work at UCLA Neuropsychiatric Hospital where I'm on call. So far I've omitted 2 Jesus Christs, a Napoleon Bonaparte, an albino who thinks he's Santa Claus, and now I have this guy the cops brought in who claims he's Iggy Pop and you're his manager." As the conversation continued, it became clear that Jim had again been picked up by the cops, who'd called following a complaint by a cashier at a Hollywood burger joint and found the singer lewded out and drooling aggressively at the diner's clientele. By now, the singer was well known to the LAPD, who'd previously picked him up for impersonating a woman. This time they gave him a simple choice, a prison cell or the psych ward. Iggy was sane enough to elect the latter, and when Sugarman turned up to drop off clothes and other necessities for Jim at the Neuropsychiatric Institute's complex of buildings on Westwood Plaza, he felt a sense of relief. Finally, he could hand the responsibility for his friend over to someone who knew what he was doing. As for Jim, who for so long had rebelled against authority and convention, giving in and finally confronting his mental problems was liberating. It was possible he could have objected to his confinement to a psychiatric ward. Instead, he seized the opportunity. Jim Osterberg was fortunate to have landed up at one of the world's leading psychiatric facilities. For the next few weeks, his life was conducted according to a rigid but bracing regime. He slept in a simple 8 by 4 foot room with an unfinished wooden cot, 1 pillow, 1 sheet and 1 blanket. It was bare and clinical, with no running water and a shared bathroom. Most mornings Jim would get up early and walk into a common room where he would be allowed to play records. His anthem for the day would usually be James Brown's Sex Machine album, which he'd play all the way through. After a breakfast of Cheerios, his day would usually involve group discussions, psychoanalysis, walks in the gardens, or games of basketball. Although Jim avoided most of the shrinks at MPI, he formed a bond with Murray Zucker, the resident who'd been on call when he was first admitted. Zucker was young, smart, open, and interested. He liked Jim, respected his intelligence and creativity, and would subsequently keep a close eye on his career. Murray found his patient extremely likable, not because of the bravado that those who knew his music might expect, but because he was very sweet, charming, personable, and had a great sense of humour. and was very perceptive. There was always this intensity about him. Also, there was this little boyish quality that engendered other people wanting to take care of him. It was impossible for any of the MPI psychiatrists to diagnose Jim until he was stabilised and all traces of drugs had disappeared from his system. Once that was done, the diagnosis was that his underlying condition was hypomania, a bipolar disorder characterized by episodes of euphoric or overexcited and irrational behavior succeeded by depression. Hypomanics are often described as euphoric, charismatic, energetic, prone to grandiosity, hypersexual, and unrealistic in their ambitions, all of which sounded like a checklist of Iggy's character traits. Bipolar disorders are genetic, and it has often been suggested that the condition has survived because it confers an evolutionary advantage on the population. Despite Jim's travails, his addiction to a variety of drugs, his wild mood swings and distress, that his musical career was washed up, there is little self-pity evident in his own or anyone else's memories of his time at MPI. Instead, even today, he just demonstrates an affecting empathy with his fellow inmates, who he says included a couple of delusional teens, 2 full-blown manic depressives, and a baseball player who'd thrown himself out of the window while high on LSD. And, he claims, saddest of all, lots and lots of those American housewives who just break down. They're the big mental cases in the US who just break down from loneliness and general mental neglect. They get on pills or alcohol, and one day they just lose their orientation. Dr. Zucker remembers his former patient well, but intriguingly, he now questions the initial diagnosis of hypomania, which normally gets more serious with age, and speculates that Jim's problems were more specifically related to his drug use, his creative lifestyle, and the complexities of the personae he'd chosen to harness. At times, he seemed to have complete control of turning this persona on and that one on, playing with different personae as a display of the range of his brain, says Murray. But then at other times you get the feeling he wasn't in control, he was just bouncing around with it. It wasn't just a lack of discipline, it wasn't necessarily bipolar, it was God knows what. Jim was such an intriguing psychological specimen that he was presented at what was known as the Grand Round, when a visiting professor would interview MPI's most interesting or challenging inmates. It was fascinating, remembers Murray. You had this world-famous professor, a very small guy, wan and intense, sitting nose to nose with Jim and asking him psychoanalytic-type questions. Hugely expert in manipulating his interviewers, Jim was both charming and forthcoming, but Murray looked on in fascination as the professor got down to some very hardcore psychoanalytical questions. It was intriguing to watch a showman who's so bright and charming and perceptive that he can parry any situation and put on any persona at will, deal with a world-famous psychoanalyst who wasn't having any of it. Unsurprisingly, the psychoanalysis would also cover the subject of narcissism, and one gets the impression from Dr. Zucker that what would be excessive for the average individual was unsurprising in a singer. At any rate, Murray's explanation of narcissism, this unending emotional neediness for attention that's never enough, would eventually inspire a song, I Need More, that was a brilliant exploration on the subject, says Zucker. That was off of a much later album in his solo career. We are getting to Kill City. We are very nearly at the end of this now. I know it's been a long video and I appreciate you taking the ride with me, but we're nearly there. And I want to show you this last record as well. So, while Dr. Zucker's psychological counselling and an enforced break from drugs would begin a healing process, it would take years to be completed. Without doubt, Zucker helped banish the sense of failure that haunted Jim, launching an era that would see him harness his exuberance, helping transform him from the man who sang about death trips to the one who celebrated his lust for life. But life at MPI could be boring and frustrating, with few visitors to relieve the tedium. Don Waller, Fast Freddy, and some friends from Backdoor Man attempted to visit their stricken hero. The door staff decided Jim's well-wishers were drug dealers and refused them admission. The O'Mearas couldn't even leave the flowers they'd brought in case they concealed illicit substances. David Bowie was one of the few who gained admittance. According to Jim, the doctors were starstruck and admitted Bowie, who was, Jim says, off his face and clad in a spacesuit, accompanied by the actor Dean Stockwell. But this was a very different David Bowie from the efficient, almost studious character Jim had known in London. David's opening question was, "Hey, want some blow?" A later visit was less crazed. This time Bowie brought his new regular companion, Ola Hudson, who designed his The Man Who Fell to Earth costumes, which was a film that David Bowie did. And Hudson's 9-year-old son Saul, later better known as Slash, the top-hatted guitar-singing founder of Guns N' Roses. By now it was obvious Bowie had problems of his own, but it would turn out that his sympathy and respect were valuable assets as Jim attempted to rebuild his battered self-esteem. Ultimately, the intervention of the LAPD and Jim's stay at MPI had probably saved him from a descent into complete mental breakdown and possibly from death. Yet there was one more equally crucial therapy, one witnessed by Doug Curry in the autumn of 1974, when Curry sat down in James Williamson's living room at the Coronet and listened as Iggy sang his way through a collection of around 8 songs, while Williamson accompanied him on his Les Paul Custom, plugged into a tiny pig nose amplifier. And that became Kill City, which was released as Iggy Pop and James Williamson Kill City. They look like that at the time. Which features Kill City, Sell Your Love, Beyond the Law, I Got Nothing, which is a cool track, Joanna, Night Theme. Kill City is a good track as well, actually. And then Night Theme Reprise, Consolation Prizes, No Sense of Crime, Lucky Monkeys, and Master Charge. So that, the songs that feature on that also feature in various incarnations on those other demo albums, amongst other Stooges rehearsal recordings too. So yeah, let's talk about it quick. Even in this raw, unadorned state, the songs had a stark beauty. A few, including I Got Nothing and Joanna, were familiar from the old Stooges set, but there was a new simplicity and focus to their delivery. The new songs were mostly affecting but defiant depictions of life on the edge in Los Angeles. Beyond the Law, Jim mentioned, described his relationship with Manzarek, the straights all hate the sounds we make, while Kill City was a forensic description of his own predicament, living where the debris meets the sea. It's a playground for the rich, it's a loaded gun for me. These haunting songs exemplified Iggy's predicament. Powerful and uncompromising, they would languish unreleased for many years, yet they illustrated how, even in the absence of any interest from the outside world, Jim Osterberg was compelled to make music and transform his own life with all its inspiration, stupidity, and suffering into great art. Around the same time, the two played these songs for John Cale, who preserved their acoustic performance on his tiny cassette recorder and promised to try and find them a deal. Then Cale ran into delays, but Ben Edmonds, a long-term Stooges fan, who'd previously been editor at Cream but had recently moved out to LA, offered to fund some recordings. Edmonds was convinced that Williamson and Pop could make a great record that would embody the legacy of the Stooges, but show people the Stooges could make something that resembled music. He was doing some publicity work for the songwriter Jimmy Webb of MacArthur Park and Wichita Lineman fame, and managed to hire Webb's home studio in Encino on a costs-only basis, the only fee being for Jimmy's brother Gary, who would engineer the sessions. Jim seemed humbled compared to his former self, but was earnest about proving he could be relied upon. He would meet Ben at lunchtime at a cafe by Edmund's office at Record World, and they'd work on lyrics and discuss arrangements. There would be lapses still where Jim would be beset by doubts. At one point he went into the McDonald's next to the apartment his current girlfriend had rented for him on Pico and picked up an application form for a McJob. He never filled it in though, presumably deciding that another stint in MPI was more enticing than a job flipping burgers, and he elected to return as a voluntary patient to try to get straight. Hence James would oversee the demo sessions while Iggy would overdub his vocals on day release from MPI. Fortuitously, Luella Osterberg, Jim's mum, who with Jim Sr. remained anxious for the welfare of their son, regularly sending him cash, had kept up his Blue Cross health insurance, which covered his attendance at MPI. Recording was brisk. James and Scott Thurston called in favours from all the musicians they knew, and the band revolved around Williamson and Scotty, who played keyboards and bass on half the tracks, augmented by bassist Steve Tranio and English drummer Brian Glasscock, a friend of Scotty's who later joined the Motels. James's friends Hunt and Tony Sales would also play on a couple of tracks. All of them played for free. For the 2 or 3 days when Iggy added his vocals, James would drive down to collect him in the rickety blue MG Midget he'd just bought. A recent insurance payout meant he was free to devote himself to music and take him back in the evening. Although Jim was occasionally woozy as the MPI doctors experimented with the dosage of what was probably lithium, his singing in retrospect seemed perfect. Its slight wariness and air of desperation perfectly suited to the material, and the initial mixes, says Ben Edmonds, were rough, raw and thrilling. One night during a mixing session, Art Garfunkel dropped into the studio on the way to see his friend Jimmy Webb and sat and listened to a couple of songs. For months afterwards, Edmonds found it hard to erase the memory of Garfunkel's frizz-crowned head bopping respectfully up and down to the crazed sound of the Michigan Lost Souls, whose career seemed the perfect antithesis of his own. And we're getting a couple more pages and we're there, guys. Although there was no immediate reaction from Rocket, whom they regarded as the most promising contender, Edmonds was optimistic about the tapes, particularly when he played them to Seymour Stein in January 1975. He was already a respected industry exec, but he would soon become even more celebrated with his signing of the Ramones and later discovery of Madonna. Stein loved what he heard. "These aren't demos, this is the album," he told Edmonds. But when Edmonds returned to Los Angeles, he discovered that in traditional Stooges style, Williamson and Pop had conspired to sabotage their own career once more and swiped the master tape from the studio. So this stuff didn't get released till much later. Today, Williamson says that he and Jim were advised to take the tapes by Bennett Glotzer, an entertainment attorney who was planning to take over Iggy's management. Bennett said to us, "Go up there and get the tapes and I'll do what I can to shop them." So he drove up to Jimmy Webb's house and said, "Hi, can we have our tapes?" And they said, "Sure." Ultimately, says Williamson, Glotzer despaired of dealing with Iggy, who was too frenetic for him. Meanwhile, Edmonds had shelled out his entire savings from his measly journalist salary with no return, although with admirable sang-froid, he saves most of his resentment for the limp remix that Williamson would perform on the tapes a couple of years later. Glotzer's lack of progress in shopping the tapes paled alongside some darker news on 11th February 1975 when Jim received a phone call telling him that Dave Alexander had died in Ann Arbor's St. Joseph Mercy Hospital the previous day. Jim rushed to Ron Ashton's apartment, telling him, "Xander's dead and I don't care." Ron was outraged and felt like beating Jim up. James, who was shocked by the news, calmed things down, but Jim's reaction was a kind of denial. He was deeply troubled by Alexander's death. He liked to pretend he had no emotions, or only superficial emotions, says Michael Tipton, who had long conversations with Jim about the dead Stooge, but you could tell it really bothered him and that he was deeply depressed. Alexander's death was caused by pulmonary edema brought on by pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas, a condition which is often caused by alcohol abuse. Indeed, the autopsy also noted severe alcohol-related damage to the liver. So, by the summer of 75, Williamson had once more drifted apart from Jim, perhaps because of an argument after the guitarist tried to get him to sign a contract covering their work at Webb Studio. James had also concluded that he was never going to make it as a guitarist. He'd cut his hand during a violent argument at an Alice Cooper recording session that took a long time to heal, and it was just one more thing in a long sequence of crap, he says. He spent his time learning audio engineering at Paramount Recorders, by which time Jim's musical ambitions seemed to be once again focused on David Bowie. By now, David had... Okay, so that is a good place to stop. That is a good place to stop, because we've been going for a while. And so yeah, that is where, at this point, that is the kind of official finish of the Stooges, as it were. They kind of already had, but the fact that he's still with Williamson and playing like those songs that they wrote in the Stooges, I'd say Kill City is the actual official last thing they did, until when they came back in much later. I mean, I believe James Williamson actually came back and worked on a couple of Iggy's solo albums during the, might be late 70s, early 80s, but we're not covering that in this particular video. But yeah, they officially come back. At least, I don't know if James Williamson did, but Ron Ashton and Scott Ashton come back on a much later album, 2003's Iggy Pop Skull Ring. And do a few songs on there. He also got songs on there with like Sum 41 and Green Day and a band he'd built by that point called The Trolls, but we're not going to go into that because we're just covering the Iggy and Stooges. And then they did come back. Hang on, I'm going to pull the laptop back out just to show you, because after they did the songs on there, they did come back not long after with a full album called The Weirdness, which is that album. And it was the first Stooges album of new material since, well, it claims since Raw Power, but I guess it is, but it's the first one definitely since Kill City. But of course, I suppose it featured the Ashtons, so yeah, officially. And it also had Mike Watt on bass on that one as well. So that was one they released in 2007. And then I believe, unfortunately, Ron Ashton passed away. Does it say on that? Yeah, he died in early 2009, unfortunately. And then after that, there was one more Stooges album, which was in what's like 2013, which is called Ready to Die. This is that album, and that one featured was the first one to feature Williamson again, I believe. If I can just skim down and look who was it. So it was Iggy Pop, Scott Ashton, Mike Watt on bass again, James Williamson, and Steve Mackey on saxophone. So that's Steve Mackey as well. So it was like another sort of reunion. Unfortunately, it didn't have Ashton, who passed away. But that there is the rather long-winded, a brief history story of Iggy and the Stooges. Hope you've enjoyed it and I've not bored you to death. I think there's been interesting stuff in there. Certainly stuff that I learned in the book that I didn't know about him. But yeah, if there's any interest, I might do an Iggy solo career one. But hopefully that's been real informative, and hopefully I haven't read like too much of the book that you won't check out for yourselves, because you really should, because there's more in there than what I've said, and it's a really good book. Also recommend the Bowie one as well that I showed earlier, because that was a real interesting read too. All right then, guys. Thank you for bearing with me. I know it's been a long one, and all being well, I'll see you in another one of these. Thanks, guys. Take care.